From shinobi to king. What if Naruto claimed the Iron Throne?
Hello everyone, welcome to What If Naruto Joined Game of Thrones and Claimed the Iron Throne movie. Before we start, please go support Dragneel Slayer for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made. There will be some mistaken characters' gender, but of course Naruto is a male. In Game of Thrones, you either win or you die, there's no middle ground. Myths and legends have darkened the lands of Asai due to its proximity to the Shadowlands, lending an aura of mystery and intrigue to everything that surrounds it and to the inhabitants who walk its dark streets. In Westeros, strangers are not unwelcome nor are they a strange sight, but when a man comes to the north from lands farther than Asai itself, he brings about changes in history. A member of the Nine, forced to wield a sword from the moment he was born, estranged from his family, Naruto of the Uzumaki Clan, has arrived in the Seven Kingdoms and entered the Game of Thrones with no apparent purpose. Alliances, betrayals, deaths. Pride does not exist in war, and honor has left many men dead. Chapter 1. For the men and women of the south, the north was extremely cold even during the summer months. Snow appeared as the weather desired. It didn't matter if it was summer, autumn, or spring. If the weather and the gods so desired, the snow would eventually cover the ground completely, reaching a considerable depth that would prevent a horse from moving normally. It should be noted, however, that in autumn and winter, snowfall was extremely heavy, with the long winters being at their worst, claiming hundreds of victims across the length and breadth of Westeros. However, Westeros was now experiencing a long summer that had softened the weather in the north, although not enough for its people to put aside the overwhelming and dense clothing with which they covered their bodies, always wearing skins of really hairy animals like bears or wolves, and covering their hands with warm gloves when required. And a long summer was preceded by a much longer, much harsher winter. If the summer had lasted almost 10 years, the winter would last the same number of years or even exceed that number by several more, extending the suffering both north and south of the neck, where temperatures and weather weren't as cruel or even worse than those in the north. Winter is coming. The Stark family motto was not only present in Winterfell, the Starks' place of origin, but it was present in every noble settlement and person who lived above the neck and had survived the harsh northern winters, where men and women were less demure, wilder, more willing to settle for a confrontation with axe in hand, as true descendants of the first men who came to Westeros before the formation of the Seven Kingdoms, and the Northern Kingdom was controlled by the Iron Throne, or rather, by whoever sat on it. Although the old customs had not been lost. Due to the death of Lord Eddard Stark, Regent of Winterfell, Warden of the North and Hand of the King, for alleged treason and defamation of the crown and the royal family, the North rose up in arms against the men who to them were mere strangers, men and women who had killed their own. The actions of the Stark eldest son, Robb Stark, and his mother, Lady Catelyn Stark formerly Tully, had caused and maintained the war with the Queen Regent's family, to the point where more claimants to the crown had appeared within the same royal family, albeit on the side of the deceased father. Stannis Baratheon had named himself king on Dragonstone alongside his sworn lords, being guided, according to gossip, by an exotic woman who seemed to worship a strange god and who had led the late king's brother to distance himself from the Seven and all they stood for, being shrouded in shadow if any of the Seven believing Septons were asked. For his part, being much less devout than Stannis and remaining loyal to the Seven, the youngest of the three Baratheons showed himself to be much more liberal, much more loved by the people than his older brother and than Robert himself, who died painfully when he was skewered by a huge boar during a hunt. Renly demonstrated this love by being the king who was followed by 100,000 swords, 100,000 horsemen, and surpassed his brother's offensive by having the Stormlands and Highgarden under his banner, demonstrating that he would be the king when the capital fell and the usurpers were eliminated. This was the scene in Westeros when a stranger from a distant land arrived at the heavy gates of Winterfell wearing only fine robes, revealing skin that was neither white nor tanned. It was a slightly bluish hue, indicating that the person was slowly dying of frostbite. Or so the Maester of Winterfell estimated when the young man was carried to one of the castle's chambers, where old Luwin cared for him while he rested and regained his color, thanks to the warmth of the room. Luwin estimated that the man was from across the narrow sea, possibly far beyond the Summer Isles, and probably from Essos. If Luwin was allowed to guess, he came from beyond the east itself, from the lost islands in the eastern seas that no one had explored and no one knew about. To Maester Luwin's surprise, the young man brought to the castle by Sir Roderick Castle's guards began to show signs of improvement within 5 days of being under his care, displaying slightly tanned skin 10 days after the care began. It was strange for a stranger to come so far north, unaware of the risks of traveling without a horse, without winter clothing, and wearing only what looked like a doublet too long to seriously protect its owner's body. Luwin actually had to alter the man's clothes to leave him with ones more suitable for his stay in Winterfell, though he had no doubt he would miss them. They seemed like overly expensive clothes. Luckily for the master, he didn't have to worry about the man and could give an estimate of what he was doing just from what he had in his bag. It was possible that the man could be mistaken for a southerner, but there were three things that stood out about him. The first was the strange clothing he had been dressed in, clothing that was of no use against the cold of Winterfell and that no one seemed to wear in the south. The second was the strange plate armor the man carried in the same pouch. This wasn't armor like the ones worn south of the neck, like the ones knights in service to southern lords displayed in jousts, tournament clashes, or war skirmishes. This didn't have iron or leather forming the torso, but rather two plates held together by fine steel threads that seemed to join the breastplate over the man's torso. There was also a mask, a helmet, shoulder guards, and a skirt that were all too strange. And the third was the sword that was attached to the armor. It wasn't a two-edged sword, a bastard sword, or a short sword used within Westeros. From what Sir Roderick said of the sword itself, the blade had only one edge, not two like the swords of Westeros. It also took on a slightly curved shape and was thinner than a tempered double-bladed sword, making it much faster and better suited to slashing and penetrating than blocking or shattering armor. Even Sir Roderick could only describe the sword as strange and beautiful. With its white handle, black guard with a gold rim, and light ornamentation on the handle and scabbard, it was truly exotic, and the old master at arms in Castellan of Winterfell could swear that the sword would be worth a fortune if anyone ever decided to buy it or the man decided to sell it. Finally, on the 15th day, the foreign man began to wake up. His eyelids began to flutter with the effort they were making to open, to allow their owner to see where they were. When they finally opened after a few seconds, the young man didn't seem to show any confusion or hesitation at the stone ceiling that greeted him or the cawing of the crows flying across the clear sky, allowing the rays of sunlight to enter through the window, as if they were the cause of the guest's awakening. He soon moved to sit on the edge of the bed, his eyes looking down at his own feet. There was no fear of losing any appendage or limb in his gaze, there was only relief and calm like the sea itself. "I hope you woke up feeling better than when you arrived," the master's tired, raspy voice was what made the man stop looking at his feet. "I'm not sure you understand my language. We'll find a way to understand each other so we can help you." Luwin expected to find a bit of confusion, some frowns, and some amused grimaces that the late Lord Stark's children would surely enjoy. However, the master saw a small smile touch the blue-eyed man's lips, as if this were amusing, though Luwin didn't see the amusing aspect of the situation. Could it be because of his age? "Don't worry, sir. I understand Westeros. My parents' tutors taught me several languages." Where Luwin tried to see a problem, the master found there was no such problem, it had only been in his imagination. And the old man had to admit that the boy spoke the language of Westeros too well and fluently, as if he had been born there and had never been a stranger to the gates of Winterfell. And if someone added the golden blonde hue of his hair, Luwin had no doubt he could pass for a Lannister or one of their bastards. Although the blue eyes that represented the children of the Stormlands made for a truly curious combination for the master. "And my clothes, good sir. You may call me Luwin. The clothes you wore at the gates of Winterfell were discarded by our men. They were worn. There were some scratches in the fabric, bloodstains, and mud we noticed recently." Luwin expected the man to act angry. Instead, the golden-haired foreigner simply shrugged, looking at him with those two eyes that looked like two enormous sapphires. "Clothes are clothes. By the gods of fortune, I was able to reach land before drowning." "Drowned, my lord? Did you come in some kind of vessel, if I may ask?" "That's right, old Luwin. I came on an old ship that eventually perished. I think near what they call the Iron Islands, where I must say too many pirates and scoundrels have gathered for my liking." The man massaged the back of his neck. His blonde hair reached his shoulders and gave the man a fierce appearance, almost like a Northman, from what Luwin deduced when he saw him. "And of course, I came here by chance of my own gods. If I hadn't had the help of Susanoo, I probably would have drowned in the narrow sea." Luwin had not heard much about gods beyond the known lands, but the old master assumed that all lands had their own gods with strange names, fantastic stories, and superhuman powers brought to nature. "And you walked here? It's good to walk. As a son of Bishamontan, I must represent what a warrior must do in battle." The man spoke with pride, from what Luwin could sense as he listened. And he had to say it was like watching any follower of the warrior speak of the Seven and the very god they profess their faith to in all its splendor. "Any reason you decided to come to Winterfell?" A raven flew through the window, and Luwin took what appeared to be a letter bearing the seal of another northern lord to whom they should answer, or rather, Brandon should. It's strange to have foreigners in these lands if they're not southerners. And war has broken out in Westeros. Luwin tried to verify the man's words, to discern his hidden intentions. However, the man's blue eyes sparkled at the mention of war. It was like watching a child confronted with a new toy, something that completely caught his attention. The sight reminded the master of Bran. The boy seemed more interested in his feat when he got into mischief than in his lady mother's reprimand. Ore brings fortune, the man murmured, his eyes darting around the room. It was a modest room. A cot, a desk, and furs covering the bed. Surprisingly, his feet were protected from the cold granite floor by bearskins. But I didn't come to Winterfell for the war. If I had wanted, I would have opted for the south, I suppose. There was little chance that the north of the Seven Kingdoms would be attacked by Lannister men or allies of the crown. No one wanted to march into lands ruled by strange gods, those they called the Old Gods, gods far colder and stranger than the seven to whom the south had surrendered. And Luwin had to admit that the man was right. Had he wanted to, he would have lent his sword to any of the lords battling in the Riverlands or the lands of Casterly Rock to Tywin Lannister and his bannermen. And it would probably be far more feasible for anyone to serve the lion than the wolf. Casterly Rock's money was plentiful, and Tywin was one of the fiercest generals who could give any other commander on the board a hard time. Although the presence of 100,000 swords at Renly's service favored the younger Baratheon, if you ask Luwin. I'd just say I strayed if I had to explain. Though I suppose my gods want me here, I have ended up in this bed, old master. Intense blue eyes stared into the wise, weary eyes of the old master. Luwin would admit, only if asked, that those eyes mesmerized him, as if he were being dragged to the bottom of an immense sea until he drowned. And he didn't feel better until the stranger looked away and released his own gaze. You follow some strange Eastern gods, good sir. Haha, I suppose everyone is a stranger to any outsider outside one's religion. He licked his lips. He hadn't felt hunger or thirst until that moment, but now his stomach was growling, and his mouth was growing dry and almost cracking. I'm sorry about this, good master. May I get you something to eat and drink? While he had been unconscious, Luwin had taken care to keep the stranger's body somewhat nourished, but it was not the same as a good solid meal and good wine, as he had often heard Sir Roderick's men or the weapons master himself recommend. If the stranger was hungry and thirsty, Luwin would provide him with some food, clothing, and shelter until he could fend for himself or wished to leave them. Good sir, Luwin turned around in the doorway. He fixed his eyes on the blond man. What is your name? Using his index finger, the man scratched his cheek as he considered how to answer that question. He could feign memory loss, or perhaps use a false name, a Westerosi one. But his clothes or his behavior were not typical of Westeros or Essos, as the master surely knew. Ah, that's rude of me. Luwin's head tilted back slightly as the young man stood. He was enormous, perhaps close to 6 feet 2 if you ask the master. You may call me Naruto if you please. Naruto, of the Uzumaki Clan. Chapter 2. Brandon Stark could be seen as an unfortunate young boy. Due to a fall that was all too freakish, at least for the inhabitants of Winterfell, the boy had lost the use of his lower body, something that had kept the lad in a depressed state for some time, at least until Tyrion Lannister provided him with a way to ride again, which revived young Bran's spirits, and he soon began riding normally again. Although due to the growing enmity between the Lannisters and the war in the south, Brandon's work had focused on that of Lord of the North, the Lord of Winterfell, in the absence of his mother and his older brother, who was named as king in the north and a traitor to the crown and attempted usurper, although the only interest of the northerners and the river lords was only independence, the march of the Seven Kingdoms, and to be ruled only by Robb and his offspring. As Lord of Winterfell and aided by Sir Roderick and Maester Luwin, Bran had been receiving the northern lords in the halls of Winterfell, at the request of both to act as a sort of hand of the king, as the lords and people of the north had come to Winterfell for aid and advice, and for the Lord of Winterfell to intervene in the affairs of their people. Of course, Bran wasn't acting alone in making a decision. His mother, Catelyn Stark, hadn't traveled south, leaving Winterfell without a ruler. Bran was barely 10 years old. A small boy without full bodily function, he was always accompanied by Summer. As Lady of Winterfell, Catelyn had taken it upon herself to ensure that decisions didn't fall on the shoulders of one of her sons. They might be future bannermen for Robb, but they weren't ready in their mother's eyes. Because of this, important decisions involving Winterfell and the management of its resources were always overseen by Maester Luwin and Sir Roderick. The old knight was, in Lady Catelyn's absence, the Castellan of Winterfell. Both Summer and Bran had been paying much more attention to the special guest from Winterfell than to the lord's business in the last few days, and many of the lords even spoke of the stranger who was accompanied by some of Winterfell's men during his stay, now dressed in clothes much more appropriate for his time in the lands north of the neck, the only notable thing about the man being his hair and eyes, two characteristics that did not belong to people descended from the first men. Those followers of the old gods. The stranger had become a recurring theme in the court of Winterfell to the point that a letter was sent to the Riverlands, to Riverrun, the current meeting point of the young wolf's forces and his bannermen, reporting the presence of a person from the other side of the narrow sea, from lands so far away that they are not known to the Maesters of the Citadel, or at least there was not too reliable information, if they asked Luwin. The Maester of Winterfell had requested all possible information about those inhabitants beyond Essos, those who lived in the uncharted lands of the east. And what was sent to him could be considered a fable, a story to tell children at night, to amaze them. According to the books used to obtain the information, the men and women who lived in the east, on the other side of the uncharted lands, had strange customs, rituals in which the firstborn were placed in service to the nine, as the main cults of those strange people were called, almost similar to the seven. The people on the other side of Essos and the Shadowlands had countless gods, as the stranger had mentioned to the old master. However, there was the cult of the nine, where firstborn sons were sent into the service of one of the cults, as well as educated and trained like any eldest son. The difference that these firstborn had with the firstborn of Westeros, besides the fact of being trained by strange priests, was that they lost all rights to obtain any wealth from the family, passing the succession to the second son or daughter of the family. Those clans gave equal importance to men and women. They didn't separate succession rights or diminish the importance of a daughter within the noble families of the clans beyond Essos. Great women led what the outsider called an empire, the same one that a woman had currently been leading for several decades, ever since her childhood. But the visitor from Winterfell's explanation, Luwin began his own manuscript on the customs of those people. Naruto was, to the master's surprise, happy to help, beginning by admitting that firstborn sons were trained and educated by the nine, serving the cults and the imperial family with honor for many years. In this part, the stranger added something more to the delight of Luwin and the citadel soon. Families, including peasants, sent their firstborn sons and daughters to be educated by one of these orders, and it was mandatory for all to have a second son or daughter who would actually carry on the family name. Those who joined the nine detached their lives from the families to which they belonged, turning the family name into a mere reference to where they had once belonged. Hearing this and recalling the foreigner's introduction, Luwin realized that Naruto was a firstborn of the Uzumaki family. The young man had mentioned his family name as if it were merely a given, as if he were serving the family and not participating in what it did. Of course, this increased Luwin's interest in the foreigner's history and culture, seeing Naruto as if he were a toy to him and he were a little boy, which seemed to amuse the young blonde every afternoon they spent together. Sir Roderick had agreed to the stranger's stay when the young wolf and his mother, especially the latter, had considered it. Since the attempted assassination of young Brandon by a Lannister paid assassin, Catelyn had been very careful about who entered Winterfell Citadel, who lived near her children, and who she allowed within the Stark household. During the War of the Five Kings, as the conflict had been named, any stranger could be a sword paid for by the enemies, by those who killed Eddard Stark and brought agony to the ruling house of the North, the one that tried to stop the enormous veracity of the Lannisters. It was young Brandon who finally entered his mother and brother's shell. Supported by Luwin, despite Roderick's protests that the maester was supporting the young lord in a childish and dangerous idea, Bran managed to allow the stranger to remain within the walls of Winterfell as long as he wished, no longer with a guard following him everywhere like a wild and dangerous dog, and allowing the blonde to wield his strange sword again, something that seemed to make the young man's eyes sparkle. Giving him the appearance of a child in front of a candy store. "So, are you a knight? Or like a member of your empress's royal guard?" Those questions came from young Brandon Stark, who looked at the stranger with shining eyes, expectant of the answers and the possibility that his new friend would be like a knight. It was worth noting that the young lord of Winterfell had generated appreciation for the stranger. Within Winterfell, and among the lords who came to visit at the request of his mother or brother, sometimes to swear allegiance to the Northern Crown, the only person who hadn't looked at him with pity was Naruto. The blond man's always bright eyes were warm and kind, always with a glint of mischief present. "You may call me a knight if you like, young Bran." The strange sword lay unsheathed across the man's lap. Like any sword, no matter how strange, the sword the stranger had brought needed care and maintenance. "We are not a party to the decisions of the Empress or her council. We are not allies of the imperial family or any other noble. As members of the Nine, we do not take sides in the civil wars of our people." "Oh. So you're like the members of the Night's Watch, back on the wall." Bran's sharp mind came to the conclusion in just a few seconds. The Night's Watch was the closest thing the young man could find to the cult of the Nine, as they were a kind of monk warrior who didn't support any king or side with any noble who tried to rebel against them. And it was where his bastard brother, Jon Snow, currently was. "We can have wives, children, and lands, Bran. It's not that simple." The sword's blade flashed a faint blue-black hue, slicing through the steel like a burning flame. "We can live lives outside the cult, but we'll always be part of the cult. We're just cut off from our family." The cult of the Nine was strange to anyone in Westeros, and at the same time it was something fascinating, at least for curious people like Bran or those interested in knowing how the old Maester Luwin worked. "So, they just took you away from your family?" "You can look at it that way, yes. Some have even pointed out that everything was taken from us unfairly. There were a few members who deserted and were hunted down like dogs." The blade disappeared into the sheath and a click was heard as the guard hit the top of the sheath. "I see it simply. I'm living the life I want to live and where my gods have led me. They are always in my prayers. Don't you feel sorry? Bran's brow had furrowed into an annoyed grimace. He would miss his mother and brothers. He already missed them. Arya and Sansa are far away, in the queen's hands. Rob is at war and my mother is in Riverrun. And I feel sad without them. Naruto remained silent as he wrapped the sword in a dark cloth. He listened to the boy's words for a few seconds, noticing the sadness in his voice, understanding what Bran was saying. Grief for a family. The Nine had been his family the moment he opened his eyes and learned to wield a sword. But he could understand the boy's mentality, for he was only a 10-year-old brat, a boy separated from his family by the war, which killed his father and dismembered his family. Yes, he could understand that mentality and pain. It's the step toward becoming a man, Brandon Stark. Was it your dream to be a knight? The dark northern clothes made Naruto's skin, eyes, and hair stand out more than they would in the south. Sir Roderick was kind enough to allow the blacksmith at Winterfell to make him a military outfit, which included the Stark symbol in a small area of his breastplate. A dream that cannot be fulfilled. Is that so? The foreigner's mind flashed with an image of a member of his generation who had nearly lost his way, all because of a serious injury that damaged his back. However, she made him walk again, able to walk among the living and wield a sword once more. What do you mean? The sunlight had begun to turn red. The star was setting between the trees and the high walls of Winterfell, causing the darkness to slowly spread like vipers toward Winterfell's main building, the one from which the Starks had ruled for generations, since the age of the first men. I can't guarantee anything, Brandon Stark. Even with my friend, that was a chance guided by the gods. Back injuries could lead a person down a path filled with pain, suffering, and constant tears. Naruto met one such man. And he saw how, thanks to the best doctor in the world, he was able to walk again, to wield a sword. I had a friend in the same situation as you. He hurt his back so badly he could barely walk. He was mobile, unlike yours. But the woman who healed him is the best doctor anyone could ask for. She turned a negative chance into a positive. She could give you back the use of your legs, and you could be a knight. Although, everything is in the hands of the gods. That was hope. Like a dagger, the stranger's words entered little Bran's mind and heart, warming them, filling them with hope, something that seemed to have been lost since the beginning of the war that was ravaging Westeros, burning and destroying its lands. The little boy's dark eyes glittered at that revelation. Even the oldest masters of the Citadel would have left a child to his fate, giving up on searching for a cure. He might still be crippled, as Naruto was telling him, but there was a huge difference. He was giving him a path, a small bit of hope. And he wanted to take it, even if it was even more painful to see himself still without his legs. It could be painful. Brandon and Naruto knew it could be. The older had given the younger a small light, a path illuminated by the light of hope. But that could soon disappear as if blown away by the wind, as if it were dust and ash. Good. If I ever see that woman, I want to see if I can walk again. There was determination in the young Lord of Winterfell's words. His fingers tightened on the leather of his trousers, and his lips pressed into a thin white line. Brandon Stark could be a knight or Bran the cripple. Those were his two choices. If all goes well, I could bring her to Westeros. Naruto took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, refreshing northern air. The last thing you lose is hope. Chapter 3. The Ironborn had watered their home with blood. Pirates, bandits, thieves, and murderers. The drowned god had his laws, and the Ironborn followed them with a firm stride, the resolve as sharp as a sword, and the strength of a mighty warship. For generations, the Iron Islands had been home to pirates who ravaged Westeros with their raids, taking whatever they wanted by the Iron Law, with whatever bloodshed was necessary. If an Ironborn wanted something, they took it with their might, overpowering others, trampling them until they remembered who was in charge. The inhabitants of the Iron Islands loved strength, blood, and the wealth amassed by constant raids on their enemies, their prey. They hated those who lived in the Green Lands and could take nothing by force, winning with iron what one desired. According to the drowned god and the laws of the Iron Islands, one was to gain the favor of the god and the core followers of House Greyjoy by using one's strength, the iron one wielded, and staining that iron with the blood of one's enemies without flinching, taking everything by force without fear of death, for one would be reborn. It was this pressure that forced the only surviving son of Balon Greyjoy to rush to take what the Starks loved most. Winterfell, the Stark home, one of Robb Stark's main strongholds along with Riverrun. Theon Greyjoy led his men, despite his sister Asha's protests, toward Winterfell, intent on taking it. The main Stark force was south of the Neck, fighting off the lions and leaving the north unprotected, just enough time for the Ironborn to take what the wolf left behind and rise as kings of the Isles in the north, with all the strength the drowned god had given them. It was a very appetizing fruit. For generations, Winterfell had been the home of the Starks and their descendants, the main gathering place for the northern lords, when their lord called. It was an iconic place, a site that represented stark pride and the current force that accompanied the young wolf in his fight against King Joffrey Baratheon's forces to recover his sisters and separate the Riverlands and the Northern Lands from the Iron Throne. Theon wouldn't be the only commander to move his forces toward a vulnerable point despite the downsides of such an action. Theon was, of all existing commanders, one more who decided to take the crown jewel, seizing the strongpoint from behind one of the enemies he faced. Such were the Sons of Iron. Although some might have been sane, the desire to obtain what they desired drove them to act recklessly, to face situations from which they would emerge badly or simply not at all, returning to the arms of their drowned god. This was something Asha feared in some ways. Her brother had been a hostage to the Starks and the crown for too long, softening him to the point where he was swayed by his emotions. She might want Winterfell. Anyone might want it and want to take it. But they didn't have enough men for a full, sustained takeover of Winterfell. She wouldn't be able to hold it for herself if the Starks decided to turn against them, if the Northern Lords came to aid the people of Winterfell and the Lesser Lords protected behind the thick granite walls. Despite this, Asha remained silent, letting her men and her brother's men throw hooks, scale the walls, and engage in silent combat against a few guards protecting Winterfell and any men who chose to fight for their lord. She kept silent as she climbed. She kept silent as she stabbed a swordsman too green to be considered a man. She kept silent as she walked through the grey corridors of the city and saw Theon's back before her, too broad to be a woman's and too hunched to be a real man, one who would truly die for his ideals. Is this what the Starks did for my brother? Asha Greyjoy remained silent as she felt the blood splatter her face. Using the back of her hand, she wiped her cheek and stared at the dark liquid, made even darker by the night that was protecting them. Since when had she allowed her inept brother to take the reins? Did she do it to see what he was capable of? She still didn't know the answer. When Theon mentioned the plan to her and she saw the men following him, she followed like a shadow. Silent, deadly, always glued to her master's feet, mirroring his movements. She had learned everything about Theon. His thoughts, his actions, his inflated ego. Her father had dismissed him as a mere dog who didn't know his place, and Asha could see why. Theon Greyjoy wasn't an Ironborn like her father, her uncle, and the men who followed them. Theon was a boy of the Greenlands far from the hand of the drowned god. Too soft to be a Greyjoy and too much of a fool to be a king. An exasperated sigh escaped the girl's mouth as the train of thought finally ended. Her brother was not who she had hoped for, who her father had desired. Was he taking Winterfell merely to gain fleeting merit in the eyes of Balon Greyjoy? Asha would give all the gold in the Isles that was the motive. She could bet it all and win because Theon was trying to validate himself in his father's eyes, to be a perfect son, an heir. That's not how things are, Theon, you idiot. Asha's eyes never left Theon's back. They didn't even leave when they took the stairs to the chamber of Brandon Stark, the current Lord of Winterfell, who would be her hostage, along with his 4-year-old brother. However, there was something that made him not step on the first step, that made him not follow in his brother's footsteps, and that made Theon stop halfway and look at his sister in surprise. Asha. I've lived here a lot. Bran's room is higher up, and I've already sent men after Rickon. When they're both in our hands, the guards won't fight, and the men of Winterfell will give in. There weren't enough men to fight the Ironborn. It was something Theon had told him constantly until he was hammered into his head. So who was shouting? Why did he hear some of his men cursing and swearing at the top of their lungs? If there wasn't a full guard, who was fighting them, and why weren't there more men accompanying them? Asha looked from the foot of the steps at her brother. I'm not as foolish as you to underestimate the men and women of Winterfell, Theon. Just go ahead with your plan to take the Stark children. I'll see to it that there isn't a contingent of Ironmen on our trail, as we had hoped. Theon and Asha's contingent from the Isles wasn't massive, only a couple hundred men, all of them too proud to pass up the opportunity to claim they had taken Winterfell under the command of the Iron King's sons, Balon Greyjoy. But though they were few in number, they vastly outnumbered the defenders and had the strength and skill to keep up with the few guards stationed at Winterfell. So why didn't they follow Asha and Theon to the Lord's room? The Ironmen were men and women raised under laws and beliefs where strength and taking what was wanted by iron were paramount. Within the islands, there could have been perfect fighters, men and women as strong and feisty as Eddard Stark, Sandor Clegane, or Gregor Clegane himself when it came to fighting their enemies. But there were also such fighters outside the islands, some even trained like demons and monsters. Blood stained the floor and walls of the grey granite corridor. Greyjoy's followers stood 20 paces from their target, swords and axes drawn, doubt reflected in the gleam of their eyes. Between the handful of Greyjoy men and their target, a dozen bodies could be seen lying scattered across the corridor in huge pools of fresh blood. It was even possible that a member was scattered about, separated from its owner. The cloud of steam rose to the ceiling. This is a mess, hands stained with blood, chest muscles splattered with red drops and the occasional piece of flesh. Iron Men they call you. Is a nickname really necessary for mere pirates? Using his right hand, the foreigner brushed back his hair, dyeing it red. "When are you going to start being good fighters, bastards? Come on." The Sons of Iron moved, though not all of them. They charged at Naruto, weapons drawn, shouting insults at the half-naked man blocking their path. Any other man or woman would have wet their pants. He simply stomped his feet, feeling the cold granite, and swung his arm swiftly at the first assailant, smashing the man with a right hook that shattered his nose and his lower jaw as if it were made of glass, creating a crunch that made some flinch as they saw bones protruding from their comrade's chin. Grabbing the man by the collar of his doublet, he shoved him in a subtle motion against the second man, knocking the unconscious first and second attackers against the wall, allowing him to move out of the way as the third man's sword came down on him, trying to cut him like a piece of butter. That move was devastating for the third man. Naruto's hands moved, and in a second, the Son of Iron's sword was impaling the two men on the wall, leaving the third unarmed and with his wrist shattered. "Arg. You bastard son of a bitch." Light on his feet, whip-like arms. Naruto's eyes locked on the third attacker, the man with the shattered wrist. He didn't let him reach for his knife. He moved and slammed his knee into the man's face, sending him stumbling, perfect for him to whip out his leg and slam it into the man's neck, right against his Adam's apple, with such force that the blow made him choke and fall to his knees, both hands going to his neck. "You've killed these good people." A rustling sound made the remaining members shift their gaze to the strange man facing them. It was clear to everyone that he wasn't a northerner and that he was much more similar to a Lannister than a Stark. "Then I'll have to follow the example of the Uchiha ghost and the fratricide. I'll have to kill all of you." The decision reached the ears of the Sons of Iron, and a shiver ran through their bodies, feeling an icy cold that stuck to their hearts, causing them to release steam from their mouths, as if the temperature had dropped too far below the ideal temperature. "What the buck?" The footsteps ceased. Another handful of men appeared on the other side of the corridor, their swords soaked in the blood of Winterfell's defenders. "Are you all crying little girls and summer boys now?" One of the men shouted, pointing at the men who had fought Naruto. "There's only one of them, and he's unarmed. If you had seen him fight, you wouldn't say the same thing, One-Eyed." One-Eyed spat out a greenish phlegm onto the granite floor. He bared his rotten, yellowish teeth and gave a mocking laugh at his companion's scream. "Ah. You're girl now, dork. Really?" The axe gleamed as the moonlight hit the blade. One-Eye began walking toward his prey. "I'm going to have to make a man out of you, you little shit." The insult was aimed at Dork, but the axe swung towards Naruto with the intention of cutting his flesh. "At least that brat warned you and put up a fight." Blood trickled onto the cold stone. His fingers closed around the iron blade of the axe, but it didn't cut more than a sliver of skin, a mere gash on the palm of his hand. "I suppose they call you One-Eyed because of that eye patch, huh?" Naruto pointed at the eye patch covering the man's left eye, grinning fox-like. "Or is it because you're too blind? You brat bastard." The eyes of those present could never forget how that man's hand passed swiftly through the mouth of One-Eyed Man, destroying his neck as if it were nothing, cutting off any words that it wanted to come out of the mouth of the Iron Man. "That's disappointing. You're not made of iron." Naruto retracted his arm, and One-Eyed fell inert to the ground, with a huge hole, as if a spear had pierced his mouth. "Iron Men, you deserve the name Buttermen more." Dark eyes connected with blue eyes. The Shah watched that scene without witnessing a word, but fear was something that reached her even without much thought. Had a single man taken out a dozen Ironmen and held the rest back with fear? Having seen One-Eye die with a monstrous blow, and the fact that the man wasn't wearing any armor or weapons, didn't help the thoughts or fear that invaded a Shah at seeing that scene, at feeling that thirst for blood. However, her pride as daughter of Iron was above all. "Maybe a man can't kill him," she said, making herself present for her brother's men and her own. "Maybe only a woman can kill him." The Shah and Naruto exchanged glances. The woman had taken up the bloodstained short sword and axe, but he didn't make a move in the face of her threatening gesture. He just stood there, watching as the daughter of Iron walked toward him with determined steps, fear clouding his gaze. "Naruto." Bran's voice echoed. "Please stop. Stop fighting." Brandon Stark fell to the ground when he was pushed by Theon. This made the blonde growl gutturally, who allowed himself to be hit by the pommel of a Shah's sword and fell backward, like a sack of potatoes. "Winterfell belongs to the Ironborn." The Shah looked at her brother. "Idiot. If this man stands up and doesn't follow that Stark brat's orders, you'll probably get gutted before I do, idiot." Chapter 4. The cells of Winterfell were cold and dark, with a constant smell of wet foul-smelling piss clinging to the nostrils of the prisoners chained there, who were only given a small ration of food and were constantly beaten and harassed by the Ironborn, who took over rule over Winterfell. When Brandon Stark finally relented to allow the inhabitants of Winterfell, those he was to care for as their lord, to be spared by Theon's men, causing some to fall within the cells of Winterfell as if they were mere animals. The cold inside that place flooded the lungs and clung to their walls, leaving its presence evident, taking root like a germinating seed. Then, slowly, it rose to the throat and spread until it began to burn with cold, to ache as if hell had fallen to earth and as if fire were burning it from within. And finally, the cold spread to the feet. First it was the legs. They began to go numb, to tingle, to the prisoner's discomfort. Then it was the feet. They began to get cold, to lose color. And finally, when the cold reached the toes, the prisoner became someone belonging to Winterfell, a mere memory. This was Theon's intention when he unleashed the stranger into one of the cells, when he pushed him like a mere dog towards his new home with no clothes for the cold, no food, and barely covered with what appeared to be a sack of potatoes, all for his wounded pride, for seeing his men killed by a wild blonde man, for seeing Bran trying to save him. Naruto examined the walls of his new room. There was one difference between when he arrived at Winterfell and now. He was too used to the cold. His body, trained to be a weapon, had finally grown accustomed to the chill of the northern reaches of Westeros, and no matter how hard Theon tried to mold him into a dog, into merely a memory of the man he once was, he couldn't succeed. That idiot Iron Brat. The cult of the Nine was strict. They took the firstborn from each family as soon as they were born, raising them by priests in service to the Nine, and meeting their biological parents after completing the initial stage, which would be about 8 years under the tutelage of one of the Empire's cults. And the training that mere children received had killed hundreds of them, something Naruto didn't explain to Luwin or Bran when he told them about them. They were monsters for treating children as toys, mere tools, but they created the monsters that the Empire desired. He sighed. His back was pressed against a cold wall, his arms chained and adorned with thick cold almost icy iron chains. In moments like these, the scar began to ache, reminding him that it was there, marking him with the number 9 until his last breath, until he died at the hand of some enemy. "Do you think that's all?" Naruto stroked his cut cheeks. Those whisker-like scars weren't from birth, as some believed. And he wasn't the only one who bore them. All those who served the Nine were branded with those whiskers, treated as the incarnation of the demon fox, one of the Nine. Many people had found those marks an aberration, and others had adored them, especially the feminine side of the population. However, they were reminders. Along with the kanji for 9 on her back, they reminded her that she belonged to him, that she was a mere instrument and plaything of the one who was always present in everyone's nightmares. The Greyjoy, eh? He threw his head back and felt the chill of the granite. For several seconds, he closed his eyes and sighed, letting the air leave his cold lungs. "You're a beardless brat, it seems to me, an idiot hooked on this place like a cat on catnip. That will bring about your downfall." Naruto had met thousands like Theon Greyjoy. In fact, they were the most common type of person in the world, abundant in every corner from Westeros to beyond Essos. And all of them, without forgetting any of them, eventually perished without achieving their ambitions or being swallowed up by them, devoured and forgotten. Only those with the gift could win. People like the ghost and the parasite. "I was hoping you'd rebel like the dog my brother says you are." The fire lit up that dark cell, and Naruto narrowed his eyes, annoyed by the sudden change in light in the middle of the night, which forced him to cover his eyes slightly, showing his annoyance. "I could escape this place, woman. I've escaped worse places than this and only sustained minor injuries." Asha Greyjoy placed the torch in one of the available torch holders. She looked at the man who had slaughtered nearly 20 men with his own hand, unarmed, and then felled him with a blow from the pommel of her sword. But she knew it was for Brandon Stark. The Stark boy was the one who had made that man yield to her childish blow, to the mere touch of the metal of his blade. "So, if someone asked you, you would rescue the Stark boys from us?" Naruto of the Uzumaki clan stared straight into Asha Greyjoy's eyes. There was curiosity mixed with fear, admiration mixed with horror. He'd seen those looks before, in men and women, old and young. Anyone like him commanded attention when he fought. And while Theon of House Greyjoy despised him, his sister seemed to have found an interest in him. "And how are you so sure that I won't do it now, after taking your neck and breaking it using this harmless weapon?" The clinking of dark cold chains caught the attention of the Iron Daughter's dark eyes, and a smile spread across the lips of the man sitting there, his bare chest covered in scars. Her brother had sent him there to freeze to death, to let his lungs probably freeze. Asha watched him there, smiling mockingly and mischievously, holding his hands out toward her, as if she were a small child wanting to be picked up by its mother or sister. But something was off, and she knew it. The way he smiled, the way he held his arms out if she had taken his hands, he would have killed her right then and there with the chains that restricted her movement. And it was a terrifying thing for the daughter of the king of the Iron Islands and the North. I don't think it's a good idea to hold your hands right now, honestly." Naruto smiled when that tone was as shaky as a leaf in the strong wind coming off the sea. That game of being the mouse, of being the wolf in sheep's clothing, it wasn't his style at all, what he would do. He was a fighter, a conqueror, and a bloodthirsty killer. He preferred to wrap his body in fresh blood. But if he had to do it, he would do it without a second's hesitation. He was trained for it. Hahaha. The guttural laughter reverberated off the cell walls. Yeah, that's what people usually say, I guess, Miss Iron. The arms fell away, and with them the heavy chains. Why aren't you in charge of these inept people? As? The glow of amusement danced in the sapphire orbs like two wild flames. That idiot. Theon. He's a beardless brat who hasn't grown any hair on his privates and who boasts an ugly fuzz on his languid face that makes you want to drive a stake into him. Sitting back, the stranger looked directly into Asha's eyes. Yes, you think so too. Winterfell will devour you and cause the children of the god who drowned in water to perish. A twitch appeared in one of the young woman's eyebrows. Had a man insulted a god? Few men could openly insult a god, and even fewer would do so in front of that god's fervent followers. How long would that man last on the Iron Islands? No, how long would they last with him? Shocked, Asha began to think about blood, about how many Ironborn that bastard could kill with his bare hands, without a sword. How many could he eliminate with a weapon? How many could even keep up? Asha Greyjoy came to a conclusion. The man was a monster chained with butter, controlled only by a promise to a crippled child. My brother may be an idiot. But he's my brothers. Ha. Whoever understands them. Naruto scratched his head and spat at Asha Greyjoy's feet. Fine. That idiot will die. Not today, not tomorrow, but he will. His pretensions to Winterfell, to be a dream son of the North. Have you not seen it, Asha Greyjoy? The one you might have considered a brother, a son of your god, is a mere vestige of what he should have been, a child with pretensions and pretensions to swell his pride. And what do you know about my brother, foreigner? I know he is not a warrior, that he is not the kraken who would guide his home upon the wolf. The glow went from amused to intense like a stabbing dagger. I am a monster among my people. We who lie with the nine are the tools of an empire, of a family descended from our gods. Like that tool, we have seen war at ages when you only used rags for a nanny to wipe your rear. Asha Greyjoy, sister to Theon Turncloak, Theon the greatest bootlicker in Westeros, Theon the proud. You may speak or attempt to amend my words. However, Theon will die by my hand because I have stipulated it, because I so wish it as my whim toward the king of hell, toward him who are the nine. The intensity struck Asha Greyjoy. She remained silent, but those words felt like a massive mace striking her. You shouldn't fall alongside your brother, Asha Greyjoy. I won't save Bran or Rickon because I know they won't let me. I've already spoken to old Lewin. Did that bag of bones of the Maester come to see you? Do not kill him. It is not worth your life to kill a friend and advisor. The stranger's lips cracked, lacking the necessary moisture. I can kill Theon. I will propose to Bran that we free him, but his journey lies north, as the dreams he mentioned to me prophesied. Though if possible, I will be his sword and his support. I will make him grow before the long night. You're raving, now. A little. The chains fell with a thud. Asha's eyes widened. I will not hurt you. Nor is it my interest to undo what the god established for me. Fine. I've been here for a few weeks, and I know from your eyes that you plan to abandon your brother and strike out on your own, perhaps return to your father. My interest is in Riverrun, in the mother of these children, who is anxious for her offspring. Didn't you say that the crippled child would refuse and all that nonsense? Tall, standing at his full height on two legs, the blonde looked down at Asha Greyjoy, who was clearly several heads shorter than her. If you believe everything someone says, you're crazy woman. Hahaha. At this point, unable to move, Naruto planted a kiss on Asha Greyjoy's lips, much to her enjoyment and the panic of the daughter of Iron, the daughter of Balin Greyjoy. It's just the ramblings of a locked-up man, honestly. It's not like my god sent me here for some reason, and I'm the only one who'll turn the war around. Men don't do such things. Hahaha. Sanity was something Asha Greyjoy doubted her prisoner possessed. Speak of gods. Mention omens. Act like a light-bearing hero. The daughter of Iron didn't doubt the man was one of the finest swordsmen she'd ever seen, but things like the Long Night and the Walkers were beyond dispute when they were merely myths, whispers told by those who were completely insane. And she was beginning to think the man was the worst madman of all. Now, aren't you asking why I'm not in shackles? Asha looked at the prisoner's bare wrists and then into his blue eyes. That's a good question, if you ask me. Here, Asha Greyjoy could have taken several paths. Flight was on her mind, or she could have fought as a worthy daughter of the islands and her father. She could have urged the man to put those chains back on, but that wouldn't have been pretty for her. She could have even tried to persuade him. However, just like the reason she came to him in the first place, and just like how she felt about it, Asha Greyjoy dropped the heavy armor first and slowly stripped herself bare before the stranger's gaze, looking as if she had been born. For his part, Naruto of the Uzumaki clan remained silent and stoic, observing that body battered by the northern weather, soiled by the less than pristine armor, with some scars from battles and training under the gaze of lustful men. She was a daughter of nobles, a naked woman before him who looked at him, expectant like so many others, but enamored of his strength, like every woman who lived on the islands, like every follower of the Path of Iron. Although it had to be added that she desired him. It's nothing personal, man. Uchiha finally pushed Naruto down onto the cold floor of the cell and straddled him, naked as a clam, with no weapons to protect her. That prisoner could kill her, and she knew it. But I've never bucked someone from beyond Essos, someone who could take on 100 men. 1,000 and a mountain. Chapter 5. Winterfell belonged to the Starks in the north. No one who wasn't a Stark or bore their blood could walk the grey halls of the fortress calmly, as quietly as they wished, and this was something Theon Greyjoy had learned in his time as Lord of Winterfell, as an invader of the ancient city and an attacker on the true lords of that grey city. There was discomfort. There was a cold but constant feeling that bothered the invaders, forcing them to look over their shoulders at their backs, ready to be killed at any moment by anyone, including their own comrades. Were they going crazy? The North remembers. Magic had been lost with the death of the dragons. Or at least that was what was said in Westeros since the fall of the Targaryens and the last dragons, expelling what was sorcery far from the territory protected by the gods. In more remote places, they did believe in stories, there was magic, and they had the context of many events in history, of many sayings that accompanied men as mere phrases, as mere things said by the elders, but which held a hidden meaning. The men of the Iron Islands were not going to be comfortable in Winterfell, they could not be comfortable in the north as a whole. They had attacked the heart of the home of the first men, of the old gods who accompanied them. That cold feeling, if they asked the right person, was the breath of the dead watching the invaders, biding their time, waiting for their end under the swords of the Northmen. Theon was reluctant to dwell on ghost stories. His men were far more so than he. Could a place remember? Generations died, turning to dust, and few men carried their hatred back eons, rotting their souls until finally the wronged had obtained justice. The North remembers. However, those 3 words whispered by the golden-haired stranger were constantly present in the mind of Balon Greyjoy's son, as if they were a lacerating wound that would not close, that would not heal and was always present, festering and bleeding. Bucket. Winterfell has been taken. When father comes with men, we'll hold it. Theon could be as stubborn as a mule, and that stubbornness was driven vigorously by his pride, by his desire to be recognized, and by his longing to be a king, to wield the power he'd been denied when he'd been separated from his family. But those feelings were constantly at odds with his morals, with the affection he'd generated for Eddard Stark and his sons, who had once been brothers. But were they really brothers? Were they ever brothers? The doubt was always present, like a dagger stuck in his gut, twisting every time he had a glimpse of those desires. Buck Rob. I've made my decision. I'll stick with it until the end of my days. I'll take what's rightfully mine. Birthright was something Balon Greyjoy frowned upon with his aging eyes. If the current king of the Isles and the North had to choose someone as a successor, Theon had no doubt it would be Uchiha, his sister, his beloved sister. Since when could women wield such power without proper recognition? There was Cersei Lannister, the Queen Regent, but the time for powerful women passed when the laws placed men first, when the Westerosi decided to uphold the rights of a son over those of a daughter. And Theon hated that his father didn't acknowledge him, that he didn't see his accomplishments and what he'd done, that he didn't see him as a worthy successor to the kingdom they were building. Did he really abandon Robb for that? Was he really willing to fight for the name of a man who wouldn't look down on him? Theon wasn't going to back down, he wouldn't do it now. He was planting the right seeds, waiting for the right time. Obtaining Winterfell in the north for his father was just a small snack that his father, Balon, would see with eyes shining like a child with a new toy. He would be. Arg. A groan of pain caught the young Greyjoy's attention and made him rise from his seat and rush out into the corridor, worried about any attack from Winterfell's men. Due to the speed, Theon was unable to respond. He felt the blow and the blood, and soon after, the ground hitting his back. When he was able to open his eyes, he had been knocked down by a prominent headbutt that shattered his upper lip and nose, from which a suggestive amount of blood had begun to emanate and stain his chin. It was the boss. The hand fell on Theon, and his words were silenced. His previously confused and angry eyes now stared in surprise and horror at the person staring back at him, their eyes bright and amused, filled with mockery. Theon, Uchiha's brother, the sharp voice reached the young islander's ears. I'm going to see young Brandon Stark, and if you stop me, well, you'll end up like them. Using the thumb of his free hand, the stranger pointed down the hallway. Theon's wide eyes widened. A trail of blood and bodies was moving toward his bedroom door from the beginning of the corridor. None of them seemed to be breathing, and they were lying in pools of their own blood. And thank you for keeping Wado Ichimonji for me, good sir. Naruto's hand patted the katana's handle, an amused smile on his lips. I'm going to speak with the boy you're holding captive. The hand left the mouth of the former hostage and ward of Winterfell. Theon Greyjoy stood, fire blazing in his dark eyes, wiping his chin with the back of his right hand. It didn't take long for him to close his hand on the handle of his sword, unsheathing it and jabbing it into Naruto's back. "You don't think I'll let you move, do you, bastard?" he muttered, pressing the tip against the stranger's right shoulder. "Talk, idiot. You shouldn't be rude, boy. You don't know who you might mess with these days. If you want to die for your pride, for wanting Winterfell and recognition, fine. But don't lead others to your fate." Sparks flew. The clash lasted only a second, too fast for the islander's eyes to capture, and he stumbled from the force of the blow against his sword, feeling it about to fly from his grasp. When Theon finally could see, he saw the unsheathed Wado Ichimonji in his enemy's right hand, gleaming in the torchlight. It looked beautiful, as if the steel were Valyrian steel, but it was distinctly different, with a very different hue. Shit. Theon bit his tongue. He regained his balance and closed his hand around the handle of his sword, making sure he had a grip on it, that he could use it, and that it hadn't vanished like smoke, that it hadn't escaped his grasp. "I told your sister I'd kill you if you interfered with this. She should be the one leading this, not you." Theon tried to take a step, but the length of the katana prevented him from advancing toward his enemy. "You couldn't even foresee that I would escape." "Asha. Is she? Probably covered in furs, resting on the bed after we went to sleep." His teeth clenched and his jaw tensed. Naruto chuckled, amused. "She really is fierce, and she'll leave you behind, boy. She won't die trying to protect a fortress that only 1,000 men could hold. Do you really have anything in that head beyond sawdust?" The sword swung and repelled the katana in a single motion. It then closed the distance and attempted to cut flesh, finding this completely impossible. Wado Ichimonji moved as directed and deflected the Iron Sun's blade with precise precision and just the right amount of force, destabilizing Theon. "Do you want to dance, kid? I find it entertaining, if you ask me. It's been a while since I've danced, as my teacher likes to say." Teeth clenched, sweat beading his forehead. Theon Greyjoy let his breath escape between the small gaps in his teeth, spilling out over the edges of his tightly pressed lips. He never left the stranger's blue eyes. "Brother," footsteps echoed. Weapons drawn, a handful of islanders appeared in the hallway, observing the scene that awaited them, and that some, those loyal to Asha, already knew would happen. "Stop now. I gave him my word that he could speak to Brandon, but not take him." "And what did you give her in return?" Theon turned to his sister, scathing. "Your cunt." The blow reverberated off the walls of that hallway. It hadn't even been a split second. It was faster. Theon was on the floor, and Asha was waving her hand, annoyed at having wasted all that strength on a blow against her brother, although the last thing he said was completely true. "You have a few moments with the cripple, stranger." Asha's fierce, steely eyes never left her brother's down form. "I'm going to have a talk with my brother. I'm going to show him how well I was able to fight this bitch." There was division among the Ironmen who led and had taken Winterfell. It was something even a fool could sense in the air, smell, witness. The men led by and completely loyal to Asha Greyjoy had prevailed over the men who followed Theon Greyjoy's blind pride. They had done so in both numbers and strength. None of them wanted to die in the north, cut off from the sea, from who they were. Theon couldn't see that, but his sister could. "Winterfell is meant to be northern, brother. It's meant to be Stark. You've already proven your point, what you're capable of. Why can't you see that you can't defend it? Give me Stark's boys, and let's leave this place, leaving only ashes, only destruction and fire. That will be the welcome for the king in the north, the wolf who will howl in pain when he sees his home and his family destroyed." She had a point Theon refused to see or wanted to see. Pride and a desire for recognition kept him silent while his sister spoke, feeling like a child scolded by his mother or older sister. Why didn't Asha see what he saw? Why didn't she want this opportunity handed to her on a silver platter? If she didn't want to be the mistress of this place, he would be the lord. He would take the opportunity. But he wouldn't leave Bran and Rickon with Asha. Those were his pieces to play, to control the north under the pressure of his boot and steel. He spat to the side. "Fine. If that's what you want, sister," her eyes clouded with silent anger. "I'll let that hound speak to Brandon, but I won't give you the boys or Winterfell. You've lost your chance, sister. Now I'll rule the north from Winterfell. I'll be its lord." There it was again. Asha saw it in her brother's eyes. Greed, desire, longing. All of it was encouraging him to go ahead with it, to become the lord of a place that didn't want or need him, to be a mere puppet of its desires. Did her brother really not realize he was being sucked into a spiral, a whirlpool that would ultimately lead him to his very death? Asha Greyjoy took a deep breath. That was her brother, that was how he was lost. Raised in the weak ways of the Starks, her brother could never be the heir to what his father wanted to build, what his father wanted to raise against Westeros. "I'm sorry about this, brother." The sword vanished into its sheath. Asha's eyes showed sadness, a certain pain mixed with anger. Her brother had made his choice. She was making hers, always guided by what she could handle. Winterfell wasn't something she could handle, not even with an army at her service. I hope you can survive what's coming. I truly hope we can meet again and that you're a righted man. The growl came from deep in Theon Greyjoy's throat. There was his sister, rejecting him, walking away, fleeing with her tail between her legs, probably bucked by the foreigner in Winterfell's employ. And what did that matter? He had his men, he had his swords. He was going to keep fighting and keep Winterfell for his father, for himself. Run away, sister. Be that foreign bastard's bitch. Chapter 6. The sky had darkened and torrential rain had begun, causing the rivers to rise. The summer days were being forgotten, overshadowed by the cold autumn winds that ensured a freezing winter, and by rain and dark days that made the time of war much more sinister and dark than it had been at the beginning. Those boys who had been born in the summer, who took up their swords after the pleasant warm summer wind, watered the fields of Westeros with their blood, defending the ideals they believed to be right. The weariness had reached the lands of Westeros, leaving the 5 kings scattered throughout the 7 kingdoms, although their number had been reduced. The battles of the lords of the north and their king brought blood to the west, burning and fighting against the faithful followers of the lion, thus forcing the lords of the rivers to create an iron defense against the men who returned to the west with the intention of stopping the young wolf, who continued fighting against the enemies of his family with the intention of obtaining victory, reaping a fame that fell on his shoulders despite his young age. However, the most important and crucial turning point of the war occurred at 3 key points. One of them was the confrontation at Storm's End, where young Renly Baratheon was killed and a large portion of his men joined Stannis' forces, giving him military power comparable to that of his enemies and multiplying his own forces at Dragonstone by hundreds. The next major event was the war at the Blackwater, which pitted Lannister and Baratheon soldiers supporting Joffrey as king against raiders led by Stannis Baratheon, who was determined to take his nephew's head and depose the Lannisters and take the Iron Throne. This led to the final event that decided the War of the 5 Kings. Joining forces with the Tyrells, Tywin Lannister clashed with a force of over 50,000 swords against Stannis' rearguard, causing some of Renly's former followers to turn against him to follow Renly's ghost, who rode alongside the Lannisters to install Joffrey as king of Westeros and Tywin as his hand of the king. The confrontation left the Lannisters and the men of King's Landing victorious, forcing Stannis to flee with his tail between his legs like a winded dog, like a simple dying man who would not fight again for a while. Joffrey had important alliances. Highgarden, Sunspear, Casterly Rock and Storm's End supported the young king in his rise and gave him the greatest military force within Westeros. Robb Stark had lost many of his swords and the only alliance he had, rumor had it, was lost to dust. And the River Lords were hurt at the start of the war. Robb Stark's support dwindled, leaving the young wolf without the men for an assault. And the Greyjoys didn't help the Starks. The enormous fleet that Theon promised the young wolf ended up attacking the north itself, enveloping the northerners in the tentacles of the Kraken and burning and destroying the settlements of the northern lords, even going so far as to capture Winterfell itself. The news spread like wildfire. The major cities quickly learned of the fall of Winterfell, and it wasn't long before the news reached Riverrun, the current rallying point for the rebel forces against Joffrey, the king's followers in the north. The Riverrun guards had been eyeing the former Lady of Winterfell with concern. The news from the north was not good, worse even than the news of the war, and it had pushed Lady Catelyn Stark to make a pact with one of the least honorable men in the world. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the one who was said to have copulated with her sister, Joffrey's biological father in every sense of the word. And this action, prompted by the fall of Winterfell and the disappearance of Bran and Rickon, led to the woman being locked in a tower, accompanied only by her dying father, since her room was next to his. Despite being denied entry to the chamber, a lone rider had recently arrived at the gates of Riverrun, carrying a scroll he would not yield to any soldier, dressed as a Northman. But the Northmen who remained with Lady Stark didn't recognize him, and that golden hair wasn't Northman's, and was much more Lannister-like. "My lady," after several long seconds, the guard spoke again. Sir Edmure Tully was the one who gave in to the strange young man who insisted on seeing his sister, doing so with such vehemence that he couldn't stop him. In fact, the man himself had stated that he would kill Edmure if he didn't see Catelyn Stark. The man wishes to see her. He says it's urgent, from the north. Catelyn Stark had been absorbed for a long time, her father's old hand in hers, thinking of her lost daughters, her dead sons. All she had left was Robb and her daughter Sansa, even though she was a prisoner of the Lannisters. She had the vague promise from Brienne and Jaime that they would return her to her, that she could have her back. Why should she have to attend to matters of the north? Her son was the king. Send him and Desmond. Let no one else bother us. Catelyn Stark's face seemed to have aged 50 years in that time of war. How many days had they been fighting? How many days had they been trying to recover what was lost? Catelyn had given up. She had lost her husband and her sons. Now, the Stark home was taken by that brat Theon, whom she had wanted Rob to keep close to keep old Balin under control. My lady. The voice that reached Lady Stark's ears had a strange accent, one she didn't recognize and hadn't heard before. That told her he wasn't from Westeros, that he wasn't from the West, but it didn't guarantee he wasn't a murderer. Slowly, Catelyn turned to see the young man standing behind her. He had shaggy blonde hair, vibrant sapphire eyes, and strange scars across his face, his cheeks bleached white by the northern chill. Beyond the strange sword at his waist, Catelyn noted that he dressed like a Northman, like her son Robb, bearing the Stark mark on his breastplate. And it suited him. Did you have a message for me? Lady Stark's attention turned to Hoster Tully, her old and worn father who was about to meet the stranger, about to leave the world of the living. That is so, my lady. A scroll appeared in the woman's peripheral vision. Catelyn sighed and took it in one hand, straightening it with a swift movement. I'm sorry. The eyes darted around, rereading those letters a dozen times before they turned away and looked at the young man who stood there, plowing, his right hand on the handle of his strange sword, his left hand stretched out at his side. Is this true? Luwin himself signed the parchment so you would believe me, Lady Stark. I could not move with the children, but I could assure you that their destiny is to live. They would not die by Theon's hand, for both escaped even shortly after I left. The dead children are not Brandon or Rickon Stark, my lady. There was life in Lady Stark's clear eyes behind those words. There was a fire that burned brighter, more intense, from the embers of the flames. There was a glow in Catelyn Stark's watery eyes, spilling tears down her worried lined cheeks. Thank you, thank you. Naruto took the woman as she hugged him, wetting the tanned leather of his armor with tears of joy, of the small hope pushed by the new and old gods, by the gods of the East, to whom he prayed. Good men died, my lady. Sir Roderick, Maester Luwin, and 2,000 Northmen, according to my sources. Winterfell is in ashes, with the dark smoke of the fire rising in the northern sky, growing darker these days. The Stark home, Ned's Catelyn murmured, pulling away from the blonde man, her eyes red with tears. The walls are being rebuilt, the castles are being razed. My children are safe, hidden somewhere in the north. Hoder and a wildling are protecting them, along with the wargs and the reed children. I'm afraid so, my lady. I couldn't stay with them, and I left young Bran to decide for himself. They would be safer in the north than traveling south, albeit with reservations. Reservations. The north remembers. The frown deepened, and a cough escaped the foreign swordsman's throat. His clear blue eyes darkened, as if a storm were raging across the ocean. There were traitors in the death of the Castellan of Winterfell, and the 2,000 good men who perished in the north, Lady Stark. Men once loyal to the Starks fought with the intention of killing Brandon and Rickon, making the north their own, and driving their family from the sacred home of the first men. Their children were alive, but there were traitors among those men who had supported Ned at the time, who had supported Robb when he went south to retrieve his sisters. Was it honorable? No, but wars weren't won by honor. Her husband must have known that. She had already learned it when Ned died. Who were they, Sir Naruto? I am no knight, Lady Stark. Maester Luwin taught me a few things, but I couldn't say for sure. I didn't stay to verify who they were, and I simply sought out your children for safety before leaving with some friends I made along the way. I can only assure you that there are traitors in the king's ranks in the north, and your eldest son will be in trouble if he faces the crown with that burden. Money moved people. Catelyn Stark knew that, but she hadn't expected it, though it wasn't unusual or unprecedented. The internal conflict between the Boltons and Starks had lasted hundreds of years until they finally reached peace, and the history of the North was truly bloody, if you asked Catelyn. And with the Lannisters' victory over Stannis and Renly's death, where would interest shift? I want to thank you for this news. Lady Stark's hand closed over the parchment, crumpling it slightly as a result of the turmoil of emotion she felt, which seemed to want to clash. Are you the stranger Luwin and Bran told me about? Haha, yes, my lady, I'm that foreigner your son Brandon fell in love with. Although that's thanks to my stories and a promise. Promise? I promise to try to heal your injury, my lady, claiming that a companion of mine recovered from the same injury. I'll try to have the best doctor I know treat your injury. Though I have no promise that you'll recover. Watching Bran leap from rooftop to rooftop again, running alongside his direwolf while hearing Arya and Rickon's laughter, Sansa's complaints it was a dream, one clouded in his mind by that man's words. Could it really be possible for his son to walk again as he once did? A sigh escaped Catelyn Stark, making the swordsman's ears vibrate. We shall have you very much to thank, if I may. Catelyn bit the inside of her cheeks. Brienne of Tarth and Jaime were traveling to retrieve Sansa, to stop the Stark family from fracturing, from dying and becoming extinct. I want to ask a favor of you, even though I've only known you for a few minutes, and you've already done so much without payment for your services. But I would like you to. You want me to go to King's Landing, to obtain Sansa and everything from her, so that you can return her to the north or to your arms, yes. Massaging her neck, Naruto of the Uzumaki clan weighed that request, keeping his eyes on the lady before him. Travel south to aid one of the great houses in disgrace. It is a path full of thorns and blood that you propose to me, Lady Catelyn Stark. And I have no support from my people and I am completely alone, accompanied by my trusty sword. He patted the handle of the Wado Ichimonji under the dismayed gaze of Brandon and Rickon's mother. However, his lips stretched, twisting into a slightly sincere and mocking smile. I believe I can take it. My people have toppled homes with less than a toothpick between an old man's yellowed incisors. To aid your house and your daughter is my goal now, my lady. If you ask, my sword is at your service as payment for saving my life in a time of need. King's Landing was full of vipers, of men with hidden agendas, with daggers tucked into their clothes, ready to be used against their enemies, only intent on gaining more power, more wealth. Would you really do it? Naruto of the Uzumaki clan breathed heavily, filling his lungs with air. Was he willing to fight an army to take a child back from the hands of a queen? He swore his sword and honor to Brandon Stark of Winterfell. He swore his sword to Catelyn Stark to return what the North had given him in short order. And he had been in Uzumaki once, abiding by the laws of his family. The Lannisters always pay their debts, don't they? The Uzumaki beyond Essos, in the dark eastern lands, always keep their promises, never wavering in their path. But I ask one thing in return, my lady. Do not take the sweetest sweets. Do not accept what others accept without fear. Watch your back against those who swore loyalty to you for broken promises. The war has turned the tide, and the North no longer holds so much appeal to many. Chapter 7. King's Landing had seen better days, better times, and worse. Since the fall of the Targaryens nearly 20 summers ago, the Battle of the Blackwater was the second battle some of the royal city's inhabitants had seen, the second time they had fought to protect their homes. Although it was the first time the city's inhabitants had achieved victory, they celebrated the deaths of their enemies, even though it had been almost a month. After the Battle of the Blackwater, titles and awards were bestowed upon the right people, lining the pockets of hundreds and giving rise to many who were merely fighters, occupying important positions in the city and holding titles that supported them, giving them the strength to continue fighting another day in that fateful war. It was no surprise to anyone when Lord Tywin took over as Hand of the King, pushing aside his younger son Tyrion and taking charge of the city, pulling the strings like an uncrowned king, like a true man in command of hundreds, thousands of men and women in his service, being the head of the lion. Under Tywin's command and with the promises and efforts of the Master of Coin, the prizes shifted to the new allies of the Lion and the Heart. Highgarden, as well as its leading men, received generous rewards for their services, revoking any rebellion status and erasing any stain that Renly Baratheon had left on the House of the Rose. One of the main prizes was the betrothal between Joffrey and Margaery Tyrell, the only daughter of the Lords of Highgarden, Renly Baratheon's previous wife, and, of course, the one in charge of granting 50,000 swords to anyone she married. Margaery's twin brother, Sir Loras Tyrell, was awarded a position within the Kingsguard so he could always be by his sister's side, becoming one of the new swords in the king's service and fighting alongside his sworn companions. Those were some of the rewards for the Southern Rose, for which she changed her cloak according to circumstances. But Margaery was loved by all. As a daughter of Highgarden, the young woman had won the hearts of all men and women thanks to her kindness, breaking the trade siege that King's Landing had had until that moment and appearing at the head of a caravan delivering food, herself leading the way. Of course, men like Tywin saw this as an opportunity and took it to do something his grandson had refused to do. Give the family the crown and have the people on the side of the crown and the Lannisters, something Tywin would do by marrying the Tyrell girl to his brazen grandson. Tywin was a man with a vision. He wanted his legacy sitting on the Iron Throne, to let his house be recognized even above the other six, above the dragonlords who once reigned in Westeros, making all bow under his sharp and disdainful gaze, something the old lion would never forget and would never allow again. His grandson had made many mistakes. He was the one who caused that conflict by putting Ned Stark in the black cells, and because of that, his mad wife lashed out at his youngest son, Tyrion. And he should have stood by. He was Lord Tywin, Lord of Casterly Rock, with enough money to drag out that war for the next 100 years. Of course, that slap forced him to fight Stark's whelp and regain his lost honor. And he was determined to ensure that it wouldn't happen again, to ensure that his grandson wouldn't make the mistake of evoking a second War of the Five Kings. With the young wolf currently fleeing the west amidst the news from the north, with Stannis hiding on Dragonstone, and with Balon Greyjoy fighting the wolf, Tywin had enough. With the right moves and the right ears, he would end this war within the year, their heads on pikes, blood streaming from the weapon without fear, without restraint. Tywin looked at that map. The young wolf had wreaked havoc in the west, but he'd lost two things. The loyalty of the Frees in the north, which was being invaded by Greyjoy pirates. Should he press the wolf now that they were without men and allies? He could do that, but there were plenty of other things in the game to use to hurt his enemies and get what he wanted. Lord Tywin, a Lannister guardsman, interrupted the old lion's musings, bringing the man's sharp eyes to bear on him, causing him to swallow. There is an emissary from Riverrun who wishes to speak with you. You have been insistent. Persistent was a word the guard wouldn't use to describe what the man had done, what he had said he was willing to do. But he was no idiot. He wasn't going to press the issue or even mention the blonde man's words, how he had threatened the king's life just to gain an audience with the hand of the king, how he had impaled 2 guards, simply because they tried to stop him. Insistent. I said no one was to bother me. Tell my brother Kevin to take care of that insistent man. Tywin looked again at that map of Westeros, with the pieces placed on the board, representing the enemy's movements, their next objectives. I don't think he wants that, my lord Hand. He's said things, he's shown things. He impaled Lambert and Carl with a spear when they tried to stop him, my lord. Now I must speak to their families. There was both irritation and interest in the old lion's eyes. He was irritated by the guard, by his refusal, but he was interested in this emissary from Riverrun. How did he even make it through the gate and walk down the street to his chambers? How was he, an enemy, inside King's Landing, moving without anyone wanting to stop him or trying? Send him in, the Lord of Casterly Rock relented, looking toward the window with his dark and green eyes. And let no one disturb us. Or, on this occasion, I'll have to reinforce my point with a pike in your head. Yes, sir. Normally, Tywin Lannister wouldn't have given in to a simple guard's request. But to see a man so interested in seeing him that he even impaled 2 of his men. Well, it was odd that the gold cloaks hadn't intervened. Tywin wouldn't do anything. In fact, he would simply meet the man and have what he wanted from his lips in a few moments. Lord Lannister. If Tywin was impressed, he didn't show it. His green eyes remained focused on the door, looking at the young man, who stood a little over 6 feet tall, wearing dark armor that hailed, if he wasn't mistaken, from the very north. The direwolf, a detail on his collar plate, was enough of a clue for him. I'm not used to receiving people under pressure, under threat of bloodshed, in my halls. However, I'm impressed and intrigued. Why would a northerner go to that extent? Naruto of the Uzumaki clan looked at those ornate walls, that enormous double bed that was fit for a king, that floor full of velvet and that table with a huge map of Westeros being held by a golden cup filled with wine, with gems shining under the light of the torches. Night was falling. This is the first time I've been called a Northman, Lord of Lannister. I'm not even a Westerosi, and I was born on an island. My clan is from an island, at least, and I've always been an islander. The Lord of the West's interest increased slightly when his ears were captivated by that strange accent. His eyes, previously fixed on the strange man's, had moved to the scabbard on the man's right side, oddly positioned upwards, but without a weapon, possibly in the hands of his guard. Strange accent. I doubt you're from the Summer Isles, am I right? No, I am not from the Summer Isles, and I am not a knight, in case you add the being before my name, Lord Lannister. You might consider me a sellsword, a sold sword. And you want to go from serving the Starks to collecting Lannister gold. Is that all there is to it, boy? If it were for gold, I would have gone with you first. If it were for blood, I would have followed the young madman west with my sword drawn, ready. If it were for justice, I would have followed the Brotherhood without banners in their fight against the Lannisters into the Riverlands, the Trident. Yet I neither went first to your men nor followed the Starks west, though I could have. And even less did I join the Brotherhood without banners, those vigilantes driven by a small shred of honor. Sincerity bathed those words in the ears of the Lord of the West himself, who looked at the young man for a few long seconds that seemed like hours, at least for anyone who observed the interaction between the 2 blondes, with the older one having long gray hairs already emerging from the previously golden hair of the rock lion. And what does someone who seeks nothing seek? You have served me nothing, you have helped me nothing, and you are not sworn to someone I care enough about to give you whatever you desire. What does a foreigner want from someone like me, besides money? No backing, no men, no name. You are nothing more than a stranger in Westeros, boy. Naruto of the Uzumaki clan, if I may introduce myself. Your men were troubled to want my sword, my legacy. Though, to be no one. I am many things. Giant Slayer, he who killed the dawn, the demon who devoured the dragon. In my land I have a lot of names that I am known by, and all of them remain within reality, even if there are some skeptics. What do I want? I would like to possess everything you have, however, my loyalty will only cost you something to keep what you desire in the hands of your inept grandson. An eyebrow rose, making Tywin Lannister's gaze much more questioning than he would have expected from the Lord of the West's gaze. What would that be, kid? Can you enlighten me? You want the 7 kingdoms for the Lannisters. I want the vast and mighty north for my own hands to rule. That is my price for swearing my sword at your feet, Lord Lannister. That he who has not lost a single fight in the east may serve the lion. The north was in Stark hands. It was the only remaining remnant of rebellion, along with the Iron Islands, who didn't seem to want to stop. But Tuin had plans for the north and the Isles, for the east and the Errands he had plans for everyone. Why, then, had a brat appeared with those words on his lips? Was it just a charade, a ruse? Or was it someone truly capable? Doubts and questions lingered. Tuin wasn't going to give in to a stranger, to someone who had given him nothing. You want the north in your hands, probably knowing that Sansa Stark is in our power. Yet you have given me nothing to obtain what I desire, to place my men and my line in charge of Westeros. But that could change with a few words. I want my son back. I want my heir in my hands. I want Jaime Lannister back in King's Landing, boy. Can you do that? Jaime Lannister had been in Riverrun before Naruto arrived in King's Landing. He was freed by Lady Stark herself in order to obtain her daughter, to be able to win back Sansa, and to realize the possibility of having her family again, albeit without her husband and his bastard son. The stranger's eyes moved around the room, to the map of Westeros spread out behind Lord Tywin Lannister, waiting to be used by the Lord of Casterly Rock in hand of the King Joffrey, the first of his name. You only desire Jaime when he could bring you the head of the king and the north or his chief commanders. Naruto's lips curled with a steely glare. You only desire your son when he could bring you whatever you desired as a token of loyalty, Lord Lannister. Blue eyes connected with green ones. There was resolve, a certainty and the brilliance reflected in the blue of those orbs, which never flinched from the gaze of the eldest Lannister, something Tywin could undoubtedly come to admire, to respect. That boy, who couldn't have been more than 20 days old, stood before him, his relationship with the Starks as clear as day, completely crystalline in the eyes of the old lion. Tywin snorted. I want to see if you can do what you promise. Lady Sansa will have a full stay in King's Landing, something you already know. And if you won't take her to Riverrun, then I'd rather have someone who can show me the north. She's the key. Sweetwater's journey to King's Landing could have been uneventful. But Jaime Lannister was too well known, too hated, or too loved. The Northmen were between the royal city and the Riverlands, fighting the Westermen. The chances of Jaime reaching King's Landing without help were slim, maybe almost none, if you ask Naruto. But, placing his hand on the handle of the Wado Ichimonji, the stranger accepted the lion's request. If it is what Lord Tywin Lannister wishes, it is what I will give him to show that I can have whatever I wish, to gain his approval. I will march now, alone, faster than the wind. And before you know it, you will have Jaime Lannister as your heir and perhaps some Northmen dead. But don't play me, Tywin Lannister. The ocean will swallow that which vexes it, my mother is fond of saying. Chapter 8. War had ravaged Westeros, watering every corner with blood, with corpses of young and old scattered across the grass, their eyes being devoured by crows, by birds drawn to death and war, scavengers ready to devour the feast that the fighting between the houses had left for them. Places like Highgarden, Sunspear, and the Eyrie still kept their borders closed, preventing the passage of enemies. These were three of the places least affected by the War of the Five Kings. However, pirate raids had recently increased in number and intensity, leaving some routes blocked and preventing merchants from passing for fear of being attacked by the Ironborn who had taken the north for themselves, leaving the young wolf homeless. Northmen, Knights of the West, and fervent fighters of the Trident continued to fight for their lives in the very center of the continent, below the Riverlands and west of King's Landing, surrounding the lands ruled by the Lords of the West and the feudal lords. This had been Ross Bolton's fault. The news of the fall of Winterfell and Sir Edmure's untimely marriage to a daughter of Lord Free had forced the Lord of the Dreadfort to release most of his men into the areas near his settlement. Harrenhal, the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, the one that had been devoured by the flames of the Targaryen dragons and was said to be cursed by those who built it, who inhabited it, leaving many dead over the centuries. The intention of the Northerners patrolling the area was to be able to stop Jaime Lannister, to return him to the king in the north, to prevent son and father from reuniting, and the forces of the west from recovering the forces lost during hundreds of continuous confrontations, of deaths that littered the land. Ross was determined to obtain Tywin's son, to be able to hold him in his hands and use him as a bargaining chip if Sir Keevan or Lord Tywin attacked him on his way to the wedding. And he had let the bloody mummers roam freely around the areas surrounding the fortress, combing every forest until they found Sir Jaime Lannister's whereabouts. Oh, come on. The sword hissed, and the clinking of chains accompanied the forced war movement. The kiss of steel resonated through the room once more, alerting the birds, causing them to take flight to avoid the fray, to see the combatants. Scruffy, dirty, tired, and chained. Sir Jaime Lannister retained strength in his arms and legs, though to a much lesser extent than when he'd been in constant training. A year as a prisoner, without much movement, prevented him from staying in shape, with reflexes as sharp as those of a born swordsman. Despite this, his enemy wasn't having an easy time achieving victory over him, subduing him in that confrontation on a whim, as the knight would say. Jaime, drop the sword. Stop now. Brienne Tarth halted Sir Jamie's blade, causing the man to snort at the force the woman used. The maid of Tarth had been trained as a knight. She was his dream, his desire, and the size, the strength, the ugliness made the maiden an object of ridicule for men and women alike. Having spent a year locked up and chained, Jamie couldn't keep up with the woman beating him. His arms burned, his muscles telling him to stop, to kneel and let the woman tame him. But his stubbornness prevented him. He himself didn't want to. Using a sword was part of his duties and the right thing to do. How could he keep the woman safe and keep his promise if he was chained? A sword could make all the difference, something Jamie knew very well, and Brienne's honor was blinding her. Another shock finally brought Jamie to his knees and heaved heavily, feeling his forehead beaded with sweat from his recent exertion. His hands felt numb, his arms burning with exertion. With a kick, Brienne separated the blade from its owner. A disapproving frown had appeared on the woman's face, who was pointing her own sword at the Kingslayer's neck, unwilling to remove it from the man's Adam's apple. He was now on his knees, looking at her with eyes like two dull emeralds. "This is madness, woman," the knight snapped, feeling humiliated and tired, his arms barely available for his mind, troubled and exhausted by imprisonment and that simple fight. "Why couldn't I have a sword? It's not like you can protect me alone, woman." The vast distance separated Brienne of Tarth from King's Landing, increasing the possibility that both would suffer an attack from any enemy of the north or from Sir Jamie himself, who spared no enemies. A long list of knights, soldiers, lords, maidens, and ladies would be willing to end the life of the heir of the West without a second thought, hindering the knight's journey. And Jamie, unlike Brienne, was aware of what could happen on a journey like that, with Westeros at war, with bandits plundering every place they could. "I will not twist my hand, Kingslayer," the woman snapped, yanking Sir Jamie's chains to his feet, putting the strength in her arms to good use. Had Brienne so far chosen, she could have run the Lannister through the air at that moment and ended the debate by bathing the land in blood. "I promised Lady Stark I would take you to King's Landing, and I will keep that oath to her." Lady Brienne of Tarth was a woman willing to keep her oaths. When Catelyn Stark asked her to accompany Jamie to King's Landing to fulfill his promises, she took it completely seriously. To her, Jamie was merely a package to be delivered, a promise to be kept with the woman who saved her life during the chaos surrounding Renly's death, the man she herself had chosen to protect with her life, something she couldn't achieve when that shadow slashed her king's throat. "You're too stubborn." Jamie's shoulders slumped, and his defeated expression became more noticeable. "If we die, it won't be my fault." The defeated look Jamie Lannister sent her captor's way didn't shake the woman's resolve. Perhaps another lady would have fallen before the emerald-eyed knight's eyes, but not Brienne of Tarth. Having grown up with a fervent desire to be a knight and by its standards, the woman wouldn't fall to a man who had lied, slept with her sister, and shamelessly hurt a child. Especially not when he had sworn an oath to Lady Catelyn Stark, the widow of the previous Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Brienne of Tarth tugged on the chains and pushed Sir Jamie toward the horse she'd been riding. They were nearing King's Landing, a few days' gallop away, and the woman wasn't going to stop when he was so close, when her mission was within her grasp. And, to take Jamie's own advice, she was too stubborn and honorable to let a promise, an oath, fall away like the wind, like nothing more than dust. "Are those horses?" Jamie's voice brought the woman wrapped in steel and leather back to reality. Halting her steps heavily, Brienne of Tarth pulled Jamie behind her just in time to see a vanguard gallop toward them. 20 men were approaching, all on beautiful warhorses, wrapped in metal, blood, and leather, their faces hidden beneath threadbare cloaks or helmets stained with mud and blood, some with patches of rotten skin. "Stark men or Lannister men?" Jamie asked, trying to peek his head over the woman's shoulder. Brienne shoved the Kingsguard with her shoulder, earning a groan from the Lannister heir, causing him to back away. "It doesn't matter." Her hand fell on the handle of her sheathed sword. Narrowing her eyes, the woman looked at the first of the men. Greasy hair, tall, a goatee replacing his chin on a long face. "They don't look like gentlemen." "But..." Jamie's eyes narrowed at the banner the men waved with them. He recognized it perfectly, having learned from that company back when he was still fighting against the River Lords and the Northmen. Those men at the beginning of the war had been under his father's command, or rather, under the command of the Lannister Gold. The Bloody Mummers, those who went by the name of the Bold Company. And Jamie recognized their commander. Vargo Hoat, better known as the Goat for his lisp caused by the swelling of his tongue. He wasn't a man Jamie liked very much. Brienne, Jamie tugged at the Lady of Tarth in an attempt to get her attention. Another detachment of riders was following the first, possibly more of Vargo's men. If Jamie's information wasn't too old, the daring company numbered around 200 or 300 riders, too many even for them to do anything about. Brienne. When the Maid of Tarth reacted, the Sellsword riders passed by as if they were not there, as if Jamie Lannister were not a prize for every man or woman in the Seven Kingdoms, and were not a bag of gold from the hand of the old lion, as well as a blow to the pride of the Kingsguard and his father. "Are you passing by? We're right in the middle." Jaime's outburst didn't seem to force the riders to turn around or to see if Jaime Lannister was really there for them to keep under control. In fact, the gallop grew louder at the shout and the 20 men disappeared from sight. This was not the case with the second group. The 50 riders stopped in front of Brienne and Jaime as the former pushed the knight towards his mount, moving their lances to point only at the woman, who frowned at this gesture from the men on horseback. "Sir Jaime Lannister?" The accent was strange to the Kingslayer's ears. It didn't come from the Free Cities and it didn't sound like it was from the Summer Isles. It was the first time Sir Jaime and Brienne had ever heard it, and so they looked at the man who mentioned the knight's name so casually, as if he had known Jaime all his life and they were best friends. The man appeared among the group of riders. Wrapped in hardened leather and furs, his Northman-like appearance marred only by his golden hair, the one who mentioned Jaime's name looked first at Brienne before looking at Jaime himself. "Yes, you are indeed Sir Jaime. Almost a carbon copy of your father and a male carbon copy of your sister." His left hand tugged on the steed's reins, forcing the other riders to move to make room for him to dismount. These good men helped that goat fellow run with his tail between his legs, with the loss of almost all of his men. It's a shame Vargo didn't want to help, but these good companions did. Companions was a word Jaime didn't see on the faces of Vargo Hoat's former men. There was a long list of appellations the Lannister could use to define them, but companions. Sir Jaime had no doubt that the blonde man must be strong, given his behavior, and that he also carried enough money to make the men betray Vargo. Did he call them companions merely out of mockery or irony? He couldn't tell, but the playful glint in the blonde swordsman's eyes gave him a slight idea of the direction those words might take. "I can't give you Sir Jaime. I must take him to King's Landing to speak with his father, to obtain." The sound of steel leaving leather forced the maid of Tarth to draw her own sword. Sword against katana. Mocking blue eyes against serious, determined dark ones. Brienne wouldn't back down, and Naruto wouldn't yield. Unlike Jaime or Vargo, he would take the female knight's head for convenience, for his own benefit. "I'm taking him, Sir Female Knight." Steel sliced through the air. Naruto leaned back, evading the slash of Brienne of Tarth's sword, letting her snort. "It's nothing personal, really. But I have business that's incompatible with yours." Brienne took a stride forward. That step was seized upon by the stranger. The Uzumaki clansman moved forward and fervently attacked the hand that had kept Jaime chained, drawing a yell from the woman as her limb was severed with such ease and in too short a time, leaving Brienne to fall to her knees, still holding the sword in her other hand, gasping in pain and dripping blood. Katanas were good for slashing, hacking, decapitating, and cutting into vital areas of the body. While a tempered sword could easily penetrate and cut, as well as block, a katana couldn't do the same things a knight's sword could. It had only one edge, and its defense was nothing compared to what a knight's sword could achieve. However, a katana of the steel weight Ichimonji wielded could match and surpass a common Westerosi sword, something Jaime realized when Brienne's sword collided with the foreigner's, shattering into tiny fragments that flew in hundreds of places, forcing the Lannister to take cover and only receive a few scratches. The tip of the weight Ichimonji was placed under Brienne of Tarth's chin, forcing the woman to raise her head slightly and look at the man who had defeated her. He wore Northman robes. She could see the Stark symbol on the man's chest, formed in the hardened leather. But this man was not a Northman, and he did not serve House Stark, not in Brienne's tired eyes, who took a deep breath, knowing what was coming and what would soon happen. Westerosi swords were good for slashing, and Eastern swords were best for cutting. A single sweep of the weight Ichimonji ended Brienne of Tarth's life by severing her head from her body. And the man who did it didn't close his eyes or blink at the sensation of warm blood wetting his skin. He kept his eyes open and watched the woman's final moments, showing no mercy. There was nothing in those blue eyes that met Jaime Lannister's emerald ones. "Your father awaits, Sir Jaime. Mount the horse." The katana lowered again. The chains were cut to Jaime's own satisfaction. "We have a few days between us and your father." Chapter 9. The rainy season in Westeros had hampered the progress of merchants and free riders traveling the length and breadth of the continent in search of fortune. This had further affected the various armies established by the Seven Kingdoms, serving one of the kings trying to seize the Iron Throne, something that was currently in the hands of Joffrey Baratheon and his loyal followers, who seemed to have obtained victory in uneven ways with their various rivals. Arranging everything for his wedding to his future queen, leaving aside the daughter of the late Eddard Stark, the previous Lord of Winterfell who was executed for treason, and attempting to usurp the throne occupied by the eldest son of the previous king. The group of 30 riders entered through one of the gates of King's Landing, wrapped in threadbare dark cloaks that had become heavy from the falling water, generating a feeling of cold in the riders themselves as they advanced towards the Red Keep while being watched by the few passers-by in the city or by some members of the Gold Cloaks who whispered among themselves as they looked at one of the riders who was in the lead, appearing to be more anxious than his companions. With his eyes glowing with green fire. The rider leading the group was none other than Sir Jaime Lannister, a member of the Kingsguard, heir to Casterly Rock, and one of his lord father's favored sons. But the surprise wasn't because of who he was, but because he was returning to the Red Keep when he should have been in chains, guarded by Northmen likely stationed at Reverun, the king's current northern settlement, after his passage through the west, and the burning of hundreds of acres of land that should have grown wheat. Some food to supply Casterly Rock. The war had affected the supplies of the various houses, especially those where the war had been waged most intensely, with greater ferocity than it should have been. Such as the lands of the Trident and the Westerlands, they were damaged, with the loss of thousands of golden dragons and men who now watered the soil with their blood. However, certain areas had held up fairly well after the recent clashes between the various kings. Without the support of the North, Robb Stark would have to ascend again to the former Stark home, and that would leave the Riverlands completely unprotected, without the army that followed the young wolf everywhere. This could put an end to the war that had already been ravaging Westeros for too long. Sir Jaime, completely soaked, pulled on the reins of his steed, causing the animal to protest at the abrupt order to stop by its rider, shaking its head in discomfort at having felt its jaw being bothered by the reins it was wearing to control it. That strange guy hasn't continued with the group. The stranger had left the band of riders when King's Landing came into view, making sure that Jaime was marching toward the city and seeing his father, so he could tell the Hand of the King that he had fulfilled the first part of the pact. If there was a second, Jaime didn't know, and certainly the strange stranger in Northman clothes hadn't mentioned it to him, but he had let it slip that he was marching toward Harrenhal, intending to stir up the river lords with a little steel and fire, drenching the rivers of the Trident with the blood of those loyal to the king in the north. Jaime saw, behind those words, the fire burning in those eyes that reminded him of the ice of the north, as if it were an icy fire that burned through everything, that would sweep them all away when he himself unleashed it upon them. And that made Jaime think that the stranger was a man too mysterious, too dangerous, to be trusted as a king's man, or as a sworn sword in service to the Lannisters or the crown. I must see Cersei. Since his release, Jaime had thought only of his twin sister and of returning to her, of protecting her in these moments of such indecision. Was Dorne sending men to the landing? Jaime wasn't going to leave his father and sister within reach of men and women who might turn against Joffrey his son. He shook his head. Those thoughts had to be dismissed. Jaime. The man's voice, raspy and tired, reached the Kingslayer's ears, causing him to turn to see the person who had called him. Soon, a faint smile appeared on his lips when he saw the man who had called him by name. He was all too recognizable to Jaime. Wearing that armor even in the Red Keep, with the Lannister symbol, his cloak at ground level, and his gaze hard. Uncle Keevan. Uncle and nephew embraced tightly under the watchful eye of the Lannister guards who followed Lord Tywin Lannister's right-hand man. Sir Keevan Lannister, one of the foremost commanders in the West and Tywin's younger brother, being the second son of Tytos Lannister and one of his older brother's most trusted captains. I'm so glad you came. The Western Knight separated from his nephew and looked at him for long seconds, finding his brother's words now true. Though for Keevan, it was strange that Tywin would put his trust in a stranger and a foreigner. But his nephew was back with them, completely unharmed. And the boy who rescued you? Sir Keevan attempted to find out the stranger's whereabouts through his nephew. As agreed between his brother Tywin and Naruto of the Uzumaki Clan, he was to rescue Jaime and bring him back to King's Landing, but he was also to dispose of the Northmen stationed at Harrenhal and any other northern lords he encountered along the way, which could lead to his death. He is following father's orders. Jaime's words seemed to calm the eldest Lannister, something that was reflected in the brightness of his eyes when they connected with his nephew's. Looks like he's a man of his word, Keevan murmured before pushing his nephew toward the corridor leading to the Hand of the King's chambers, something that made Jaime himself flinch. Is something wrong, Jaime? Your father wants to speak with you urgently. When Varys confirmed your presence in the city, he was coming to find you. Keevan met his nephew's gaze, but omitted the fact that he had been forced by his brother to go after Jaime. In a few weeks, the Dornish would arrive at the landing gates, and several groups of bandits made up of commoners and soldiers were positioned along different roads, ready for an assault. Just like the Brotherhood without banners. Despite Keevan's thoughts, Jaime's intentions were very different from those of his uncle or his father. He desired to see Cersei more than to drink water or a good Dornish wine served alongside a huge boar steak. That thought brought back to the Lannister knight's mind the memory of King Robert's death, the death that had started the entire War of the Five Kings and brought it to this point. But there was no turning back. The dead were dead, and the war was coming to an end, if the news was any indication. I wanted to see my brothers. Jaime bit his tongue. His main objective was to see his twin, but after Eddard Stark and Stannis Baratheon declared his sister's children his, wanting to see only Cersei might be viewed with excessive suspicion, especially by the crown's enemies who were stationed within the city, waiting for any confirmation before pounce on Joffrey. You can see them later, Kevin murmured, pushing his nephew toward the staircase that would take him to the hand of the king's chamber, his father's chambers. On one part of the wall, Jamie noticed a dark, almost black stain that caught his eye. It's surprising that a boy wanted to see your father so badly that he killed 2 Lannister men for it without a care in the world. He didn't do it to see the king, but to see your father and swear loyalty to him in the form of his son. His uncle's words surprised him. Did Naruto of the Uzumaki clan do that to bend the knee to his father, without a hidden agenda behind the smiling mask? The Lannister highly doubted that a man like the foreigner was acting in good faith, without a hidden agenda behind his actions like people like Varys or Littlefinger himself. Especially if you were playing the game that everyone in Westeros was playing in that war. And after having met the foreigner from the east, the doubts only grew in Jaime's mind, and he narrowed his eyes. Didn't my father doubt his word? I could be dead now, with my head on a spike. It had been one of 1,000 possibilities that ran through Lord Tywin Lannister's mind, and his brother Kevin had been present during his brother's various mental delusions, during his paranoid moments, contemplating the different endings that could lead to the death of one of his sons. Fortunately for them, the stranger brought Jaime to King's Landing as he had originally promised, completing the first half of the contract Tywin and the stranger made behind closed doors, away from the ears of Cersei or her allies. Your father and I thought of 1,000 ways to rescue you from the hands of the Northmen. But the different situations on the table forced us to act differently. Yes, your father and I thought of your death or this foreigner's trap. But I suppose his desperation to get you back led him to trust a stranger like this boy. Having you back is a relief for his mind and the troubles the kingdom brings. You will be able to use your sword again to protect Joffrey and fight for your father. Both men had arrived at the door to the king's hands chamber. Doubt still lingered in the Kingslayer's eyes, recalling Lady Tarth's death and the stranger's possible selfish motives for saving him from death at the hands of Vargo and his men by escorting him to King's Landing. I don't trust the stranger, the younger Lannister muttered, looking at his uncle. His plans are unknown, mysterious. And he's helping out of goodwill when he could gain so much more by giving me the northern boy. He's not doing this to help your father or the crown without getting anything in return. Sir Kevin looked at his nephew as he placed his hand on the door handle. He wants the north under his control. He wants the Stark family domains by marrying young Sansa, even though Tywin wanted to marry her to Tyrion, so the Lannisters would have control of the north. I don't know exactly what convinced him, Jaime, but your father accepted that boy's words and plans to give him Sansa and the north, along with everything that entails, as a trophy, as a prize for a list of actions for the crown and the Lannisters. I don't know if he has become a tired man or desperate to end this war. Sometimes, your father's plans escape my mind. Lands of the rivers. The clashes had increased in recent days between the northern lords, the river lords, and those loyal to the crown, growing to the point of spilling blood onto the land soaked by the autumn rains and leaving hundreds of men dead, devoured by crows flying over some of the destroyed camps, enveloped in fire, blood, and hard-to-breathe smoke. But despite the deaths, the war continued. In Duskendale, war had finally arrived. Under Roose Bolton's command, the vast majority of the northern infantry advanced toward the port city of Duskendale, intending to take it under the control of the king's allies in the north, causing a loss to the lords loyal to the crown. That at least was the intention. Blood and death swept through the northern infantry. Soldiers, knights, and lords drew their swords and strengthened their positions when they saw an immense enemy force emerge, pushing them out of the port city, back toward the King's Road, and forcing them to flee from the Tarly bannermen, who commanded such military force over their enemy. That was a different game. But the pincer movement, the northern forces were sandwiched between Lord Randall Tarly's forces and those of a bannerman they could not recognize. The one the Northmen did recognize was the giant riding alongside what appeared to be the commander of the king's second army, dragging a massive sword with which he cut down a man with a single blow. Blood, severed flesh and screams. The spear pierced Helman Tallheart's chest and left him embedded in the ground, blood bubbling from his throat, choking him to death. But the northern lord's eyes saw his murderer. Hair as golden as the sun, eyes as blue as the sea itself, 3 scars on each bronze cheek, Lannister armor covering his body. Finish them off, gentlemen. The roar seemed to encourage the mountain that rides. Sir Gregor cut down another Northman with his greatsword, drenching the wet grass with the blood of the first men and taking victory at the Battle of Duskendale as the Northmen finally retreated with their tails between their legs. Sir Gregor. The giant man growled as he dismounted, his ears pounding with a strange accent. Come with me and Lord Randall Tarly. We must discuss the siege of Harrenhal so we can recapture the fortress for Lord Petter from the goat soldiers. Randall Tarly was standing under a tent with some men loyal to the domain, facing the men loyal to the Lannisters, when Sir Gregor and Naruto of the Uzumaki clan entered together, causing Clegane's giant to bend slightly to avoid hitting his head. Foreign boy, the domain lord muttered, looking at the Easterner with his sharp eyes of lord and warrior. I suppose Lord Tuin had some purpose in placing you in command of his men and my forces. It had been strange to the chief captains that Lord Tuin would send a sellsword, a sworn sword, to command the Lannister forces on that side of the Seven Kingdoms, much less allow him to bear the colors of the House of the Lion. You guess right, Lord Tarly. The gloves hit the deerskin map, scarred hands becoming visible to prying eyes, though it would hardly matter to the eastern stranger. He returned his gaze to the Lord of Hornhill. He has sent me as his eyes, his voice, and his law, a representative of the hand of the king on the battlefield, unwilling to be rid of Sir Keevaner his son Jaime, who is back with his family. Rumors grew at the latest news, increasing when no one seemed to find a lie in the stranger's voice. You may call me simply Naruto, if you wish. I am not a lord or a being. The sound of wine refilling a goblet followed the young stranger's words, but at no point did Lord Tarly attempt to cut short Lord Tuin Lannister's envoy's speech, but instead remained silent, waiting. The wedding between Lady Margaery and King Joffrey will take place soon to consolidate the crown's hold. The blue orbs glowed for a few seconds, and Naruto turned, looking at the captains and lords around the table. By that time, I intend to secure the King's Road, surround the Tully forces around Riverrun, and recapture Harrenhal. What can we do, my lords? Chapter 10. Harrenhal was built before the conquest of Westeros by House Targaryen. Its walls had turned black as ash, a fact attributed to the dragons of the conquerors of Valyria when they burned the castle of Harren the Black, burning the former Lord of the Trident and the feudal lords to death. Aegon the Conqueror, along with Balerion, ensured that the walls of that castle, with its gigantic and hard walls, would be a reminder of the power of their house, of what they would be capable of against their enemies and those who opposed their conquest of Westeros. The enormous castle located on the northern shore of God's Eye Lake was a reminder of a time when dragons soared across the skies of the world, when men and women rode creatures made of fire and flesh. A reminder of a time that ushered in one of the greatest dynasties of the Seven Kingdoms, one that brought kings to their knees and conquered territories with steel, fire, and the blood of their enemies. The castle was imposing to anyone who saw it, even in its current state. Half ruined, its walls blackened by Balerian's fire, Harrenhal remained the greatest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, haunted by the ghosts left by the wars of the conquest, a castle cursed by the ancient lords of the Riverlands, cursed by Black Har himself and his descendants, who stalked the halls looking for their next victim. The castle had been granted to Petyr Baelish, the current master of coin, as a reward for his services to the crown in getting the Tyrells to join Lord Tuin's advancing army and form an official alliance against Stannis Baratheon at the Battle of the Blackwater, adding to the castle complete control of the Riverlands, giving Petyr control of some 20,000 swords at the best of the Riverlands. Currently, the river country was devastated by war, by the plundering of Lannister men, and by the clashes between river lords and westerners, leaving a vast river of blood between them for the rest of the centuries. The contingent of Lannister riders halted before the gates of Harrenhal, banners fluttering above the heads of the soldiers and commanders of the king's forces. With a disdainful look, the first rider spurred his horse toward the ruined gates, watched by men accompanied by a goat banner. "We've come to reclaim the castle in the name of King Joffrey, the first of his name." One of the guards spat phlegm at the horse's feet, looking back with a certain amount of sarcasm, finding the rider's reaction amusing. "If you don't want to die, surrender." The Bold Company, or Bloody Mummers as Vargo Hoat's men were known, had been working for the Lannisters as a mercenary company, burning and pillaging the riverbanks, but had defected to Robb Stark's side when the tide seemed to have turned in the king's favor in the north. Vargo himself had worked alongside Roose Bolton, and the Lord of the Dreadfort had promised the sellsword Harrenhal as his seat, something the goatee-bearded man took at face value. Vargo had posted sentries who watched the Westermen with a grim gaze, likely weighing their chances of surviving a clash with the king's men. "They won't pay much attention to you," a voice from behind the rider made him shake his head. Clad in Lannister armor with a wad of Ichimonji hanging from his back, Naruto trotted slowly to stand at the rider's right side. "Vargo is a stubborn man, greedy by nature. We'll have to burn him and his men, don't you think, Sir Gregor?" A snort came from the largest man in the group of riders. Clad in armor that made him unrecognizable were it not for his height, Sir Gregor Clegane looked toward the battlements of Harrenhal, weighing his chances against Vargo's men and their numbers, trying to gauge whether they were on equal footing or outnumbered. "It doesn't matter," Naruto spoke again, looking at the two men stationed at the door. "How much do you want to open that door and not die, good men?" Money could move mountains and was the main source of exchange between the Seven Kingdoms. While a knight might fight out of honor and loyalty to his lord, mercenaries were not guided by such actions. Their primary interest was one: money, the riches any lord could give them. Vargo might have Harrenhal, but what about his men? A glimmer of greed was evident when the right words fell from the foreigner's lips. He looked at both men with a crooked smile, knowing he had caught the guard's interest. "Neither Sir Gregor nor the rest of my men will kill you once you're paid," he clarified, glancing sideways at the giant. Of course, this was annoying to the mountain, who couldn't understand how anyone could avoid murdering such simple-minded men. With the money in hand and the gates open, you'll be able to live a few more days. However, if you refuse, well, I won't be the one to hold the dog's leashes. The blue orb stared at the two men, waiting for some response, some hint of what they would do. Both the guard on the right and the one on the left stared at each other for several long seconds, during which they silently debated what to do. But the path to take was even too clear and in plain sight, the only one open to them. Being sellswards, both men stood aside and allowed the Lannister men to enter Harrenhal, led by Sir Gregor Clegane. The giant knight of the west led the assault on the city, ruthlessly slicing a sellsword in half, hacking the poor man to pieces with a sweep of his massive broadsword as his horse whinnied. Even mercenaries sometimes have heads. A leather bag fell into the hands of the guard on the left. Mercenary companies usually lack loyalty and are driven by money. I would recommend that you not be one of those men. You'll never see Vargo Hoed again. If you'll excuse me. Naruto spurred his mount and followed the Lannister men into the courtyard of the enormous castle, observing his own handiwork. Harrenhal had been stricken with death. During the conquest, its builder and first owner had died at the hands of the Conqueror, the first king of the Seven Kingdoms. Recently, an uprising by northern lords had led to the deaths of hundreds of Lannisters and allowed Lord Bolton to occupy the castle. And now the sellswords loyal to Vargo Hoed and Bolton were being slaughtered by westerners, led by a wrathful giant. Blood bathed the sand of the castle square. The screams of mercenaries and servants, as well as of harlots and prisoners, were the music that filled the halls of Harrenhal, accompanying the constant clash of steel and the urgent orders of commanders on both sides. Vargo Hoed had been caught almost unprotected. Almost because moments before, he had been with a wench who served Bolton and whom the goatee-bearded man had kept in his bed for his amusement and enjoyment. When the goat confronted the Lannisters, he did so half-naked, sword in hand, ready to fight the attackers in his chambers. Who dares to challenge me? The man's lisp made Naruto grit his teeth and bite the inside of his cheeks, all to hold back the sardonic laugh that was climbing in his throat and ready to be launched at Vargo, the only man the blonde foreigner had ever met with the problem of a swollen tongue. Oh, man. He pushed aside one of his men and showed himself before the mercenary leader, causing Vago to frown when he recognized the blonde. I'm not going to take you seriously when you're talking so weird, Vargo. Vargo pointed his sword at the blonde swordsman accompanying the Lannisters. His eyes hadn't missed the change in attire, going from northern clothes to western clothing and armor. You. The mercenary roared, lashing out as he took a single step forward, missing by an inch. You bastard. You betrayed me. I don't quite understand you, Wado Ichimonji responded to the second stabbing attempt, blocking the mercenary's blade as it was placed in front of its owner with the blade facing Vargo. Can you repeat that? The mercenary's sword swung in an angry slash, attempting to cut through his target. The blonde man took a step to the left and let the blade pass by without even grazing or causing any injury. Taking advantage of the momentum, he swung his left arm and slammed a punch into Vargo's face, sending the audacious company leader reeling, the taste of blood filling his mouth. Bastard, Vargo spat. His hands wrapped around the sword, his fingers turning to iron around the handle. I'm going to slit that throat and rip your heart from your body. So prepare yourself, bastard. Katana deflected the sword slash. Steel against steel. Wado Ichimonji sparked as it slid down the blade of the mercenary sword, being deflected as it rose at its owner's command, causing the two swordsmen to switch places. You don't deserve me to use Wado Ichimonji. The blade disappeared into the sheath at the swordsman's side. Sir Baron. Let me have your sword. Sir Baron Storm blinked at his commander's request. Without objecting, the man swung the bastard sword at his leader, watching with arrest as he caught it in midair and drew in time to deflect Vargo's upward slash, forcing the goatee man to fall, as Naruto shoved the bastard sword into Vargo's blade, forcing the man to fall forward, surprised by his opponent's strength. Naruto reacted by slamming a kick into Vargo's face before he got up, sending the man crashing into a table, blood dripping from his upper lip down his chin, showing it was cracked by the blow. Come on, a right slash, a left slash, and a stab. The combination was the same, forcing Vargo to defend himself as he retreated toward the wall opposite the door, bombarded by the laughter of the Westerners. Is this all the goat can do? The bastard sword drove the mercenary sword into the wooden floor, wedging the tip between the gap between two planks, making Vargo's eyes widen. Oh, you've lost your sword. You're not going to get it out in time. Naruto could have killed Vargo Hoed as his soul desired. However, he stopped when he placed the tip of his sword against the mercenary's neck and looked down at him with a mocking smile. Killing the man would be a mercy from the gods, and he was a man. He gave no mercy. I'm not going to kill you. You won't die by my hand, at least not today. Sir Gregor. I have a toy for you that I want you to have a lot of fun with. Vargo's eyes turned into two dark eggs as he saw the enormous figure of the mountain crouching to enter the room, his body covered in enormous armor that resonated with the giant's every movement, who never let up with his enormous blow. "Here, Sir Baron." Naruto threw the sword towards its owner, who caught it in bewilderment. You're welcome, my lord." "Hahaha. My lord. I am no lord, Sir Baron Storm. Like any man, I am a blood-loving bastard. The gods only guide me along this path and I only enjoy wielding my sword." Chapter 11. The events in King's Landing extended to the commoners living in the capital. Every event, tournament or wedding was known to the inhabitants and celebrated by them, extending the celebrations for weeks after the event had passed. On this occasion, the wedding between Joffrey Baratheon and Lady Margaery was planned to last about 2 weeks, with the final day being the grand wedding between the king and his betrothed. Men and women from all over the world arrived at King's Landing for King Joffrey's wedding. They all sought to make their fortune, to gain the favor of some Westerosi lord, and to earn some money that would allow them to live the rest of the year without worry. Due to the increase in strangers, the gold cloaks had increased in number by order of Lord Kevan Lannister, who was in charge of keeping the King's Landing guard ready for the wedding of the king and the lady of the domain, without anything jeopardizing the stability of the kingdom. The streets were filled with merchants, carrying strange fruits and weapons that seemed brought from distant lands. People from Bravos, Pentos, Lies, and Volantis had traveled by ship to the royal capital with divided interests. Some came simply to take part in the event, others came to sell their swords to the lords of the west, the richest of the 7 kingdoms. Landing was chaos. Sitting on one, with his legs dangling, Naruto looked at the people coming from the port, looking at the ships that docked in the city's port and from where strange men and women in colorful clothing got off. After Vargo Hoat's imprisonment and the capture of Harrenhal, Lord Tuin had summoned Naruto to return to the royal city, intending to be present in case anything went wrong. The old lion was cautious and astute, his eyes always watching everything that happened under his nose, letting nothing slip by. And much less at an event like that. Weddings in times of war were cruel. The Red Wedding, organized by the Frees of the twins and supported by the Boltons of the Dreadford, had been an example of what could happen if one didn't have the necessary allies, with swords ready to fight the enemies. Why was Robb Stark so trusting? That question Naruto could never answer or understand. Despite Rickon and Bran being alive, both Catelyn and Robb were too careless in the game, and their pieces were removed from the board by another far more cunning than them. The honor of the North is shit. Honor doesn't win wars, and I've already warned Lady Stark. He wasn't on either side. As a sworn sword and sellsword, he sold his services to the highest bidder, and currently, Lord Tuin Lannister was the highest bidder with whom he could work much longer. That, of course, didn't take away his promise to Bran and Lady Catelyn, but they were promises he would keep, following the rules of his gods. The North is now in the hands of the Boltons as Wardens of the North. A Northern Lord commanding disaffected Northern forces. Surely Lord Roose doesn't expect betrayal. Lord Roose Bolton was not a man well liked in the North and would be even less so when news of his betrayal spread to the main settlements of House Stark's vassals, who would not follow the Lord of the Dreadford willingly, something that even Tuin had seen coming. He needs Lady Sansa as the key to the North, as a bridge to Winterfell. However, her grandson won't let go of his broken toy even if he wants to. There were hundreds of stories that lords whispered among themselves. Stories that serving women told their brothers or husbands, their fathers or sons. Stories that men spoke in taverns as the wine and mead went down their throats. Joffrey Baratheon had not been a good king, and he had not treated a young lady of the North as she deserved. Using her as a plaything, Sansa Stark became like a frightened little fawn, cornered against the rocks as the sea pounded against her constantly, giving her no respite. Could anyone really treat a lady in such a manner? Could the Queen Regent not have stopped her son's ravings? Naruto was aware of the low regard some Westerosi placed on women. Places like Dorne were an exception to the rule imposed in the 7 kingdoms. But was the situation so bad that he would denigrate a young woman? The young foreigner couldn't conceive of harming a woman. If he had done so in his own land, where the Empress ruled, he would have seen his manhood cut off with a sword, without any consideration. In their land, women were as important as, or more so than, men. Women gave their lives and had ruled their country for 2 centuries without revolts, without rebellions they couldn't stop. Of course, not all of them were excellent rulers, but to date, the only event that had marked their country had been the War of the 13, which ultimately devastated the south of the country, turning it into a completely uninhabitable wasteland. "Ah, here you are, stranger." He pushed aside thoughts of his country and the imperial family and turned his head to see the man who had called him. The man was certainly handsome, with thin eyebrows, a sharp face, and an aquiline nose. His lustrous black hair had a few silver streaks that made him even more striking to anyone. Prince Oberyn. Auburn Numero's Martell stopped his walk when he was finally 2 steps away from the blonde, showing a slightly mocking smile, amused at the sight of the foreigner sitting, looking at the passers-by of the city port. That dwarf has taken it upon himself to give us quarters that could have easily been given to any other lord. He crossed his arms over his chest, letting his hair whip around his face as he took in the same sights as Naruto. What are you doing, good friend? The relationship between Naruto and Auburn didn't extend beyond a few days when the stranger met the prince in what appeared to be a brothel with some exotic women brought from across the narrow sea, from the free cities. In that instant, and after 4 bottles of Dornish wine, the stranger and prince were like brothers, laughing heartily in the company of other brothel customers and the prostitutes themselves. I was just watching, the boy admitted, tossing the apple core into the river. I was wondering if anyone from my homeland would show up in the royal capital. But I'm afraid that's not the case. There was no longing in those words. Auburn didn't sense the sadness that should have accompanied the tone of his voice. It was as if those words came out lifeless, energyless, and were spoken about something that held no real interest for the boy, as if he were commenting on any trivial matter that might be on his mind. Lord Tuin and the throne haven't given me what I asked for, and I've been acting a bit restless lately. The men of the domain aren't helping my retinue and I act kindly. Of course, this is the doing of the next queen's parents and grandmother. The future Lord of Highgarden, Willis, is very different from his father. I might say I'm sorry for leaving him crippled. The Prince of Sunspear decided to change the subject. The justice that had been promised to him when Tyrion had been Hand of the King in Lord Tuin's absence. Of course, Auburn felt the insult leveled at the Lannisters, an insult that was directly directed at the Martells, who were not liked by lions or roses. It wasn't something that worried him too much, though. If he didn't get the promised justice, he would simply take it any chance he got. You need not fear that, Prince. Tywin Lannister is too old and cunning a lion to waste the services of the Mountain, who now sits at Harrenhal, securing the fortress for his new lord. Even I see the futility of wasting a man like Clegane. The gleam intensified in the blue orbs. Having seen the Mountain in action brought back memories of his time at home, when he still served the cult of the Nine. But all things fall of their own weight, even immovable men like Clegane or devious ones like Lannister. A Lannister always pays his debts. Quite a load of rubbish, wouldn't you say, Auburn Martell? If they truly paid their debts, it would be with their own blood. The great house of Lannister had created a legacy built on the blood of its enemies, the sacrifice of its members, and the death of its allies. Cersei Lannister had pulled strings to place her offspring on the Iron Throne, something Naruto understood when he met Joffrey and his mother. Green eyes, blonde hair, and an overly proud ego that swelled their souls. Where were the blue eyes and black hair? Naruto doubted Cersei's children were from the previous king, even though he hadn't met him. But the Baratheons had black hair and stormy blue eyes. That was something that was written in the books. Serves a Lannister. I serve many men and women over the course of a year. My sword is made to serve, to be used for a legitimate cause and reason. I serve Lord Tywin because he is the knight that will win this war. You need only look at the board. Blue eyes stared into the prince's dark ones. Auburn swore he saw a dragon's fire glowing behind a storm, behind a sea raging with anger. Was he holding back his anger by being in the royal capital? Without the boy's confirmation, Auburn couldn't cast unfounded suspicions. But what the Prince of Sunspear would say was that he liked that look. Intense, burning, and full of power. It reminded him of the eyes of his sister's husband, the ill-fated Rhaegar. Could the boy before him be a Targaryen bastard? Even Rhaegar was a madman driven by prophecy. That was what was said when he first wielded a sword, watched by guards and servants. This boy has no madness in his gaze, no dragon's blackness hovering behind his eyes. Auburn thought of some of the men he had known, searching for that look the foreign boy was giving him. Of the hundreds of men and women he had known, none could match those stormy, flame-enveloped eyes of a Targaryen dragon, a true dragon. The War of the Five Kings. Robb Stark was assassinated at his uncle's wedding, and the northern lords were taken prisoner, killed, or missing. Lord Stannis Baratheon is hiding on Dragonstone with his tail between his legs after his defeat. Balon Greyjoy is too focused on his war with the Northerners. And, of course, Joffrey is the undisputed winner, counting on the south, the east, the west, and, recently, the Riverlands thanks to the Frees and the Boltons. The wind ruffled the prince's hair, shaking the strands in a way that gave the man a certain wild tone. I suppose your choices have been the wisest, even though you didn't know the results in advance. You've made the best moves in your favor. Wealth. Fame. Land. I suppose Tywin will give you something for your recognized efforts. The defeat of Glover and Tallhart and the capture of Harrenhal. There's also the rescue of Sir Jaime Lannister of the Kingsguard, the heir to the Old Lion. You haven't done anything truly significant to make the Lion owe you anything. He has not married Lady Stark to his son of medium height. The North was what he'd demanded for Sir Jaime's ransom. He'd asked for Sansa Stark in marriage on a whim, interpreting Lady Catelyn's words in a completely different way. Of course, the only way to get Sansa out of King's Landing was through death or marriage. And he was the best catch in that whole nest of vipers. Or at least better than a Lannister. Winter is coming. The North remembers. He shook his head and looked back at the port. 1 million people lived in close quarters in King's Landing, including nobles, septons, soldiers, and commoners, all sharing the space while simultaneously creating a sense of community. That number only increased with the new king's wedding, and the smell of shit had increased considerably. Their interest is the North, the home of the Starks. The young lass looks too good for a place like King's Landing. If the stories are true. They are, Prince Oberyn. I've verified the facts with servants, nobles, and knights. But those who gave me the final information were a few snobs. Little birds. Some birds. Perhaps the information from some crows, my good friend. Perhaps, he sighed, standing up. The armor had begun to weigh heavily, to become uncomfortable. No matter. I have a dinner with Lady Sansa. If you would like to join. No, no. Well, we wouldn't mind, the first move must be yours. Oberyn's arm hit the blonde's back, causing him to raise an eyebrow. Valeria and I will find other company tonight. There's no need to confront your plans. I only expect you to be ready tomorrow. The tourney for the king's wedding is about to begin. Ha! I wouldn't miss it, Prince. I want to see what the Red Viper of Dorne is capable of. Chapter 12. The stories of knights were often filled with fantastical details, featuring mythical weapons brought by the hand of the gods or strange beings who disappeared into the forests. They were always the figure who embodied good, protecting the weak and saving princesses from enchanted towers, restoring lost glory to the kingdom they served. Those, at least, were the stories the wet nurses told the children at night, like bedtime stories, creating anticipation in both boys and girls. While a boy longed to wield a sword, fight his lord's enemies, and be anointed by the Seven as a knight and possible Kingsguard, girls longed to be married to the handsome princes and knights, those who would always protect them even from the worst horrors in the world and from anyone who would do them harm. Sansa Stark understood that stories were just that, stories told to be imagined and enjoyed, but they never represented the reality of the men who wielded swords and covered their bodies in armor. Who used being as a title, but tarnished the oath sworn under the gaze of the gods they served, of those who gave them all life. Kings and queens made and unmade, creating a legacy for arrogant princes and commanding knights, as if they were mere sellswords, mere swords with which to achieve what they desired, leaving them like dogs after a plunder that finished off the inhabitants one way or another. And she learned it when the knights murdered her father. She learned it when the Kingsguard tore off her gown, leaving her half naked. She learned it when Sir Boros and Sir Meryn struck her with their gauntlets on Joffrey's orders, when the prince grew angry and she was a mere stress toy for the current monarch, by a whim of fate. There were no knights who followed honor. There was no nobility in serving in the Kingsguard. There was nothing from the stories told by the wet nurse that she or any other woman could see in the men who were knights. Men were men. They followed their instincts, pursued wealth, and licked the feet of whoever had the money they craved or the power they desired. She learned this there, confined, away from her home, with the news of her dead family. The red wedding of the twins had been much talked about, both by peasants and lords, and it was the news that Joffrey used to torture her again, something that Sansa was already accustomed to, and she closed off to the news of her mother and Robb's death in front of the nobles of the court, although afterward she cried on the pillow in her room, longing for her parents and brothers, because she also knew about the death of Bran, Rickon and the burning and destruction of Winterfell. Which made her mistress of a ruin, of a dead people, without brothers or family. She was an orphan in the care of the crown. Sansa had loved the idea of marrying Joffrey. She had prayed to the gods for her heart's desire, but now she realized. They were mere dreams of a naive girl, and they cost her everything she had ever loved, and that was truly hers. She lost her family, friends, and beloved companions, along with her home, wealth, and prestige. She was not a princess, nor would she ever be a queen, much less the Lady of Winterfell as her mother had been. Joffrey and Cersei would keep her there, bound by invisible chains that would slowly strangle her, and that took on the name she hated most right now. Marriage. The queen's attendant had told her so, and Joffrey, being the devil incarnate that he was, had reminded her. She was going to be married, tied to Tyrion Lannister for the rest of her life, and she was reminded of it every day, constantly. She wanted so badly to go to the Reach and meet Willis. Talking to Lady Olenna and Margaery about leaving King's Landing had raised too many hopes in her mind, making it a small, last hope for her. But the Lannisters and the king wouldn't let her go. That much even she knew. How could they lose her when she was the instrument of securing the North, the king's favorite plaything? Sansa tried to warn Margaery of the king's cruelty, of how he had treated her. Her consolation was Sir Loras Tyrell, a member of the Kingsguard and twin of the future queen of the Seven Kingdoms. At least she had someone to protect her. But what about me? She closed a book in her hands when a rap of knuckles caught her attention. She had allowed her servant, Shay, to prepare all the food for that evening, but had dismissed her once that was done, and she was fully dressed in a simple grey dress with light silver trim. She tried to represent the stark colors, as that evening was a dinner with her soon-to-be betrothed with Tyrion, the least evil of the Lannisters. With no other servant, Sansa walked to the door and opened it slowly, subtly swallowing the saliva in her throat from nerves, from fear. She hadn't been able to refuse, she couldn't do it. It would be an affront to the Lannisters, to the Queen Regent, and to the King. And she feared retaliation from both of them, plus that of the Queen's son, Joffrey. If only Tommen had been the elder. Lady Sansa Stark, Princess of Winterfell. A different man than she expected gave her a slight bow. He was dressed in a black doublet, black trousers and boots, devoid of any house design or other adornment. Blue eyes gazed at her for a few seconds, and she swore she saw two enormous sapphires gleaming in the candlelight, as if smiling reassuringly at her. However, the sword at the man's side brought her back to reality, making her realize where she was. "Excuse me, sir. And Lord Tyrion." The foreign man looked at her for a few seconds as he removed his gloves, tucking them into his leather belt. Sansa had mentioned Tyrion Lannister, the halfman, the imp of the royal family. She couldn't say they were similar, except that they both had blonde hair, though hers was even more golden, if that were possible. "He hasn't come, my lady. In fact, dinner is with me. Weren't you informed?" Sansa blinked in confusion at this twist. Wasn't she going to dine with her betrothed before preparing for the wedding that would bind her to hell? Was this another test? Yes, it would be the ultimate. They would be testing her, tempting her to see what she would do and punish her. "I'm sorry, my lord. But I'm waiting for Lord Tyrion Lannister, my betrothed. If you'll excuse me." She went to close the door. She didn't want to talk any more than necessary. Having Tyrion and a wedding on her mind was wearing on her even more than she expected. Why all the mention of Tyrion? A hand halted the movement. Sansa flinched when the man placed his body between the door and the frame. "Did Lord Tywin's servant not deliver the news to you, my lady? She will not marry Lord Tyrion, though no such command ever passed her lips, if I may say so." Under pressure, Sansa relented and allowed the foreign man into her home in King's Landing. Being a native of the land had given her that room a parlor for private meals or meetings, though it had only recently been granted to her thanks to the hand. "Aren't I going to marry Tyrion?" He saw hope shining behind those blue eyes, the size of his mother's. He saw life entering Lady Sansa's body at the mere mention of a sentence, as if she were breathing again after being squeezed too near death. These monsters. He lowered his hand to the handle of the Wado Ichimonji, feeling the texture of the hilt, remembering the faces of all the lions he had met, whom he had ended up serving like a sword, with a purpose. "No, my lady. Though, however, she is still betrothed to someone," and her words were a stab. Naruto saw it in the trembling of Sansa's lips, in the dying of the sparkle in those eyes that were looking at him. He swallowed hard and closed the door behind him as he continued. "I regret having to give you this news, Lady Sansa. The Lord Hand has arranged for you to be my betrothed, my wife for services rendered to the kingdom in some familiar and some lesser-known capacities. My name is Naruto, of the Uzumaki Clan, across the sea." A peasant couldn't marry a highborn woman. For someone like Tywin to give in so easily could only be seen one way. The Lord of Casterly Rock was gaining more than just the north for the kingdom. Much more than Harrenhal and the Riverlands for Lord Baelish. Much more than just returning his son and heir, though that was certainly important. But what the two discussed in the Tower of the Hand was only in the minds of both men. And Naruto was no mere peasant, as he proved to the hand. Sansa choked for a few seconds. That man wasn't Tyrion. Blue eyes, blonde hair, and strange markings on a sharp face, free of baby fat. He was tall, taller than her and Robb, and even slightly taller than Sir Loras Tyrell. He wore no armor, and he wasn't from Westeros, though he spoke Westeros too well. And she saw him as a handsome man, with features too similar to the Lannisters. If he hadn't mentioned his place of origin, she would have thought he was another relative of the Queen Regent and the imp. My lord. If you like, I can serve you dinner." "There's no need, Sansa." Naruto stopped the girl's movement by grabbing her arm. He felt her tremble, as if she were a small leaf loose in the wind. He let her go in a second. "I don't want to eat, not now at least, and not until you calm down a bit. You're too nervous, and I need to make sure these words stick in your mind." What words? "Their brothers are alive." Sansa had expected any response to her timid question. But the answer given wasn't one of the long lists. Did he mean Bran and Rickon? Robb? All three of them? Could she trust him and believe that this wasn't some hoax concocted by Joffrey so he could abuse her again? If it was a joke, Sansa could tell it was truly cruel, like Joffrey and, most likely, her mother. And she was tired of playing that sick game. I don't understand you." A frustrated exhalation hit the girl's heart-shaped face, making her close her eyes, smelling the mint in that mouth. I warned Lady Catelyn about this, of course, and I took steps to ensure that you could believe me without being accused of fraud." He rummaged in a small pouch and pulled out the sigil of House Stark, a sigil possessed only by members of each house. "This was given to me by Lady Catelyn when I visited her at Riverrun a few months ago, after the siege and burning of Winterfell." The girl's blue eyes moved toward the Stark seal, the same one her house used to sign letters and seal them with the intention of revealing their provenance. But it wasn't just a letter seal. Not for her, at least, Sansa of House Stark. It was the trust her mother placed in the man before her. No one in her house would leave a seal in the hands of a stranger unless they had obtained something that made them valuable in their eyes. This. "You may still have doubts, my lady, but I swear to you that I am an envoy from your mother and that I was in the north with your brothers. They cared for me when I came to these lands, falling ill and reaching the gates of Yomi. I could almost see some of the men I killed. The doubt would always be there. That place was King's Landing, a place filled with vipers, with people willing to stick a knife in their back for just a little gold and recognition, just to get what they wanted. Should she trust, or should she remain locked away, willing to follow Sir Danto's plan?" Sansa lifted her face from the seal in her hands and stared into Naruto's eyes for several long seconds. They were similar to a Tully's, but they were much more intense, much more expressive, and much less friendly than they appeared. They could have been the representation of a sapphire or a stormy sea. "They are the eyes of a man who is willing to give his life." Her father's voice filled her for a moment, recalling a moment from her childhood when she was lost with her mare, with a guard from her household dying from the wounds of some renegade Night's Watch. And on that occasion, she etched that brightness and that look in her mind, the same one her father described when he saw him, the last moments escaping through his mouth. They were better times. Sansa closed her hand around her family seal and looked into the stranger's eyes again, searching for a small opening that would prove her paranoid mind right. "Fine, sir. I'll try to place what little trust I have left, the little they've left without harming me. I could be losing what's left of my life, and I could remain locked away for the rest of my life. Play with the king or trust you. Escape or stay, following every word that comes out of his mouth. Be his fiancé or let myself be married to the imp and be bound by chains that won't let me move. I've lost my home, my family, and my status if it's possible to stop being noble. I've even lost the desire to leave these walls. I have no men in my service, and I only have a handmaiden that the queen gave me out of simple pity, perhaps as a mockery. Telling this, with the bird circling, is my final word. But I think I've grown tired, that my mind has seized on this." She brought the seal to her chest. Fat tears fell from her eyes. "There are no knights or royal guard to protect me. The world isn't a fairy tale. I just want to be reunited with my family. The siege on, Arya and the others, I just want peace." Sansa's eyes widened. She felt herself being pulled in, and soon she felt the warmth of Naruto's chest against her face, his arms wrapped around her with the strength and gentleness necessary to represent one of the comforting hugs she needed. "Your wish is my command, my queen." Chapter 13. Spies were a very important tool in times of war and very valuable in times of peace. A well-built network, with a fully capable owner, could obtain the most sensitive information in the realm and pass it on to the highest bidder, although it earned the hatred of lords and kings alike. This was something Lord Varys, known as the Spider, had become accustomed to from the moment he took up the mantle of advisor to the kings of Westeros, serving some better than others, always providing the information necessary to keep his head on his shoulders, something he liked and preferred to maintain as he had until now. As a good master of rumors, Lord Varys had to keep the king of the Seven Kingdoms informed of everything that might harm his position in the war or his own life. However, how could he inform the Queen Regent or the Hand of something he didn't know about, something that was too strange and incomprehensible to him? He could obtain the most coveted information thanks to his little birds, but there was something he wasn't getting, something that was slipping through his fingers. Information from abroad. When a strange man in dark armor demanded a meeting with the Hand, Varys couldn't see what he wanted. He was able to confirm some information later, but it was too brief to consolidate anything of any real use. The man hailed from beyond the free cities and the lands of Asai, better known as Asai of the Shade or the Shade, from an unknown empire in the east that no one had heard of until now. Of course, these were only small, unconfirmed rumors, but the eunuch could only sense a growing interest in the man under the command of Lord Tywin Lannister, the Hand of the King. The promises made in the halls, in the parlors, in the small gatherings he knew them, could play them to his own advantage, for his own peace and his own interests. What did the stranger promise Tywin to win Sansa's hand? That was something even his little birds couldn't figure out. And try as he might, he couldn't gain even a shred of knowledge on the matter, losing some of his little birds along the way. The foreigner was a fearsome man. Varys could see the danger in the foreigner from distant lands. Not knowing his interests, his loyalties, or his price put any plan on hold until a later date. Even Prince Oberyn's friendship for the man was something too unheard of. Because of this, he'd had to go to places he'd rather not tread. More specifically, a tent near the lists where the tournament matches for the king's wedding would soon begin. And it was a place that filled his nostrils with the smell of sweat. Even after a while, I don't like this too much. That tent was unlike any other. Black as night, with no banner, no recognizable symbol. There was no representation of a house, of a knight who could be given the necessary name. That striking tent could only belong to the man Very longed to meet. "It's good to see you, Lord Varys." Blue eyes stared at him intently, shining with what seemed to be some joy or mockery, without blinking even once, as if they had been constructed from the very sapphires they seemed to represent. The stranger was naked from the torso up, displaying a body sculpted by the gods, with well-defined muscles and scars running through every inch of his torso like veins, some more recognizable than others, like one that was on his right shoulder and reached just below his shoulder blade, and that seemed to have been made with a saw or a serrated blade. "This one?" The man patted the scar. After a moment, his lips curved into an amused smile. "It was made by a cursed sharkskin sword. Or so the legends about the demon sword tell us." He was a seasoned warrior. Varys could see it in his scars, in how upright he stood, not breaking a sweat despite being surrounded by enemies and allies. Did the man have allies, though? That was something he had to find out if he wanted to remove him from the game. "It's very striking, my lord." "Scars usually are, Lord Varys," the man chewed, spitting the words out mockingly. "Each one represents a man I've killed, an assassin who tried to kill me, or a woman I bucked hard and scarred my skin with her nails." Naruto laughed at the last words, allowing Varys to chuckle briefly. "They are my life, Lord Varys. Though, is that exactly it? My life is what you so long to know and cannot discover." In the lands beyond Asai, in the lands of the sun, spies and intrigue were a daily occurrence, something you saw with your own eyes. One day a friend or relative was alive, and the next day they were executed or murdered, leaving no one to know the reasons for their death or the hand that executed them. Thus, Naruto recognized that the little birds were a good net, but not enough to prevent him from seeing the movements behind the scenes or obtaining anything too valuable from them. He was educated and trained from birth, and when he consecrated himself to his order, he did so after 1,000 hearts were dedicated to his god. Varys couldn't discover anything he didn't want discovered or known himself. There was no relevant information within the mind of anyone who had ever met him, and when he spoke to the specific people he wanted to speak to, he made sure the birds had left their nests by fair means or foul, regardless of their age or gender. That would be extremely well-paid information, the counselor admitted, holding the stranger's gaze. He could see the power behind those eyes, the resolve and iron will of a man who had nothing to lose but his life. "I must say, he's put us in a difficult position." "Us? Or just you?" Varys had the decency to laugh briefly, having been caught out in his interest. "My fault, good sir." The quiet sound of Spider's footsteps accompanied his movements as he approached an iron flagon of Dornish wine. "May I?" "Of course." At any other time, Varys would have been too cautious to drink a beverage he hadn't poured himself. However, not knowing the man also made it the best place to avoid dying from poison. He wasn't an enemy of the stranger, and the stranger had no interest in killing him. How could he know? He hadn't run him through with his sword on sight, something a man like Naruto of the Uzumaki clan would do upon seeing his enemy. And that reinforced the fact that there was no poison in that canvas tent, much less coming from an assassin. He was a cautious man, much more so than he was. "Do you like dragons, my lord? Or their stories, at least?" Naruto watched as Varys poured himself a glass of wine. He did so carefully, but without holding the contents to his nose to check for any odors too strange for him to drink. Was he just trusting his luck, or was he just too dumb to think poison wouldn't kill him? The weapon of women and cowards, of those who couldn't wield a sword and fight. He always hated those methods, but he could use them better than any professional poisoner. "Would you believe me if I told you I killed one of them? It was bigger than a mammoth, but smaller than the smallest dragon from the golden age of dragons. Still, a magnificent beast with scales as black as night itself, with eyes as red as blood." He doubted Varys would speak of dragons merely as a fact to be dismissed, as a joke to get to know each other better. Even in Asai and beyond, the House of the Dragon had been known. Not all of its members ended up in Westeros, conquering the Seven Kingdoms. Some of them marched toward Asai, toward the Sunlands, and were known for their interest in blood and fire, in iron tarnished with the viscera of their enemies. Varys was telling him about another kind of dragons. "It's a very unrealistic story, but I'd even accept it as true with the right evidence. And currently, there are 3 dragons accompanied by their mother." There she was. Naruto smiled inwardly. He had been right when he thought of the woman wreaking havoc in Essos, burning all the slavers, liberating thousands of enslaved men and women. He was talking about Daenerys Targaryen, the woman on the lips of every lord, at least those who were thinking of leaving the deer for the dragon. It would be beautiful to see 3 young dragons, accompanied by their mother, facing an army, he admitted, conjuring up the image of Daenerys leading an army against the hosts of Westeros. From the rumors he heard, she had already begun taking Unsullied under her command, all loyal to her as their liberator, and had begun the conquest of the free cities. However, my loyalty currently lies with the lion. I must fulfill the contract I made with Lord Tywin. Isn't it a removable contract? Even if you paid with all the gold in Casterly Rock and the Iron Bank, you could not make me break my contract with the old lion. It wasn't a matter of honor, it was a matter of name. As a servant of the Nine I couldn't change contractors for a few extra gold pieces. That wasn't how they worked. If they formed a contract, even for a copper coin, they would end it before moving on to another. However, there might be a dispute over said contract. But I will say no more, Lord Varys. We both know now that speaking of each other could end us more abruptly. Haha, I guess that's true. And you've been even friendlier and more talkative than I expected, though I haven't satisfied my curiosity no matter how hard I tried. I will not reveal my secrets to men I do not trust, good sir. My plans are mine, and yours are yours. For now, even mentioning Daenerys as your piece in this game will not make me trust you any more than I have. For you have been careless. Though I recognize that you did so for a reason. You knew beforehand that I would never betray you. You have certainly done some of your homework, good Varys. Varys smiled slightly. Naruto of the Uzumaki Clan, the outsider as everyone had known him, was well versed in the Game of Thrones, even without having directly participated. Or was he becoming so now? He didn't know what he desired, what he yearned for within his soul and heart as a man, as a warrior. But he could see the same eyes he saw in Petyr Baelish when they spoke. He was cunning as a fox. He could see that even without him forming that cunning fox-like gaze. And that, after all, he found fascinating. Naruto of the Uzumaki Clan, the foreigner and conqueror of Harrenhal, the man who slew Helman Tallheart with a single spear that drove the Northern Lord through and through. The man who rescued Sir Jaime Lannister and ended up with a company of nearly 300 horsemen in the service of Vargo Hoat. He was a man any noble would want in command, or so Varys deduced from the intelligence the men backed him up with. What had he been doing during those clashes? What else was he hiding from the other lord's eyes? You are a strange player in this game. Your honeyed words in Lord Tywin's ears may have angered some. See Lord Bolton of the Dreadford. Bruce Bolton was a Stark bannerman, or had been until his betrayal at the twins and the attack and burning of Winterfell, something his bastard son, now acknowledged by the king, had done on his own initiative, creating chaos between the Kraken and the Direwolf, creating more fighting between Northerners. Ah, the flayed one. A mocking laugh escaped the blond man's throat. He is a strange man, that Bolton, but no stranger than certain people in my country. The flayed man. He is a strange symbol, with very warlike ways. However, he is not something I should fear or someone I should worry unduly about. Free, Bolton, or any traitor to their rightful lord. They will all die for murdering someone they swore allegiance to, according to the god's decree. And the Frees broke a primordial rule that will lead to their own downfall. And I will relish it. Lady Catelyn was a broken woman, and Robb was too honorable a man. He should have joined Stannis and ended up with Tywin. But such was the wheel of fate. There was knowledge in that head, and Varys should recognize it. How much did that man know about what happened in the War of the Five Kings? How much did he know about the different houses of Westeros to take sides with one of them? Although it didn't surprise him that he had joined the Lions. The Dyrells were slowly becoming extinct and only the young wolf seemed still alive, sadly. But there was another one further removed from all conflict, a bastard. It's good to talk to someone who won't try to kill me. Varys rose from his seat and placed the goblet on the raised table. I want to see what a man of your caliber can accomplish in a mere tourney like this. Men like Sir Loras and Sir Jaime will participate and the pitched battle could end your life in just one wrong turn, in one grim second. But I'll bet on you every time. A vast array of skills, isn't it? I want to see what lies within that well-versed warrior's mind you appear to possess. Ha! Naruto scratched his head. He had a genuine smile on his lips, as sharp as a predatory wolf's. Fine, Varys. I'll give those scented hands some golden dragons. The Black Swordsmen of Assai. I want you to remember that. Chapter 14. The stands of the arena were packed with minor lords, merchants and commoners who came to watch the pitched battle of the participants that day, with the intention of making a profit by betting on some of the lords and knights who were participating in the battle of all against all that was going to start the festivities for the wedding of Joffrey Baratheon and Margaery Tyrell, who were on a high balcony accompanied by 4 members of the royal guard, the Queen Regent. The hand of the king and some members of the king's council who accompanied the king and his future wife, 2 of the people accompanying the king's being Margaery's twin brother, Loras, and his father, the Lord of Highgarden, who in turn was accompanied by his lady wife and his mother. The men in the arena served various lords or were simple mercenaries and sworn swords who moved to King's Landing for a bit of fortune and some golden dragons, as well as the possibility of joining the service of some lord who was watching the various competitions that would take place throughout the 15 days of festivities, where the last one would be the wedding of the young king of the Seven Kingdoms. The pitched battle was a simple confrontation, yet much more complicated than a joust or an archery competition. Within the arena and the battle, there would always be a large number of participants, often reaching 100 or 200 men fighting with their weapons drawn, albeit with blunt blades, so as not to kill any of their opponents. However, both the audience and the competitors knew they could receive mortal wounds and die in the confrontation. Cases such as the loss of fingers, gangrene, or any other serious injury were common in pitched battles, and no one could see who the real culprit was in the tangle of armored bodies that would constantly fight. On this occasion, there were a total of 250 men in the arena, waiting for the signal to launch themselves directly into the confrontation with their weapons at the ready, their clear intention being to obtain victory by defeating their adversaries, something that people with strange powers had been doing lately, as happened in the competition for the hand of the king that the late King Robert held 2 years ago, before he died. There wasn't a single man who wasn't wearing armor, displaying some distinctive crest or color that associated him with a house or group, as was the case with some Lannister men or gold cloaks who had taken the initiative to fight in that confrontation. Only the sworn swords and sellswords hid their symbols at all times, or if they did, no one seemed to recognize them, even though some of them were truly famous, even across the narrow sea, in Essos. But among that entire group of men, there was one who stood out. It wasn't his size, he was barely over 6 feet tall, or his bulk, he was clearly physically fit, but they couldn't compare him to men like Grigor Clegane. But what caught their attention was the armor he had donned to cover his body and face. The armor was completely obsidian black, with no ornamentation or details that could identify him as a member of a mercenary group or in the service of a major or minor lord who had taken up his sword. It was a full suit of armor, with a helmet also obsidian black, covering the wearer's face and appearing imposing when someone stared at it for too long, leaving a cold feeling in those who stood still for too long. And that was the intention. The Black Knight knew he was being watched and seemed to enjoy it, standing in the middle of the entire group of men and the furtive glances of his enemies in the audience, who were probably speculating about his identity, which would be much better when he revealed it at the moment of winning that competition. On his right side, the knight carried what appeared to be a blunt bastard sword, with a sheathed broadsword protruding from his right shoulder. His right hand, firm and hard as a ring, held a lance that he seemed ready to use at any moment. "You may begin." The king's still high-pitched voice was heard above the murmurs of the people, and the metallic sound overcame the shouts of the people who were watching, now seeing how the weapons were moved, and the men fought to win that confrontation without any regard for their rivals or companions. In a pitched battle like this, alliances and betrayals were all too common, something any experienced knight could expect. And the Black Knight wasn't surprised when a group of free men moved toward him, taking advantage of his loneliness and ready to knock him off the sand, something he, in turn, wasn't too happy to accept. The spear he carried moved as he did, following the coordination of his body. He didn't use it to stab, but instead placed it horizontally and slashed 2 of the frees viciously until they fell to the ground, shattering his own weapon. "Do down. Let's go a little further." The breath hit his own skin as it left his mouth, striking the metal of the helmet that covered him. He drew his hands back and yanked the handle of his greatsword as he used his leg to push another of the frees away and brought the powerful blow down on the last of the 4, splitting his shield and denting the blue armor. The man fell to his right knee, blood running down his left arm, dripping onto the sand. His greatsword was dull, blunted, but the blade was metal and could even kill a person if used with enough force. And he had enough force to knock several of the men within a hair's breadth of their own deaths, which was slightly tempting, perhaps even too much for someone like him who never backed down from a fight. He turned in time to deflect a flail that tried to hit the left side of his temple, coming from a man of the domain who seemed ready to seize the opportunity. And it was precisely what he would do at any time, even if it were not in a simple contest, and he took it seriously by pushing the man against a Bravosi sellsword and what appeared to be a masterless knight who was fighting with a Bravosi, destabilizing the 3 men. The latter too surprised by being pushed by another in their hand-to-hand fight, causing the sellsword to punch the masterless knight in the face until something seemed to crunch. Pleased, the dark-armored man strode sinisterly, swinging his broadsword. He didn't seem to mind when a sword struck his right side or a mace tried to crush his head with a truly murderous and cruel intent, like that of a man who loved to crush his enemies or kill them with a crushing blow. In that case, the man raised his right arm and used his shoulder to push the mace upwards again, destabilizing the man and opening his defenses for a crushing horizontal blow that sent the attacker with several broken ribs to the ground, groaning and with blood filling his mouth, something that could be seen thanks to the open helmet that allowed the man's face to be seen, as well as his blank eyes that indicated a semi-consciousness of the guy. I hate this. His breath filled his helmet and the heat didn't help the sweat slow his progress. Sometimes, he appreciated Auburn talking to him about the water gardens or the kind of clothes worn in Dorne almost year-round, though he doubted they were worn in Hell as well. But he hated that armor more than anything, the one he'd decided to wear on a bet with the Prince of Dorne, who would be watching him and his companion, probably laughing at him. The broadsword moved efficiently and cut through distance and air in a completely circular motion that tried to emulate the movement of a flail, which generated fear in some of the men who moved for him, and he took advantage of this by delivering the firm downward slash that shattered one of the men, flooding his ears with the sound of bones crunching and the grunts of pain, typical of a wounded man who had received a heavy blow. That bastard. A high garden man snarled, moving toward the black-armored knight with his shield positioned so it covered his upper body. You conceited bastard, shining with that remarkable color. But that's going to end here. Some knights and sworn swords who had a bit of family history saw those who went without any symbol as easy prey, as a simple seeker of fame, glory and money, something that even they themselves were, and that demonstrated the hypocrisy of those who received the title of knight, something that could leave in a bad place the lord they served or the one they were going to serve in the future. But the Dominion knight's scream didn't faze the man inside the black armor. In fact, within the helm, a predatory grin greeted the knight's words with a degree of mockery, as if watching a deer march toward its predator, too swollen with pride and ego to realize its mistake. The man only gained insight into the danger when his shield shattered into wooden splinters, blurring his vision and allowing a punch to connect with his face, hard enough to send him splintered to the ground, his face smashed to pieces, several teeth flying out in a shower of blood and saliva, accompanying the shattered incisors. By this time, many of the men were already fleeing towards the edges of the arena, showing injuries of all kinds, and some men even seemed unwilling to move from the spot where they were knocked down and beaten by their enemies, as if they were too content to take a nap in the arena. Of the 250 men, after only a quarter of an hour, they were reduced to 10 people encased in iron, wielding steel and with shields completely shattered by the blows, showing some wounds and ailments that prevented them from moving effectively, and demonstrating that they were capable of fighting even in the worst moments, as was the case. That confrontation should have become a free-for-all, but for some strange reason the 10 men moved towards the one covered in black armor, making him the target to beat at that moment, recognizing him as the most dangerous person in the entire arena. Ahahaha. The laughter came out slightly muffled by the helmet, but it caused the rivals to look at the man, as if he had gone completely mad. He's crazy. I suppose the pain of some wound and seeing us all against him. Error, you little Estarossa shit. The greatsword was even faster than the man's eyes, and he went rolling on the ground, losing his weapon and leaving some traces of blood, saliva and a crunching sound that could have indicated some breakage. I laugh because this reminds me of hundreds of moments from home. He pushed the greatsword with a stab that sent another man to the ground, leaving now only 8 people standing to fight, but without the greatsword in the Black Knight's hand. And my greatsword's diffuser. What good memories. 7 men moved, and one grasped the handle of his bastard sword. Weapons swung, shouts roared among the men, and the eyes of the King of Westeros fixed on the dark figure. Who is he, Uncle Jaime? Jaime Lannister, current Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, shifted his eyes to the man fighting the remaining 7 men from that bloody massacre. He couldn't recognize the movement pattern, the armor, or the muffled voice that had laughed mockingly at the enemies falling upon him. I can't recognize him, he admitted, frowning and shaking his head, but something tells me I know him, from somewhere. He has no house symbol, so I see he's some sworn sword, sellsword, unacknowledged lord or knight-errant seeking some favor from the king or some greater lord. If he wins, we'll be able to find out who he is. Has this interested you, nephew? The blond man briefly bit his tongue and held back the urge to say what Stark's letters sent across the continent. Well, I just want to see how it hurts them. Only half an hour. When the people stopped shouting, the man in black armor remained standing, looking toward the royal box, toward which he walked with firm steps that anyone might have associated with a royal lord. Finally, the man stopped, his hands taking his helmet and removing it, revealing the face of the foreigner in the service of the old lion, and he himself knelt and bowed his head in respect, shouting seconds later. Hail, King Joffrey. This is your victory. Chapter 15. Until today, Sansa Stark had never seen a half-naked man, nor the wounds adorning a body or the scars appearing beneath the blood when it was cleaned with water and white rags that turned the color of wine. But today, after the pitched battle, she saw the first man half naked, his torso completely bare and some areas of his body showing some bruises from some blows sustained during the fight, but nothing more serious than a few broken ribs, from what she could see, while he waited to be treated by the man she was looking at. Her blue eyes moved over his muscular back, seeing the scars that adorned it, leaving no room for clean, perfect skin. However, it wasn't a sight she disliked, nor did she feel any reluctance to look at them. They did remind her of her torment, with memories of Sir Marin and Sir Boros, stripping her naked in front of Joffrey and a few other nobles at court. Because of that, she could see the bruises on the man's body, and because of that, her eyes moved toward the scars and marks on his skin, drawn to what she herself had suffered and what each mark on that body represented. It's hot. Sansa gulped at the unseemly thought that entered her mind and looked away in shame, feeling her face heat up at the sight and the thought that flooded her. Since when had she become so lecherous? If Septim Ordain or her mother could read what she was thinking about the man, they would have reprimanded her for such impropriety in a lady. Though she had to admit she shouldn't be in the man's tent in the first place, even though she was pleased that he had thought of her to invite her to watch the pitched battle. He had to admit it had been gratifying. He'd been in the box with Tywin Lannister, his son Jaime, Margaery, and the king and his mother, but he'd always stood by the young Tyrell and kept his distance from Joffrey, the only man in that box who frightened her. Thanking Tywin perhaps it wouldn't be enough to show the man a modicum of respect. She shook her head, and when she heard the fabric rustle, she couldn't help but turn her head and look at the stranger who had been the talk of every lord of the court and every lady in the place. And she saw no reason why he shouldn't be. He was a handsome man, with hair as golden as the sun and eyes like two enormous sapphires that seemed to be constantly shining, gleaming even more when he grinned broadly like a fox. He's better than Joffrey. Joffrey Baratheon wasn't a good man, nor a better king, even though the people of King's Landing had grown to love him because of the kindness of his betrothed. Margaery Tyrell and her family arrived in the capital giving food and money to the needy, presenting themselves as a beautiful woman willing to feed the needy. Joffrey only got on the wagon when he rode beside her during one of her many rides to feed the people of the city. Other than that, the young Baratheon sitting on the Iron Throne wasn't much better than shit. Those were probably not the thoughts a double lady should have, but Sansa had grown weary of being a lady of the north, a noblewoman who could be trampled on by the inhabitants of the capital, by the vipers who surrounded her. Following the teachings of her mother and the Septa had brought her nothing but misery, even when she tried to please everyone. I'd give a copper coin for your thoughts, Lady Sansa. She blinked as the male voice reached her ears. Naruto had finally covered his torso with a dark almost black doublet, bearing no markings of the house he served. I'm sorry, my lord. I was wandering a bit and didn't catch you fully dressed. She tilted her head nervously, embarrassed at having been caught. I also hope you'll forgive me for intruding. I came in without permission. You can cut that my lord's stuff, Lady Sansa, the blonde man laughed. He had never been a lord, and he wasn't a lord now, even though the old lion had given him the hand of the most prized hostage in the kingdom. We're equal in all of this. Naruto looked into those characteristic Tully eyes, the same eyes he saw in Lady Stark when he visited her at Riverrun, and the same eyes his brother Edmure had, as if they were a representation of water itself. But in Sansa's eyes, he could see the turbulence caused by being away from home, by having lost almost all of her family, with only her promise that Bran and Rickon were alive and far from any danger. Or at least it was what the wildling had promised her. Understood my Naruto. The foreigner swallowed a laugh that would certainly have sounded mocking and cruel to the young lady from the north. He didn't want to be rude to the young woman, even though that would have been normal in his homeland. What do I owe your visit? The young man took a deep breath. Wearing that black armor covering his body had come at a price, allowing himself to be beaten by the rest of the participants. Not something that would have mattered too much, but now certain areas of his body were injured. I know I invited you to this, even though it would be somewhat impolite, because ladies shouldn't openly witness a cruel confrontation between men full of pride and ale. But in my village, I believe the women are the complete opposite of Westeros. That mention of the opposite hex by her fiancé caught Lady Sansa's interest, who blinked several times and tried to grasp the man's words. Distinct. Oh. That's true. He placed Wado Ichimonji on his left side, blade up instead of down. I've never told you about my homeland, or at least we've never had the time for such a conversation. My homeland, as you know, is across the narrow sea, beyond the dark lands of Asai. There, it is women who rule the land, who fight alongside men as the daughters of iron on the Greyjoy Iron Islands. But they are even worse than a Sir Gregor Clegane is. Or at least, that's how I remember my sister. Small flashbacks made him blink hard. Images of a young woman with red hair filled his head as she mentioned his homeland. Intense indigo eyes filled his vision, and he couldn't tear them away as he spoke of his sister. She was somewhat similar to Asha Greyjoy in demeanor, though if he'd been as much of an idiot as Theon, his member would likely have been eaten by a goat. And he didn't doubt his sister wouldn't have felt remorse for it. They weren't terribly close, and they never could be, not when her interest was always in the cult of the Nine, and everything she did was tied to them. But that wasn't information Lord Tuin or Lady Sansa should know anytime soon. It wasn't even information anyone in the Seven Kingdoms should even know existed. Knowing this, Naruto had never mentioned it to anyone other than a member of the cult, and he wouldn't do so anytime soon. You've never mentioned anything about your family. Sansa barely knew the man she was going to marry, according to the queen and her father. Beyond knowing that her mother and brothers knew him, information she only accepted as valid when the stranger showed her the Stark sigil her mother used to wear, she knew nothing about him. She knew that he had fought to rescue Sir Jaime Lannister from the hands of Sellswords. He had fought against the enemies of the crown to take Harrenhal for his new lord, but she knew nothing more than the few deeds he had performed in service to the Lannisters, which should have put him in a bad light with her, however, it didn't. Lady Catelyn was a woman who never trusted anyone who wasn't family or had been in her service for many years. Sansa doubted her mother would have given her the house seal if Naruto hadn't shown her proof, or if there wasn't enough evidence to know whether or not it was true about her brother's deaths and his involvement, which put the man in good standing with her trust. But she wouldn't place all her trust in him. Her time in the capital had made her somewhat wary of anyone who approached with good intentions. Even Sir Dantos was at a breaking point for her when he promised to remove her from the castle. Since their last meeting, she hadn't mentioned anything about Naruto's presence or Tuin and his daughter's intention to marry her to him. I don't usually talk about them much, the stranger admitted, finishing the sentence with a heavy sigh. Have you already chosen a dress for the king's wedding? I think, as your fiancé, I'll have to wear the same colors as you, my lady. The Stark colors were a vast array of grays that could vary in hue, but always reminded them of how dark and gloomy the north seemed to southern lords. Such colors, used for a dress, could greatly enhance Sansa's southern features, such as her red hair or blue eyes. And while Naruto might be seen as more of a southerner, being betrothed to a Stark gave him the opportunity to wear such colors, especially if his betrothed agreed to it. I'd see to that, the young Stark woman nodded, imagining Naruto in appropriate attire in the color of his house. So far, aside from seeing him in Lannister armor or the one he'd worn to compete, she'd only seen him in two doublets on two separate occasions. During their first match, and now that the competition was over. I think we should talk to a tailor. I don't have the appropriate attire. I haven't made the appropriate wardrobe changes given my changes. Naruto briefly raised an eyebrow, but soon found his answer to Sansa's words and stopped looking confused by her comment. The young woman had grown since leaving the north, both physically and mentally, and it was obvious she would have to change her attire accordingly. We can take tomorrow to work with a tailor to prepare our attire, my lady. I believe Lord Tyrion told me of one who has worked with the city's nobles, or, if you prefer, I have a couple of acquaintances who have decided to set up a tailor's shop in the city. That would be best, my lord. I think meeting some of your friends would be interesting for me. I hope you don't mind my frankness. You can speak to me informally, Sansa. I don't think I'm quite suited to formalities. I was raised as a soldier, a commander in times of need. Being treated as a lord is not something my ears are too used to, if I'm honest. I prefer a more personal approach. But you're calling me a lady, the girl murmured, frowning at the blonde's request. If you want fair treatment, I think it's appropriate that you treat me the same way, and I'll do the same. Yes, that would only be fair. Let's make a move, Lady Sansa. I'll address you informally, but you must do the same to me. The words were direct and concise. Her eyes twinkled slightly, and her lips curved into an amused smile. That way we'll both be on equal terms. Sansa found no error in her betrothed's words. In fact, it was exactly what she had asked for, so she couldn't refuse. Though her late mother and the Septa had taught her to be a lady, she believed the time for following rules was over when they both died, and she was surrounded by vipers. She could grieve for the loss of her loved ones, but as Naruto had told her earlier, they were playing the Game of Thrones. She wasn't a fighter, but she could navigate other ways to survive, the first being marrying an outsider. Then we have a deal, Naruto. Oh, we do. The boy accepted the pale hand the lady extended, feeling the cold touch of the Northman. It was surprising how, despite spending 2 years in the south, Lady Sansa hadn't changed much in her appearance beyond growing taller and taking on the body of a woman. Are you available tonight? Prince Oberyn has invited us to a dinner with his Dornish guard, the lords who accompany him, and his life-mate. Oberyn was one of the few people Naruto could consider a comrade. They hadn't fought together yet, nor had they dueled, but the stranger saw in the Dornishman's eyes something he once had, something that constantly shone brightly. I really want to. The tense canvas was lifted by a red-faced squire. Naruto didn't recognize him, and Lady Sansa showed no sign of it either, but when the blonde looked at the crest on his doublet, he could see that the boy worked for one of the Reach's lords. My lord, my lady, the boy bowed slightly. Lady Marguerite has requested to speak with Lady Sansa, if you don't mind, my lord. Naruto was tempted to laugh at the boy when he saw the discomfort in his eyes. Maybe it was because he saw the black armor on its stand behind him. No problem. He turned to Sansa and kissed the back of her hand with a certain degree of sweetness. I'm going to attend to some business, Sansa. I hope you enjoy your day with Lady Marguerite. Same here, Naruto. Please be careful what you do. Sansa left the tent, guided by the young squire. It was the moment the canvas was lowered that Naruto's eyes darkened slightly. The north is overrun by the Ironborn, and the northern lords are scattered across the continent, some dead like Tallheart and others prisoners like John Ummer, who is chained at the twins under the supervision of the Freeze. The Riverlands are at constant war, and a bastard Bolton is causing more trouble in the north than the Greyjoys themselves. He spread a map on a small wooden table, preventing it from rolling up by placing 4 stones at the corners. I promised to win a measure of glory and legacy for his house, an oath I swore with my blood. In order to take the north, I must marry Sansa and stop the Greyjoys, the Boltons, and the Wildlings from moving south over the wall. I guess I haven't had this much to do since that campaign in Pentos. Naruto took a deep breath and looked at the critical points of the War of the Five Kings, knowing his chances and what he needed to do to obtain what he promised the old lion ahead of time. It seemed his journey to Riverrun had been sped up. Chapter 16. Mercenary companies were a recurring tool used in any war fought around the world. They moved through the free cities, earning glory and money, bathing their hands in the blood of their enemies, and glorifying their fallen comrades. They always sold themselves to the highest bidder, and almost all of them were groups filled with treacherous and greedy individuals, intent on the coins they could fill their hands and the pouches they hung on their belts, unafraid to show this among their own people. Few groups dedicated to mercenary duties were filled with people with a certain degree of honor and loyalty to certain mercenary codes. The Golden Company was the most expensive and prestigious mercenary group, founded by bastards who fled Westeros years before, when the House of the Dragon was still present and at its height, counting among its ranks prominent figures, minor lords, and bastards of kings. With 10,000 men, the Golden Company was considered the most important mercenary company in the free cities, and the one that could turn a war with its mere presence, thanks to its elephants. However, it wasn't the only great company across the sea. The mercenary groups belonging to the free cities were known. They moved from one side to the other among the lords of Westeros, fighting their wars to obtain their gold and become rich, full of coins and glory, before returning to fight for another lord. But none of those groups of quarrelsome men and women had come from beyond Asai, nor was anyone known to have come from that side of the world to join a mercenary company. This ignorance and lack of information was what generated people's interest when they began to see warships sailing between the free cities, Slaver's Bay, and heading west. They all had sails as black as night, with masts blacker than coal and the wood that formed them, much blacker still. They were, in the eyes of people, whether noble or not, like an omen of death, like a dark, spreading nightmare. Of course, knowing that these strange ships were advancing towards Westeros was a complete relief to anyone who saw them, because they were immense and numerous, with enough to carry a large army of more than 10,000 men, which pushed people's imagination to a certain limit, creating fear in their hearts. The color black, associated with death and the unknown, was also a synonym and omen of something bad, as if they carried a disease that would eradicate all people in the world. Seeing black sails and even blacker ships, capable of being confused under the night sky, did not bode well for the cities they passed through. In all of them, the priests, of whatever faith, would pray in their temples, asking for mercy from whatever god they served, not caring much whether or not they were considered infidels. Survival had occupied the minds of each of them, clinging to any small ember of hope and not letting it go. But the ships, like the Breaker of Chains and the Mother of Dragons, did not stop, whether there was a blockade in the bay or not. Whether they were asked to by the nobles of the free cities or by people fleeing from slavers. The ships continued on their course, visible to all, gripping hearts and destroying ships that formed any kind of blockade, caring little about whether or not they started a war with any foreseeable enemy. They didn't even stop when they saw dragons soaring through the skies, one of them as black as the ships the mercenaries commanded. The men and women manning those ships didn't seem to be alive, for any rational human being would have, at the very least, admired the beauty of the winged beasts of ancient times. Like the ships, the crews of those vessels wrapped their bodies in dark armor and cloaks far blacker than the night. Like the sworn brothers of the Night's Watch, when not wearing dark armor, they wore doublets and furs darker than usual, blending in with their vessels, and barely blending in. However, 2 of the crew members and commanders of those vessels stood out from the rest, one for his immense size and immense 2-meter-long sword, and the other for wearing a white so pale that a person could barely look at him. The first of the commanders, the immense man wrapped in dark armor and a threadbare cloak, was a man with a serious, stern, and sour face, his right eye closed, short dark hair with some strands falling over his face, and eyes as dark as his own hair and armor. His skin was lightly tanned, covered in scars from years of service, some more pronounced than others, and his left arm was wrapped in a dark gauntlet that acted as a prosthesis, allowing him to move that limb. In contrast to this man, the other was slightly shorter, delicate, with snowy skin and white hair that fell just below his shoulders and was slightly curled at the tips. His eyes were a light, almost whitish blue, and he wore white robes, delicate and befitting an aristocratic person. The armor he sometimes wore was equally shiny and white, matching his thin, slightly feminine face, unscathed by scratches or scars. Both men were on the flagship of that enormous fleet, leading their comrades in arms, looking toward the horizon where the western land would appear in the coming days, and where each of them would disembark once they had divided into two groups. Moving and disembarking an immense fleet in a single location was too conspicuous and dangerous, attracting the attention of people who had no interest in seeing it. We've managed to skirt all enemies from Asai to the free cities, leaving behind a destruction that has nothing to do with our mission. Hundreds of contracts rejected and destroyed, leaving our pockets much emptier than they were a few weeks ago. The enemies are ahead, brother, the black-armored man stated, his eyes fixed on the water they were crossing. The narrow sea was being far too kind to them. Not a wave or storm had hit them, and not a single ship had been scattered, completely lost. The Ironborn are between us and the north, like enormous octopus arms ready to sink us for bothering them and their drowned god. Dust children with pins in their hands, the white-haired man leaned on the railing with his hands. The wind coming off the sea stirred his beautiful white hair, creating a trail that looked completely silver. Are the men ready if we face Urin or Victorian Greyjoy? The chances of that raven trying to stop us, proud as he is. The men are ready, but I doubt another victory over Urin and the taking of his other eye will earn them any pride. A wounded animal who's been running from us like a winded dog, hiding among his own people because he thinks we can't catch him, isn't a boon to us. The chieftain should have ended Urin Raven's eye's life and stuck his tongue up his ass, in my opinion. The chief, our brother in all but blood, must have done many things at certain times, like all of us throughout our lives. The clear eyes calmly looked at his companion's stern face and revealed a peaceful smile. But time puts everyone in their place. The exploits and mysteries surrounding Urin Greyjoy had earned him countless nicknames. He had turned the men and women of his ship into people without voices or tongues. Fearful that his secrets would spread to the ears of his enemies, which would be a blow to his established plans, the man had returned, after the strange death of his brother, to the Iron Islands, assuming the role of king following a vote that divided the people of the islands. But unlike Balin, Urin had a thorn in his side. One that slowly insinuated itself deeper and deeper into his body with each passing day. And that thorn was a defeat that drove Urin almost to madness, where his eye was shattered after the stabbing he received in his face, shattering his pride until it became a mere memory. But that pride had grown back over the years, turning into a shell that presented itself with a smile, years in which Urin fled from them, like a hurt dog. If I find him, I'll kill him. I'll send him to his drowned god, and he'll never rise again. I can promise you that. I know you would. However, unless he forces us, Urin is not our target, Guts. Guts and the white-haired man stared at each other for a long moment before the latter broke eye contact and returned to staring out at the waters of the narrow sea with those almost wide eyes, as if he were blind. For his part, the immense Guts stood a few steps behind his companion, his eye gazing in the same direction as his companion's. They were staring at a single point that was growing larger and larger, but it was still several miles away from them. The Iron Islands, where the children of the drowned god take refuge, waiting for their next victim. The white-haired man finally stepped away from the railing. While he usually wore white doublets, now he wore his silver and white armor that perfectly matched his hair, skin, and blue eyes so clear it was impossible to tell if they were white or blue. I will go give the appropriate orders to see if we have a chance to move further north, away from the lands of pirates and assassins. The pale eyes moved toward Guts, shining brightly. You should prepare for your own work, brother. You are to lead your men to the riverlands and set up camp at Harrenhal, as stipulated in the chief's orders. You don't need to remind me of my orders, Griffith, the enormous swordsman replied, snorting at the mocking look of the white-armored knight. Leave now, or you won't be able to go in the opposite direction to us, and our enemies will see you moving, which would be worse than we thought. I'm leaving now, Guts. One of the ships approached them, laying a bridge. Griffith put his first foot on the plank and turned his head back to Guts. Good luck, mate. A moment later, Guts stood alone at the helm of the fleet's flagship, his lightly threadbare dark cloak billowing in the wind, a dark trail projecting from his figure. He placed a mobile prosthesis on the thick handle of the greatsword, a weapon that couldn't be considered a sword, a two-handed sword. It was more like a mass of iron, and it sliced even horses with its blade, as if they were made of butter or paper. It was surprising that a human could wield such iron as to make a greatsword, as if it were a simple blade. Good. His voice carried over the waves, even reaching the track atop the mainmast. Head south. We'll round the west to the Three Sisters. King's Landing. At the same time, the union between the houses Baratheon and Tyrell had finally been made with the marriage of King Joffrey Baratheon and Lady Margaery Tyrell, only daughter of House Tyrell, in the greatest September of King's Landing, under the watchful eyes of the Seven, the Hand of the King, the Queen Regent, the High Septon, and the important noble lords in service to the king and his wife, among whom were important people such as Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne, or Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden and current naval advisor to King Joffrey, a position granted after the victory over the traitor Renly as payment for having chosen the winning side. Among the people who watched, apart from lords, major and minor, there were also ladies and knights who served in King's Landing or nobles who swore allegiance to the kingdom. Standing behind some of the more important lords, Naruto and Sansa had watched the ceremony in complete silence, hidden among the crowd that watched expectantly as the marriage took place. Finally, with the High Septon's blessing, the union long awaited by nobles and commoners had arrived, filling the streets with the euphoria typical of events such as this. That last night would be the final moment of celebration, which would end the festivities and the tranquility of the city. Unlike his fellow spectators, beneath his grey doublet, Naruto wore a coat of mail hidden from view, but not from the touch. For this reason, the young foreigner had instructed the current Lady of Winterfell about his worries and fears, about what could go wrong at any moment. King's Landing was filled with vipers ready to take Joffrey's head. The smiles that seemed genuine concealed a knife in the back that they would gladly plunge into anyone who threatened their positions. The fear that Lord Tywin Lannister instilled in everyone was the main reason why the lords hid their intentions behind their smiles and complacent faces, and why everyone watched the wedding without doing anything. It wasn't as if lesser lords could intervene in the actions of the great houses, but they wouldn't take sides until the faction of the Lion and the Stag was broken, even with suspicions of incest still hovering throughout the court. I see you in good company. After the union ceremony between the king and queen, dinner had not been long in coming, and even less so the wine, which occupied a special place in the cup that the stranger held in his right hand while he watched Lady Sansa dance with a Dornish knight. Thank you, I suppose. He turned his attention to the other man. A man no taller than a meter, probably under a meter tall, with a misshapen face and an ugly scar that didn't help matters, one that seemed to have taken off half his nose. Lord Tyrion of House Lannister, the man who always pays his debts. It's my family's saying, and I've been using it for as long as I can remember. More wine. The imp held out a silver tankard, with no design adorning the fine silver. Naruto gladly accepted the wine, extending his cup, allowing Tyrion Lannister to refill his glass, while they both watched the dance between the king and queen. You don't like your nephew. He's an utter fool, but he's the king, Tyrion shrugged. Women and men alike had been mistreated by his nephew, like Sir Dantos and Lady Sansa, destroying their lives in certain ways. His sister and Joffrey's mother, Cersei, hadn't helped the young king's behavior. My lord father now has a firm grip on the kingdom, and Joffrey won't be able to burn much more than he already has. Any potential problems, like war, will be handled by the great Lord Tywin Lannister and his new sworn sword. Oh. Are you already hearing about my exploits? Finding my brother Jaime and returning him to River's Landing. Defeating an army of nearly 10,000 northern foot soldiers, killing one of their commanders in the process. Taking Harrenhal from a mercenary force for the new Riverlord, our beloved Petter. No small feat, if I do say so myself. And returning my brother has endeared you, slightly, to my sister and my lord father. My uncle as well. The agreement between your lord father and me involved returning your brother to you, and I kept it, in addition to taking Harrenhal and defeating the rampaging northern army, taking every lord among them prisoner. He shrugged, taking another sip from his glass. That Reach wine was smooth and sweet. I'm good at my job when I'm paid for it. And they've paid you with enormous lordship, haven't they? The entire land of the north in the form of Lady Sansa, the only Stark alive, and to whom a vast army owes allegiance. It's a good pay. Too much, if I may say so. The imp's disparate eyes studied Naruto's face for a few seconds, causing him to stare back. It seemed the gods had been unmerciful to Lord Lannister, giving them the half-man before him, with a history of trouble with prostitutes too long to be recorded in a single scroll. What else have you offered my lord father for your labor and sword? It was a good question. What had he offered Lord Tywin Lannister to gain his hands on the vast northern land, with all its vassals, swords, and titles? A mere sworn sword, a sellsword, had risen to High Lord through marriage. A marriage Tywin accepted, and his daughter and grandson could not refuse. How could he do it? No one denied the hand of the king anything, and no man or woman alive had ever been able to defeat the old lion and his cunning. Eternal glory, a reign of an age, he began, taking small sips of his wine. I may have offered him so many things, which do you think it was? Money and glory, my father already has it. He's an old man, with immeasurable power and a great legacy behind him, casting a huge shadow over his sons. Tyrion Lannister, as he spoke, looked at his lord father. Those steely green eyes remained fixed on a single point but at the same time scanned the entire room. You could have granted him an army, which I don't believe. If that's ruled out, I'd say control of the Riverlands is another good option, along with complete control north of the neck. You'll end the Northern Wars, the Riverlands, and give them to the Crown, as well as subjugate the Iron Islands. That would be a good enough reason for my Lord Father to grant you the hand of the most important hostage in the realm and allow you to leave with her. That would be quite an achievement for a mere sellsword, and if you're still alive, it would be only fair to reward you with something grand. Your assumptions are accurate, if I may say so. The mind you wield, Lord Tyrion, is very sharp, too sharp, I would say. Perhaps that's why your father doesn't like you. A sharp mind in a body cursed by the gods. Ha! It's possible, it's possible. As they spoke, the moment to cut the pie had arrived. Displaying a bridal sword, the king and queen of Westeros stood side by side, holding the blade by the handle and slicing into the pigeon pie, causing a stir among the guests, who applauded as the doves emerged. Slowly, to great acclaim, Joffrey Baratheon brought a piece of the pie to his mouth, smiling at his vassals and family. But the happiness soon died from the king's smile. He began to cough violently under the gaze of his vassals and family, hunching forward as his face began to redden. Someone do something. The Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister's scream broke the silence, and chaos erupted in the room. Some tried to flee, others hid, and a few just stood there staring at what was happening. Move aside, you royal idiots. Leaping over the table and knocking the pastry over, Naruto threw the king to the ground, feeling the young Baratheon's fingers close around the collar of his doublet, squeezing tightly. But he paid no attention. Using his mouth, which was much faster, he uncapped a small earthenware cup he had been carrying and poured the contents, despite the queen's protests, into the king's half-open mouth, under dozens of stares. Slowly, little by little, after a minute in which it seemed that Joffrey Baratheon, the first of his name, was going to die, his face returned to a clear tone, and his eyes were no longer clouded by a layer of tears, and he breathed heavily, in gasps. Stop him. The eyes previously focused on the king turned to where Cersei pointed with her pale finger. Stop the dwarf. Chapter 17. Terrified and resisting, Sansa stumbled behind Sir Dantos, the court jester who had been pardoned by the king himself, but had lost all title and become a man of laughter, a clown. Drunk and persistent, the man had dragged the young woman from the hall where the dinner had been held after the king's marriage ceremony, taking advantage of the chaos of the attack on the young Baratheon, without even looking back or listening to the girl's protests, who did her best to stop, using her feet to slow the man's advance. Despite the girl's reluctance and pleas for him to stop, the jester continued walking, more quickly, evading the gold cloaks, Lannister and Tyrell men, reaching a landing stage where a solitary boat seemed to be waiting for them, rocking slightly. The boat wasn't very large, just enough for a small crew, with a cabin for 2 or 3 more people. On deck, the men were loading spices, furs, and various other things, but they stopped for a moment to look at Dantos and Sansa, before returning to their work in complete silence. One of them knocked on the cabin door before returning to his work. A man wearing a luxurious traveling cloak appeared on deck, smiling at the jester and the young lady accompanying him, not noticing that Dantos was dragging her along. Lord Petyr Baelish, Lord of Harrenhal and the Riverlands, looked down at the daughter his wife desired, seeing those riverine eyes and hair he had loved so much, a representation of the woman he had desired as well. Without speaking, Petyr walked across the plank and stood before Dantos, giving him a nod, and looked down at Sansa with his greenish-grey eyes that held a strange gleam, as if he had received something he desired, like a child given the gift it has longed for all its life. At this intense stare, Sansa flinched and tried to pull away from Sir Danton's thick calloused hands, but the jester shoved her back toward the lord and former master of coin, who smiled slightly as he reached out to grasp Sansa's limb. "Young lady, you are safe now. Plans were like seeds. You had to plant them in the ground, watch them sprout, and harvest the fruit when the time was right. He had to obtain Harrenhal with its titles and lordships. Become Lord of the Riverlands, with Riverrun as his vassal. He had won the hand of the previous Lady of Arryn, whom he would marry in the foreseeable future. And he had under his care Lady Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, the spitting image of his mother. All of this was currently sprouting, giving Petyr that confident, slightly mocking smile that seemed to go unnoticed by anyone who looked at him. Pinky. That voice wasn't familiar to Petyr, but it was to Sansa. Hopeful, she turned, feeling the man's fingers close like shackles around her hands. Come on, Sansa. Let's go. If not. An arrow grazed Petyr's left cheek, slamming into one of the crew members of the mid-sized vessel. Despite her insistence, the Lord of Harrenhal released Sansa's hands and stepped back, causing the girl to fall onto her rear as she struggled to escape his grasp. 2 more arrows flew, one plunging into Sir Dantos' right leg and the other slamming into the throat of another crew member who had drawn his crossbow and was aiming directly at the court jester's chest. Bastard. Petter's eyes flashed with rage. They glanced briefly at Sansa, but a fourth and a fifth arrow made him back down and return to his boat. "We're leaving. Now." As the ship pulled away from the small dock, armed men took up positions between Lady Sansa and the vessel, shielding him from prying eyes. Several of the soldiers grabbed the jester and began to drag him from the dock, ruthlessly dragging him as he protested. "Sansa." Her fiancé's blue eyes occupied all her attention. Naruto was breathing heavily, his face flushed from the wine and running. His doublet was lightly stained with what looked like salve, wine, and something he couldn't identify, but it seemed to be vomit from the sour smell. Then Naruto yo. But she couldn't continue speaking or protesting, couldn't even move away or complain when Naruto's arms wrapped around her, squeezing her somewhat tightly, taking a protective position over the girl. He slowly helped her stand, even surrounded by armed men, all staring at the river with grim faces. "Are you okay? Did they do anything to you?" "No, they just wanted to take me with them." Sansa swallowed her words with a loud clear of her throat, feeling both foolish and ashamed. Should she try to tell Naruto about Sir Danto's plans, what they'd discussed before the siege? They'd agreed, according to the man's benefactor, to flee King's Landing when the time came. A time that seemed to have translated in this case with the attempted assassination of the king. But she'd wanted to stop leaving. She'd chosen to follow Naruto's plans, the man her mother had supported, and Sir Danto's didn't seem to accept that. "Don't worry," Naruto gently gave her a second hug, this one much less tight, much calmer. "Everything's fine now, my lady. My Dornish friends and I will take you to your chambers, and a handful of guards will accompany you, so everything will be fine." Red Keep. Tower of the Hand. News of the attempted assassination of the king had spread like wildfire. Not an hour later, the lesser lords, sworn swords, and uninvited mercenaries knew of the news, discussing it in their homes with their families and in the taverns under the shadow of the Red Keep. Soon, it was already known to the commoners and merchants, who would carry the news beyond the city walls. Black ravens, hidden in the night, flew through the sky, carrying letters to every corner of Westeros. It wouldn't take more than a week for the news to be known to every lord, minor and great, commoners, swineherds, farmers, soldiers and anyone who walked the roads. But while that moment awaited, a meeting was taking place in the chamber of the hand of the king, discussing what had happened. The king and his wife had been forced to consummate their marriage, despite the king's own protests. Tywin had been very clear about the consummation and forced his grandson to do so, as the Tyrells were an important pillar of the current kingdom, and the old lion wasn't about to lose those allies. Mace Tyrell, Oberyn Martell, Kevan Lannister, the Queen Regent, Varys, and several loyal men stood before Lord Tywin Lannister, who had his back to them as he poured himself a glass of wine. Unlike his daughter or son, he showed no signs of nervousness or concern about the attack. He appeared calm, his gaze cold as he turned and looked at the gathered crowd for a long moment. The door opened. Sir Jaime, clad in the white armor of Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, joined the group, a new sword sheathed at his left waist with a striking hilt. This sword, as yet unnamed, had been forged from the Valyrian steel that had once belonged to Iceborne, the Stark family greatsword that Lord Eddard Stark had brought with him to King's Landing and used by Lord Tywin to make two swords. Widow's Wail, which belonged to the king, and the nameless sword that now accompanied Jaime. "We've arrested all the cooks, servants, and maids who worked for the dinner. I refuse to believe it was my brother. Can't you see?" the queen hissed, frowning when her twin looked at her. "I was holding the cup my son drank from." "One thing is certain," Oberyn Martell looked around at everyone present with those dark eyes. He showed a small smile, hidden by his wine glass. "If it weren't for the foreign boy, we'd probably be mourning the king's death. On the contrary, we're concerned only with discovering who tried to kill him. It's not a better outlook, but it's the best thing that could have happened." "I'm with Prince Oberyn," Jaime said, nodding. "If we find the killer, that's enough. Now that the stranger has saved my nephew and we have him close by, I don't think the assassins will attempt another attack, and in the time they give us, we must uncover the mastermind behind the plan." It was Tyrion. He was holding the wine cup, spilling it on the floor, erasing his tracks. The attendant saw him do it, and the threats he made toward Joffrey can be corroborated by the guards who were with Joffrey at each of those moments. The brothers stared at each other. Jaime was reluctant to believe that Tyrion would have been capable of harming Joffrey. He was malevolent, in his own way, with a sharp mind and always patient and cautious, like a petty commander willing to use others as his Lord Father or Lord Varys did, but to go so far as to try to kill the king. Tyrion didn't have the power or courage to do that. "We must put our heads on the line." Lord Tywin's deep voice halted any further confrontation between his sons, earning the glares of Mace and Oberyn, as well as the spider, who hadn't spoken. "Seek evidence against Tyrion. If there is any, it will come to light, and I will not oppose a trial against him, despite him being my son. I have a huge list of proofs, if that's what you need." Varys pulled a large scroll from the folds of his scented robes, placing it and the map of Westeros on the table. I've searched for them all, and they're all my little birds have given me. You may use them as proof, confirmation or not, depending on what you consider proof. That's all I have on Tyrion Lannister for you, Lord Hand. Tywin disliked men like Varys. Mysterious, with soft perfumed skin and clothing, never capable of wielding a knife himself. But he recognized the usefulness of men like the spider, even if in many cases it was for their own benefit. According to Varys, he did everything for the sake of and for the realm, and that was fine, as long as it didn't go against the interests of House Lannister, who currently held power, although outwardly they were the Baratheons. We'll review all these notes, Lord Varys, Sir Keevan murmured, picking up the parchment from the table. In a few days, a trial will be held if he is deemed a possible culprit. Until then, for your safety, we will keep my nephew in the black cells. Is that all right with you, brother? Yes, Tywin took a deep breath, though it was imperceptible. There would be no retaliation from our side, but the attempt on the king's life might have upset the current queen's followers. And there's too much at stake to lose it because of my son's jealousy if that's the case. But father. Jaime, the old lion's green eyes stopped his son from responding. He felt a chill run down his spine and looked away from his father's face. With this matter under control, it's time for you to leave. The door opened again as the meeting attendees were about to leave. Gentlemen and madam. Foreign. Oh. Lord Tywin nodded to his brother and dismissed Mace, Oberyn, Varys, and his sons from his chamber. When the door closed behind them, he turned to Naruto. Well. May I be frank? In fact, you like me for my frankness. He walked around the table, looking at the spread map. He had seen the scroll Sir Keevan was carrying as he left the room. The attempted murder of your grandson was caused by the poison. The Strangler. It is a strange poison, similar to small stones like the ones my betrothed wore in her diadem. The two men stared at each other. Tywin Lannister's eyes blazed silently with a fire that resembled the same wildfire that had burned at the Blackwater. Naruto's eyes, on the other hand, were calm. And it wasn't her. Sir Dantos, the court jester, gave said diadem to young Sansa by order of his benefactor, Lord Petyr Baelish, Lord of the Riverlands of Harrenhal and future consort to the Lady of Arryn. You can glean that information from the jester. Now, how did the poison get into the pie? Many people approached Sansa, but few stroked her hair. In fact, old Olenna is the only one I have ever seen stroke my betrothed's hair. And, they say, poisons are women's weapons. If those words were true, there were traitors within the coalition formed by the Lions and the Roses, so Tywin Lannister would have to seek out those withered roses and uproot them, so they would never rise again. If your words are true. Either that or Sir Dantos is foolish enough to lie to me under torture, which I have done myself. And I was part of Lord Petyr's escape when he attempted to kidnap my betrothed. The men who accompanied me, from Dorne specifically, can attest to what happened. Prince Oberyn has been good enough to lend me his men to try to stop Petyr, but I regret that he escaped me. I thought about keeping Lady Sansa safe. It doesn't matter, his green eyes flashed with anger. Keeping Sansa Stark safe is what's important to you right now. Congratulations, stranger, your wedding will be in a week. Chapter 18. The marriage between Sansa of House Stark and a foreigner in service to House Lannister went unnoticed by all the great lords of Westeros, including the Tyrells and the Martells, the current allies of the Lion, and those who supported the power of Tywin Lannister and his grandsons on the Iron Throne. The ceremony was small, with the presence of the gold cloaks and the hand of the king, accompanied by the Queen Regent as a witness, taking place a week after the attempted assassination of the king, and the news was kept hidden from prying ears until the union was consummated. While many minor and major lords knew of the match and the hand's intention to grant the young lady of Winterfell to a stranger from Westeros, they never knew when and where the final union would take place, a detail that even the spider kept in the most ominous darkness, as if unaware of the old lion's plans regarding the vast and ominous north, which was occupied by ironborn and winded northerners far from their lands. South of the Neck, in what was known as the Twins, the Free Stronghold, a contingent of northerners allied with Bolton, still waited for their moment to go north, far from their homeland. But that front's still open, as the North lacked a strong hand and its rulers. Tyrion Lannister's trial came a few days after a foreigner took the title of Lord Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, thus stripping the foreigner of any ties to a darker land, making him a Westerosi man under the command of the Old Lion, who used this new lord and his wife as just another instrument in his departure. The trial of Tywin Lannister's youngest son was taking place in the Iron Throne Room itself, with a young king seated on the throne made of molten swords and 3 judges set up at its foot. In the center of the 3, the hand of the king stood with his green gaze fixed on his son, barely looking at him. To the left of the Lord of Rika Casterly stood the Lord of Highgarden, Mace Tyrell, who didn't seem too eager to be there. And, to complete the 3 judges, Oberyn Martell had joined the 2 men, wearing soft pale robes typical of the dry burning lands of Dorne. Joining the three judges were the king's court, minor lords, knights, and members of the small council, as well as witnesses and family members, all with their eyes on the small figure of Tyrion Lannister. Do you think he'll make it out alive? Sansa Stark didn't hate all Lannisters, even though the House of the Lion had left her without a family. Tyrion, unlike his nephew, was a far better man than the knights she had once admired, treating her better than she had expected. And the Hound, the king's former guardian, was a better knight than some of her fellow Kingsguard members. It seemed that those with monstrous faces were better than those with good looks, those with bright eyes and smiles. I can't vouch for Tyrion, her husband admitted, arms crossed. I think Queen Cersei is worse than a viper, and Tyrion will probably be blamed for every charge brought. They need a scapegoat, someone to blame. Who better for that than Tyrion Lannister, someone everyone hates for his looks. Naruto's words were true, too much to his chagrin. Tyrion Lannister, once Hand of the King, defended King's Landing like a small lion. With claws, teeth, and even his entire body, ready to tear his enemies to pieces. Unlike his sister Cersei or his nephew Joffrey, Tyrion had led the men of King's Landing, taking his place at the head of the defenders, creating the best strategies his mind could come up with. A chain to catch the ships before the wildfire devoured them. Tyrion Lannister did it, even with the fire too close to burn the city down. Charge at the head of knights, soldiers, and beggars willing to die for king and city. Tyrion Lannister did it, letting an axe cut into his face, slice off his nose, and leave that scar on his face, making him that much uglier. He might be half the size of most men, but he shouldn't be considered a coward or someone who would hide behind battlements like hundreds of others. And yet, the king's image cleansing turned his uncle into a monster. Tyrion Lannister's problem is where he's placed his trust. A lady of pleasure, a sellsword, and a eunuch who will undoubtedly betray him before losing anything but his private parts. The imp, as they call him, doesn't have the allies his sister Cersei has, who, using her feminine charms, her house's money, her father's name, and the power that comes with being regent, can obtain whatever she desires. Witnesses, champions, or false evidence that will bury her brother and prevent him from seeing the light of day. Her eyes moved to the figure of Joffrey, who was sitting on the Iron Throne, with that mocking and malicious smile on his worm-like lips. And his nephew would kill him if he could, but he must play his mother's game. Putting Tyrion on trial is much more effective for her than simply killing him, increasing her name. Letting yourself be carried away by negative feelings could lead to confrontations with your subjects, such as Meager the Cruel or the Mad King. Do you support Joffrey? We both know, Sansa, that question has two answers. A false one that is given a court and the real one that we keep to ourselves and expose to people outside this place. The Lord and Lady of Winterfell remained silent among themselves as the Impess trial took place. Commoners, beggars, servants, ladies-in-waiting, knights, members of the Kingsguard, and loyal Lannister soldiers passed in a long procession, each one with tales of Tyrion, each one worse than the last, leaving the man as less than nothing. Cersei's fingers seemed to lengthen enough to wrap around her little brother's neck, squeezing him tightly, and Naruto could see in the gleam of mother and son's eyes a sickening glee, as if they had been expecting this for years. Cersei Lannister might have expected this and was willing to do anything to see her brother's downfall. Her son, the king, was merely a pretentious teenager, recently unmarried and with more malice than blood in his body. You could see it in his eyes, green like all Lannisters, shining like those of an ancient dragon king who sat on that throne, paranoid and persecuted. Tyrion's sentence will be taken to a trial by combat, the stranger finally declared, sighing. And Prince Oberyn will probably want to take part. Why not Jaime? He is Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and while he could, he won't be able to because he'd be fighting against his twin and his nephew, as well as his father and uncle. She shook her head, knowing who the queen would use to end her brother's life. The mountain is a better option for Cersei to fight for the king, and Sir Jaime certainly won't fight a giant just for Tyrion. He's not that honorable, despite being knighted so young. Wearing the white cloak doesn't add anything to these years, we both know that. A shiver made Sansa hug herself, remembering Sir Meryn and Sir Boros, one of them being the cause of her being left half naked in front of the court, the king and some servants, before the Hound gave her his cloak, and Tyrion saved her from being completely embarrassed in front of hundreds of people. That action marked her deeply and made it clear that those so-called knights had stopped being so 300 or more years ago, and were now simply anointed and recognized sellswords and bastards. I want to see him fall to the mountain. Overcome with fear, Sansa bit her tongue and looked around, hoping to see someone watching her. But by her side was only her husband, who gave a small smile, hidden from the others. Both were hidden by the gallery and witnessed the trial unseen, at least not directly, by those present, whether they were simple members of the audience or active people supporting the king, refusing to help the villain of that story. Many wish that, Sansa. Women, men, old people and children all wish for Sir Gregor Clegane's death for the crimes he has committed, and one of those people is Oberyn, who will launch himself at the mention of the Queen's champion. Of course, Tywin will keep Jaime away from that fight, and Oberyn's death would benefit the Lions far more than anyone would believe. He shook his head and looked into his wife's deep blue eyes, which reminded him so much of Lady Stark's. "Will you allow me to risk my life in the pursuit of justice?" Sansa, current Lady of Winterfell, had no time to think about her husband's question, standing there, looking at the two sapphire orbs that looked at her intensely, shining like two lighthouses. "I demand trial by combat." Tyrion's voice, despite his small size, echoed throughout the hall, almost like an imitation of his father's. The small man shifted, searching for a fighter, waiting for Bronn to move from his position at the back of everyone else, despite knowing the Sellsword's wishes. Who would fight the Mountain? The man stood over 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide, with a muscular body that could snap a man like a twig. Hundreds fell before Sir Gregor, and Tyrion had no doubt of the fear that filled the men when they saw the man riding, his greatsword trailing behind him, intent on cleaving his adversary. "I choose Sir Gregor Clegane." The Queen Regent's voice rose above the laughter as the audience had begun to mock the old lioness' youngest son, watching as all the men who had fought with swords turned their backs on him. Pleased with what had happened, Cersei's lips showed her arrogant smile, like those of a lioness who saw her prey cornered and about to die. Of course, no one expected anyone to fight for Tyrion Lannister. "I'll fight for the dwarf." He placed a chaste kiss on Sansa's lips before leaving the gallery and walking toward the imp. The men and women parted, letting the judge's eyes rest on him, accompanied by the malicious eyes of the king and the wary ones of the Queen Regent, as well as the impassive ones of the Hand of the King. The echoing of his footsteps finally stopped as he stood beside Tyrion Lannister, his eyes fixed on the three kings and the person sitting behind and above them. The king. Despite any respect or fear he might have instilled, Joffrey Baratheon, the first of his name, posed no danger. Oberyn Martell, or his grandfather, Tywin Lannister, were both fearsome and respected men who could destroy an army. "The Lannister man, protecting a Lannister son," Prince Oberyn murmured, giving a smirk. "Do you not fear the likes of the Mountain, boy? You still have children to bear, lands to rule, and a woman too." "I'm a soldier, a man of the sword," Naruto replied, his eyes fixed on Oberyn. "I can afford to fight the battles I want to fight, the ones I know I'm going to win." "Win against the Mountain." "Your Grace." Her eyes shifted to the Queen Regent, holding firm before the woman's eyes. "I can win against 1,000 men and a mountain. I do not fear death, and I will not play with my food. I serve Lord Tywin Lannister, and it is my duty to watch over his sons, even when they fight each other like stupid children to the death." Her eyes turned cold and hard as steel. "And, on this occasion, I will fight for Tyrion Lannister." Chapter 19. Large men tend to be stronger and are seen in mythical and fanciful ways by commoners, which would turn said man's life into a complete myth sung by bards and minstrels, creating both terrifying and fanciful stories at the expense of their exploits, and they would always be used as important members of any army. Sir Gregor Clegane, a man who once almost burned his brother alive, was one of those men. Large, with muscles hidden by his armor and an inordinate strength capable of cleaving an enormous horse in two, as if it were made of butter, swinging an immense sword with one hand as if it were a simple axe. He had also inherited an immense anger and cruelty that had earned him enmity with the Martells. He had murdered Rhaegar's wife and children without mercy. Rumors would later claim that this was Tywin's doing to curry favor with Robert, and had continued his evil ways, leaving a wound in the hearts of the Dornish and in the brothers of the deceased queen, cruelly murdered and outraged. Sir Gregor Clegane was the kind of man no one wanted to face. Aside from having immense power of his own and a dark and bloody reputation, he had the support of the Queen Regent and the Lord of the West. Lord Tywin Lannister, current Hand of the King. He had always been part of the vanguard of the Old Lion's army, as he demonstrated in the Riverlands, while ravaging villages and small groups of Tully soldiers, increasing his bloody reputation. Despite having been pursued by the Hand of the King, Lord Eddard Stark, using his power to do so, Sir Gregor never abandoned his lord and continued fighting in the war even before it began. This was the champion of the Queen Regent and the King. A two-legged monster, encased in armor that seemed to contain a muscular body, straight from the depths of legend. No one in their right mind would fight a man nearly 2.5 meters tall, wielding a two-handed sword as long and wide as its owner, with which he had killed hundreds of men. But for every rule, there was an exception. If Sir Gregor was ruthless, a monster, someone as enormous as a human giant, his adversary was anything but. He was not small, as he was of average height for a young man, with an athletic body due to the constant training and fighting in his life, but much less like a monster than the mountain that rides, with a more acrobatic and agile body than his adversary. Wearing strange plate armor that was very light compared to Sir Grigor's, Naruto became the talk of the town at the duel to the death that would decide the fate of the accused Tyrion Lannister, who also didn't see the foreigner representing him with conviction. The blonde sword and armor were far from what anyone would have thought, including Sir Grigor Clegane himself and any other knight or soldier who watched the duel. How could he expect to survive a simple cut from Sir Grigor's sword, with armor as flimsy as the one he was wearing? He was crazy. But that was Naruto's ace up his sleeve, as he felt all eyes on him and heard the murmurs behind him. Unlike Grigor, he didn't wear a helmet. However, a demon mask covered the lower part of his chin, contrasting with his black and red coloring, as if he were a real demon. Fear was an important psychological game, and Naruto hoped to instill it directly in his adversary and his enemies, whoever they were. He had already expected the contempt, the stares, and the comments, so he wasn't surprised or afraid. On the contrary, he seemed much more determined to put an end to Sir Grigor and his entire legacy. As soon as the bell rang, Naruto and Sir Grigor showed their swords. The difference in size and width was undeniable, as the knight's greatsword seemed to be able to cut through anything with a simple movement, as if he were severing a small twig, all in comparison to Naruto's sword. The Wado Ichimonji was a beautiful agile blade that allowed its wielder to make subtle, swift movements, conducive to deep cuts and draining blood. But it seemed fragile against a sword as wide as the mountain-esque greatsword, which was 3 or 4 times larger than Naruto's katana. However, the foreigner fell into the stance typical of his country soldiers, appearing calm. Sir Grigor, his eyes fixed on him, moved forward, launching a sharp slash that would have cut him in half. Naruto ducked perfectly and evaded the slash, letting the sword pass by, so that he ended up positioning himself in one of his enemy's blind spots without him noticing, too preoccupied as he was with lifting the heavy sword with his 2 arms. What Sir Grigor had in strength, he made up of incautiousness. Naruto took advantage of that moment on the giant's left side, a side that Sir Grigor could not see due to the helmet that covered him, and attacked, launching a swift and precise thrust to one of the weak points of any armor. The joints, in this case the one located on the left knee of the mountain that rides. The blade entered and cut the fabric, the flesh and the muscle, the tip touching the bone. But Sir Grigor reacted, sending a circular cut that made his attacker jump back, who took distance leaving a considerable space and a limp in his enemy. It didn't take long for the blood to soak the cloth and trickle down the inside of the armor's greave, leaving the knight with a strange feeling. Sir Grigor gritted his teeth, his face twisting with rage, hidden by his helmet. Now his leg was loosely immobilized, and he dragged it around, as if dead. The direct attack on the joint had robbed him of the use of a limb. "I'm not going to play who you killed." Naruto stepped aside as a sword slash bounced off the cobblestones, sending out small sparks. "All those deaths attributed to you, even if you haven't admitted to them, are your fault." The mountain roared in rage, swinging his sword wildly, trying to slash at his enemy. But the enemy remained 4 meters away from him, considering the length of his arm and his sword, which combined to give the giant man enormous reach, as he was constantly trying to strike something. "Don't run away, bastard." Cries of support for Sir Grigor were not long in coming. For the people of Westeros, fights to the death were meant to be direct and concise, with one death and one victor, without a strategy of fear. In the Shadowlands, in Asai, confrontations arose in a variety of ways, with hundreds of possibilities. Why face an army when you could poison the water supply and watch them slowly fall, weakening your enemy? Why fight a giant directly when you could exploit its weaknesses? Naruto was raised as a soldier, a commander, a killer, and a survivor. He had killed and murdered countless people, the first of whom, at 6 years old, was a wealthy old man from the free cities, but he soon moved on to fighting with a sword in his hand, slaying giants 3 times his size. He was no idiot or fool, and certainly not a coward. When he drove the Wado Ichimonji into Sir Grigor Clegane's knee and evaded the ensuing counterattack, he cared nothing for the jeers of lesser and greater nobles, or the mocking glances of the younger knights. That didn't matter. That wasn't his goal. He watched as Sir Grigor limped and charged a downward sword stroke, leaving the joints of his arms completely unprotected for his blade. As the blow came down, the Wado Ichimonji sliced into unprotected flesh, eliciting a piercing cry from Sir Grigor Clegane, accompanied by a deathly silence from the people who watched, amazed, as the giant fell on his injured leg. The arrogant 2-meter-tall man didn't even think about the wound on his leg, which was made twice, going deep enough to almost sever the leg itself, but Grigor didn't even think about it, and Naruto saw the opportunity to weaken the man's upper limbs. All armor has gaps in the joints and armpits, as well as in the eyes. He evaded the mountain-esque grappling attempt and sank the tip of his sword into the back of the man's right knee, causing him to fall flat on both knees, likely feeling a sharp pain that would prevent him from getting up. "I've killed giants before, men as tall as a pillar. I have no problem killing another, even if it's a comrade in arms. I am going to kill you." There was anger in that cry, accompanied by pain. Sir Grigor ripped the helmet from his head and, surprising Naruto himself, stood up to his full height, almost 8 feet tall, his eyes wild. If a fighter fought Sir Grigor, there was a 90% chance the mountain would survive the confrontation, likely because of his stubborn refusal to fall to anyone. And for that, Naruto respected and, in a way, admired him. However, he wasn't going to keep Grigor alive, allow him redemption, or allow him to become a member of the Night's Watch. But that toothpick, you can't cross swords with me. Sir Grigor pushed through the pain and wrapped his hands around the handle of his massive sword. It swung, the tip scraping the stone, creating sparks. Any blade that tried to stop that greatsword would likely be reduced to nothing more than a broken and shattered sword, a mere memory to its wielder. Sir Grigor's greatsword and Wado Ichimonji's sword met, colliding with a sharp clang of metal that made those present close their eyes and pinch their ears shut in annoyance. Had the foreigner's thin blade broken? When the men and women looked, and Nick was present in the blade of Sir Grigor Clegane's thick sword, while Wado Ichimonji's sword was still perfect, as if it hadn't encountered a sword 3 times its size. That collision sent Grigor tumbling backward, pushed back by the weight of his sword and the strength of his opponent. His weakened legs made it impossible for him to remain standing, so he fell, feeling his arms limp and blood staining the ground beneath his back. He could feel his doublet growing damp and sticking to his skin. You killed Ilia Martell, Queen of Westeros, wife of Rhaegar, and murdered her children. In my terms, those who murder children should no longer breathe. You can accept it, you can repent, and not go as deep into hell as you will if you don't admit it. I don't regret killing them. I crushed the children, I enjoyed the mother with my stained hands, Wado Ichimonji swung down, sharp and true, and drove Sir Grigor Clegane through the mouth from side to side, causing the man to choke, agonizingly, on his own blood until he died. Still, Grigor fought, trying to kill Naruto, to crush his head with the intention of sending him to the grave as well. But standing over Sir Grigor kept him safe, away from the thick hands that ended up severing him once he withdrew his sword, feeling the blood spraying across his face. The gods have spoken. He roared, looking Cersei Lannister straight in the eyes. Tyrion Lannister is innocent. Chapter 20. Cersei Lannister was a woman with hair as golden as the Lannisters' own gold. Her green eyes could be compared to the same color as an emerald, a dark one, full of hidden evil that only appeared in a smile. But anyone who saw the queen would say that her eyes were more like wildfire. Unpredictable, harmful, and dangerous. No one who looked into the woman's eyes could see what she was truly thinking, what she would do next, even if they were right in front of her, which made her a dangerous player who could turn the tables in her favor. In the Game of Thrones, there is no middle ground. It was win or die, and Cersei Lannister had learned to play to survive, so that her house, the Lannisters, would always be at the top of all the houses like the proud lion they were. And, as such, Cersei was capable of doing anything to get what she wanted, whether it was loyalties or one-time favors, all to remain above the rest of the people of Westeros, even if it forced her to turn against her younger brother. Although the latter carried a certain weight for her. When she had been a young woman, a witch had told her that her younger brother would betray her, that he would kill her or cause her death. That reminder was still in her mind, burned into her mind even when she stood beside her firstborn son, the king of the 7 kingdoms. Mother and son stared, with their green eyes, at the man who had kept the crown on the king's head, saving him from meeting the stranger before his time. They regarded him with some suspicion, Cersei and unease, Joffrey, as he stood there, wearing his wife's colors, representing the Stark vassal houses and his own wife at court. The unease that plagued Joffrey was due to his maternal uncle. Tyrion Lannister, the imp. That little man had tried to assassinate him as he had promised on some occasions, veiling his comments as simple slips or mockery, but he had already launched his play at his wedding with that poison in the pie. If it weren't for that blonde foreigner, the same one who saved his uncle, he would be dead now, and his brother Tommen would be on the throne, and, despite his denial, he had agreed to speak with his savior, even though he had betrayed him by saving his uncle's murderer. Like a wall of white and gold, the members of the Kingsguard stood at the foot of the steps leading to the Iron Throne, their hands on the hilts of their swords, their faces slightly hidden by the helms of their armor. Since the failed assassination attempt, the Kingsguard had remained much closer to the king, and a servant always checked the food he brought to his mouth, including his drinks. The cook loyal to the Lannisters was in charge of preparing all meals, always watched over by a member of the Kingsguard. Everyone's eyes were always on the food. I must thank you for saving my life, Lord Stark. My family and the kingdom owe you a debt, Joffrey's voice echoed through the throne room, fading between the columns and galleries, becoming an almost illegible murmur. But I have a question. Why did you fight for my uncle, the offender? The king's eyes flashed with malice. Naruto understood immediately what Joffrey was looking for. A mistake to execute, to detach his head from his shoulders and execute him instead of his uncle, probably out of revenge. Despite having saved him, the king looked at him with the darkness of a madman. Perhaps the letters about sibling marital relations were real. For a brief moment, he shifted his gaze from the king to his mother, looking into those dangerous green eyes, that regal fair-skinned face framed by golden curls. When he returned his gaze to Joffrey, he saw the similarities in that younger face, though they were slightly obscured by the similarities to the face of his father, the queen's twin. Your Grace, he bowed his head slightly, showing all possible respect and straightened, placing his hands behind his back, assuming an upright, almost regal posture. I regret having created distrust with my action, for I see the unrest it could have caused. However, here I ask you, do you truly believe your uncle would have wanted to murder you in front of his wife, yours, in front of his father, his brother, and the guests? That would leave him exposed. Tyrion Lannister may be a dark and evil little man, but he has intelligence. He fought for King's Landing under your command, your Grace, even when he seemed to hate you. He protected your throne until your grandfather returned and reinforcements from the west. Perhaps I am naive, your Grace, but a man like that would not try to kill you openly under dozens of prying eyes. Naruto didn't look directly into the king's eyes. He stared past Joffrey, staring down at the hilts of the molten swords that formed the Iron Throne. According to legend, Aegon the Conqueror used his dragon to burn all the swords he had fought with, the weapons of the enemies he had defeated during his conquest. The Conqueror himself had made the throne with the intention of making the kings uncomfortable, always feeling the cold of the iron piercing their bodies. Understand? The words died in the king's mouth. Young Baratheon shifted his attention, subtly trying to shift it, to his mother. The man before him, his grandfather's sworn sword, had not only saved his life. His uncle Jaime owed his life to that man, just as the crown owed the peace in the Riverlands that the stranger had secured. The siege of Riverrun and a few other minor settlements still lay ahead, but that man could probably pull it off. What do you want for saving my life, sir? He could ask for anything. Money, power, titles, a position. Naruto's mind ticked them all off little by little, as if he were stacking boxes on top of each other. Did he need money? No, with the new title of Lord Stark, he didn't need any, and Lord Tywin always paid him quite well. Did he need titles? With the title of Lord of the North, he'd gained enough power for his own agenda, and he was married to Lady Sansa Stark, the only legitimate daughter of Eddard Stark still alive. Did he want power? The title of Lord gave him power, so he didn't need any more of it, at least not yet. So, what could a teenager with a tilted crown on his head give him? There was only one thing I needed from that boy king. Give me 1,000 men, your Grace, and I will end the siege of Riverrun and march north to end the war with the Ironborn so that the king's peace can be established in the Seven Kingdoms, as it should be. The words spoken by the stranger were a thorn in the Seven Kingdoms. The War of the Five Kings had been reduced to a three-way war if Stannis could be considered a valid contender, though many had their doubts. The Ironborn continued to harass the shores of Westeros. Stannis was missing from the picture, as if completely defeated, though no one could be sure. And the Riverine and Northern rebels continued to resist the free assault in Riverrun, who maintained the siege of the castle with their lord restrained. The kingdom continued to bleed as the days passed, and Naruto had presented a solution to the crown. 1,000 men? Would that stop the battles that are still going on? Cersei was reluctant to hear the stranger's words, eyeing him suspiciously, as if she expected him to say she had been joking. But Naruto stared at her with hardened eyes, fixed on her for several seconds before she had to look away. Had she seen blood and fire in those blue eyes? Cersei internally bit her cheek, pushing down that unease. I only need 1,000, your Grace. I don't ask for more swords than I need. My intention is not to bleed our enemies, but to bring them to their knees. If they don't, then the fire will burn, and even Riverrun will be reduced to ash, falling upon the bones of the traitors. The blue eyes grew harder, as hard as the words that came out of his mouth, and at no point did Naruto doubt what he had said or contract his face in worry about Cersei's or the boy king's reaction. He stood his ground, his eyes as hard as his own words, like two icy splinters brought from the wall itself in the north. And it was this hardness that sent a chill down Cersei's spine and made Joffrey shift uncomfortably on his throne, as if something in that voice had reached him. I see it as feasible, the voice of the Hand of the King echoed in the throne room, followed by the echo of Lord Tywin Lannister's footsteps. The brooch appointing him to the position glittered on the right side of his torso, bearing the unmistakable shape of a closed hand. It would remove many problems and give the crown the balance and peace to rebuild. For Lord Tywin, this proposal would eliminate the greatest possible threat to his grandson's reign. The peace they were building. Keeping the Ironborn away from the coasts was a different job than it might seem, and keeping the Riverlands and the North at peace was much simpler. For him, when both areas were integrated back into the crown, they could then turn their attention to the Iron Islands and the Greyjoys to end their revolt. Whereas with Stannis there was no need to even pay much attention to him. Robert's second brother didn't have the resources to take the Iron Throne, not after his defeat at the Blackwater. No matter how good a commander Stannis was, he couldn't defeat all the men who still served under the banner of Joffrey Baratheon, King of the Seven Kingdoms. We must keep casualties to a minimum, your grace. Taking a deep breath, Tuin turned to his eldest grandson, the king. 1,000 men are few for a fight, but we need no more fighting. The war is yours. The old lioness eyes fixed on his grandson, searching for any hint of capricious refusal on his part. Despite being the king, Joffrey still acted like a spoiled brat, a bad habit Cersei had instilled in her eldest son, and one Tuin was eager to root out of his grandson as soon as possible. Keeping the Lannisters on top was the most important thing, and to do that, they had to secure the throne. I'll take my wife and Tyrion, Lord Tuin. With a nod from the eldest Lannister, Naruto nodded and left the throne room, feeling the eyes of the Kingsguard on the back of his head. Valar Morghulis. Are you going to let him take his wife, father? He has served well, Cersei. We cannot part with someone who has saved Jaime and your son. Tuin Lannister's weary, shrewd eyes glanced briefly at his grandson. Joffrey shuddered, feeling like a fawn. If that man were willing to betray us, why not do it now? You're being too trusting, father. Being confident doesn't mean you're not being watched. Siege of Riverrun. At the same time. Sir Edmure Tully was the current lord of Riverrun and the lands of the Trident. The deaths of his father, the previous lord, and his sister Catelyn had left him emotionally damaged and captive to the clutches of the Frees, his father's vassals and his by extension, thanks to the lordship. He was currently tied to a wooden post, unable to use his hands or feet, watching as the Frees surrounded his family's stronghold. The defense of Riverrun, Edmure wasn't mistaken, lay in the hands of his uncle Brynden Tully, also known as the Blackfish. He was undoubtedly doing a better job than he would have managed defending his home in this siege, and he could chuckle inwardly at every curse word Ryman Free uttered whenever his uncle refused to surrender the castle. Although what did Ryman expect? If the rope was hung on him every day, his uncle wouldn't notice the real threat because there wasn't even one. In Edmure, the Frees were as foolish as they were evil. If Ryman had hanged him the first time his uncle refused to surrender Gustasuite, then perhaps the Free banner would now be hanging in the halls within the castle they were besieging, but he wasn't doing so because they had no real intention of murdering him in front of Brynden, a man who would likely put them all to the sword if they didn't stop him properly. With his head cut off. The normal noises of the Free camp were completely silenced and soon replaced by screams of both pain and anger as a powerful echo of horses' hooves slowly arose before the crackling of flames and blood splattered over him, going straight into his mouth, forcing him to spit out the blood of a Free standing next to him, now with a shaft piercing his neck. Take up your weapons. By the gods. Edmure's eyes widened. A javelin had split Sir Ryman Free in half, leaving his upper half pinned to the ground by the javelin, his gut splattered in a grotesque pattern. Men clad in black armor appeared from between the tents, weapons at the ready. Riders shrouded in dark halos and fire cut through the camp's defenses like a knife through butter. A massive sword, more like a mass of iron, cleaved 3 free men without even pausing on the hard bone of their bodies. Sir Edmure Tully, I presume. The man drew a knife from the folds of his cloak, heedless of the battle raging behind him. You have someone watching over you, little Riverlord. I hope you will not retreat now. Then the man handed him a sword. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.